tail exploded to life as a monster's roar ripped up from the forest's shadowed depths. Laffey, her red hair blazing, lunged forward and split the beast clean down the middle. A heavy doubt gnawed at Lappy's, refusing to let her breathe. She had a friend named Wrath who, the moment he saw her wounded, snapped into action. Anoint Rarelixer's wound with it. Laffy barked that he'd squandered a priceless potion on a petty scratch, Wraith. Puzzled by her reaction, realization slammed into him. He could just craft more. Wraith and Alchemist lit a fire of dread in Lappy's. Elixirs that can heal any injury, mending bone and flesh, erasing pain like it never happened. They were nearly mythical. Only a handful of alchemists could coax one into being after years of brutal toil, and most attempts still failed. Snagging even one felt impossible. No lifetime of sweat could scrape together enough gold. Laffey risked everything, pouring every coin of her savings into a desperate bid to buy an elixir. He lunged for it and his hope shattered. The lone vial had been reserved for a noble. Desperate to secure the elixir to save her sister, Laffey fell to her knees and beseeched the seller, vowing she'd do anything. He turned her away, coldly declaring his business came first. Burned by rejection, she whirled to go and collided with a frail man who folded against her, and she grabbed him, heart-pounding, asking, "Are you okay?" A thunderous growl erupted from his stomach. When Luffy pressed food into the hands of the man who was Wrath, the man, eyes blazing with gratitude, revealed he was an alchemist. He vowed to repay her kindness by alchemizing whatever she wanted. She impulsively demanded an elixir, but his gaunt, starving frame made her doubt he'd be able to pull it off. Her breath caught, Wrath nodded, and pressed a genuine elixir into her trembling hands. Stunned, he laughed and fired. "Where did you get that?" Wrath shrugged, flashed a grin, and casually admitted he'd crafted it himself. She held the vial to the light, and when its color and the crackle of its aura matched the single sheet she'd seen in the shop, she knew it was genuine. Dazzled by its worth, Laffy slammed down an offer. She'd pay any price. Wrather flashed a grin and declared it his way of saying thanks for the bread she'd given him. Still eager to help, she sprang forward and shot out, "Need a hand selling those potions." As they walked, he blurted it was his first time in the capital and that his wallet had been stolen, leaving him flat broke. Luffy marched Wrath straight to the Adventurers Guild. The moment they stepped inside, the guild erupted into whispers and pointed looks, every eye locked on Laffey and the S-ranked adventurer. Wraith, curiosity blazing, leaned in and asked if she was well known. She snapped that at her rank, fame was impossible to escape. At the counter, receptionist Amelia fired off a bright, welcoming greeting the moment Lathe stepped up. When Wraith stepped forward and declared his name, Amelia smirked and jabbed, "Are you Lathe's boyfriend?" She flushed, laughed, and insisted she'd only helped Wrath after finding him in your collapse, her fierce denial pricking him, and Wrath stepped forward to explain their purpose. He slammed an elixir onto the counter, putting it up for sale. Laffey staggered back, jaw wide. Alchemists had spent whole lifetimes hunting a single elixir, and Wraith casually produced two as if he'd just flicked dust from his hand. Curiosity about Wraith flared inside her, burning hotter by the minute. Amelia confirmed the elixir was genuine, then fixed him with a hard stare and asked if he was really going to sell a treasure like that. Ray tossed 4 more elixirs onto the table like it was nothing, grinning that he had plenty to spare. Amelia's shout cracked through the hall, yanking every guild member's gaze to her. Lathe's heart slammed as he yanked the Wraith toward the exit and demanded an explanation. Confusion flickered in Wraith's eyes as he shrugged off the uproar and snapped that they were just elixirs he'd brewed. Lathe swore his alchemy was nothing short of miraculous. She pleaded that dangerous people might come for him if word of his gift leaked and begged him not to sell the elixirs. Rafe shot back furious. He held up empty hands and admitted there was nothing left to sell. Left with no other options, Lackey bunked down at her house for the night. Guilt slammed into him for bringing his sales to a dead stop. Wraith stood perfectly unfazed. Relief slammed into him. Any roof over his head was a blessing, even if it meant staying with a girl. Inside Lafayette House, Wrath gaped as the residents loomed over him, massive like living mountains. Lathe burst onto the scene with a young girl at his side. She swept her into view and proclaimed, "This is my younger sister, Sylvia." Laugh stepped up to brew the tea, and Silly leapt in to help. Laffy barked that she had to rest, push on, and her health would only spiral into ruin. Sylvia slid into the seat opposite Wraith, silent and sharp, as Lafayette darted off to brew the tea. Silence warped into heavy awkwardness, and Wrath's mind raced as he groped for something to say. Sylvie blurted out her thanks, and he asked why. She called him out he'd handed her sister that precious elixir, and he fired back that Laffey had helped him first, so he owed her thanks. Sylvia strode forward, insisting on thanking him, her voice fierce as she declared Lathe had toiled endlessly for her sake. Wrath reeled as Sylvia revealed Lathe was racing through every option, desperate to find a cure for her illness. A bolt of insight slammed into Ray. He finally understood why Laffy seemed so driven, and he turned to Sylvia and said, "Your sister is amazing." Sylvia's grin lit up her whole face as she nodded, declaring Lathe the greatest sister in the world. Wraith let out a sharp chuckle. Sylvia had seemed impossibly mature at first. She dropped a bombshell. She was only 15. Wraith wished to us stand as your covering. Sylvia's smile exploded across her face, a sudden flash that lit the room. Hidden behind the door, Laffy caught every word and grinned back. The next day, Wraith resolved to dive headfirst into brewing potions. Lathe demanded why. He snapped that after she forbade him from selling elixirs, he switched to brewing potions instead. Sylvie blurted, "How long does potion making usually take?" Laffy shrugged, "About an hour per vial, some brews stretching longer." Wrath scoffed, whipping up a medium-quality potion, took him seconds flat. Lackey yanked at Sylvia's side. He hissed, warning her not to trust him. Only someone as unusual as Wraith could conjure a potion that fast. As they traded barbs, Sully burst into giggles and branded Wrath a total oddball. Wrath ripped open his bag, hauled the ingredients out, and held them up for Lathe to inspect. They watched as he closed his eyes, honed his focus to a razor edge, and intoned the extract. She stripped away the taint, snapped the components into place, then blasted them into pure vapor. In a heartbeat, the potion snapped into existence, exactly as he said. The sisters' jaws dropped when they glimpsed alchemy for the first time. It was perfect. To Ray, though, it was routine. He snapped into autopilot, every move honed to muscle memory. He stumbled through life, blind to how valuable his skills really were. He aimed for a mid-grade potion that somehow spat out a top-tier elixir. He hesitated a beat, then realized mass-producing them would solve his money troubles. Sylvia's eyes flashed as she declared, "I finally understand what my sister was saying earlier." Later at the Ventures Guild, Wrath bellowed Amelia's name. "I blew it yesterday. I'm sorry. Let me make it up to you with a brand new item I'm selling." He thrust the glinting, top-tier potion forward and asked if she'd buy it. Amelia grins. They lunged to rehash yesterday first, but Laffey cut them off and told everyone to save it for later. Amelia slammed 3 gleaming gold coins onto the table, offering them in exchange for 15 high-quality potions. Rates exploded past every forecast, and she warned monsters were surfacing more often, potions were vanishing fast. Relief surged through Wrath at the thought of a warm-in. He turned to Lathe and asked what she was up to, and she confessed it had been ages since she'd accepted a guild request. Quests explode onto the board: harvest precious herbs, hunt down rampaging monsters, or tackle quieter jobs like finding lost cats and brewing potions. Laffey spilled the details, and Wraith's smirk sharpened as doubt tightened its grip, forcing her to question every choice she'd made. She slammed her name onto the adventurer roster, heart racing at the thrill and the glittering rewards waiting to be claimed. Lapti weighed the danger. One stray request for elixirs or any impractical demand could expose Wraith, so she vowed to watch him like a hawk and leap in the instant trouble sparked. Amelia announced to Wrath that he now had a rank and could climb to rank D even without tackling extermination missions. Lathe suggested. He fielded requests that had nothing to do with alchemy, but Wrath zeroed in on an alchemy request as his top pick. She tossed out a cat-themed plea like irresistible bait to sway him, but he dug in his heels and his choice stayed ironclad. Amelia barked a warning. The alchemy request was a bad idea. The client was peculiar. No one had ever fulfilled it, so it was a reckless choice. Ray brushed off her and Laffey's warnings and insisted on taking it himself. Amelia locked eyes with him to make sure her warning hit. He nodded, a spark in his gaze showing the challenge had him hooked. Breather rockets into a wild ride at the client's house. Lathe's concern flared in his mind. He surged into action, determined to carry out the request flawlessly and calm her worries. He knocked sharply, then proclaimed he'd come for the request. A young girl barreled up, greeted him with a fiery grin and snapped, "Follow me, we're starting now." Wrath assumed she was just assisting. Daisy slammed the truth down. She had posted the request herself. He matched him in age. He blurted an apology for thinking she was younger, and she snapped, "Quiet, follow me." They burst into a room where Daisy explained, her gaze razor-sharp, that he'd be extracting and purifying herbs for her. Daisy snapped that extracting is distilling herbs into a liquid that captures their properties, and purifying is stripping that liquid clean of every impurity. He rallied every last person he could and prodded them into the process. His sly, menacing grin sent a tidal wave of the task crashing into Wraith. Wraith began. His efficiency and precision obliterated an average alchemist's at least 50 times better. After a while, doubt gnawed at him, but he followed Daisy's orders and pushed on, ultimately finishing his first request with surprising ease. Hungry for Laptis's praise and desperate to prove he could handle the job alone, Rave pressed on. Later, spotting how late it was, Daisy called him out. Was he slacking? She cracked the door and tossed him a casual lifeline, a quick breather if he needed it. Daisy froze, breath caught, staring at the room packed to the rafters with processed herbs. Everything sprang from the meager ingredients she'd given him. She erupted, demanding how he'd conjured so much so quickly. Wrath smirked, unshaken, and tossed out, "I only use standard alchemy." Inferiority gnawing at her, Daisy snapped that normal couldn't explain his speed and screamed for him to reveal his method. Wraith stripped the herbs of their essence and purified it in one effortless sweep. He wielded it like routine alchemy, cold and effortless, leaving Daisy trembling. Overwhelmed, she fainted. She shot awake, sprawled on Wrath. They jolted when sudden closeness slammed into them. Seeing how dangerously exposed they were, Daisy slammed her hand across Wrath's face. Her cheeks flamed as she snapped at him. That kind of closeness is only for someone you love. Wrath's apology burst out as he insisted he couldn't leave her unconscious on the floor. Daisy accepted his reasoning, then ripped her gaze across the room to confirm the incredible work wasn't a dream. She raved about Wraith's raw, undeniable talent and couldn't fathom why the world still hadn't heard his name. He declared he'd only just arrived in the capital, until now he'd been out in the countryside, buried in studying alchemy. Curiosity ignited in Daisy. She spun to Wrath and asked for a favor. She pressed him to swing by now and then to help her, and asked him to teach her alchemy too. Wrath staggered back as the request slammed into him. He'd never taught anyone before. The idea ignited his curiosity, and he jumped at it. He agreed. Daisy thrust a request form into his hands. He signed it. He swore he'd deliver it to the guild this instant, then bolted. Wraith smashed his first guild request, and before he could celebrate, he'd already pledged to teach Daisy alchemy. At the guild, Amelia threw a triumphant arm around Wrath, whooping as she congratulated him for finishing the task. Stunned that he'd actually pulled it off, she pressed a single gold coin into his palm as his reward. Wrath spun to Laffey, chest puffed as he boasted he'd handled the request solo. Laffey, unimpressed, snapped, "Say that again," and Wrath went stone still. 30 minutes earlier, rewind the clock. Wraith burst into the guild, the completed request clutched tight in his hands. He confessed the brief was a beast, do as much as possible, left him unsure when to quit, so he pushed nonstop until his work crowded an entire room and the client was so stunned she fainted. When the dust settled, Wraith stepped forward and accepted the client as his alchemy apprentice. He forced out a confession. He'd probably pushed things way too far. Laffestress snapped that this was no small matter. He'd left the client unconscious, and she suspected the client was exploiting him. She realized the client had maneuvered him into becoming her regular assistant on bold alchemy projects and into teaching her the craft, the perfect outcome for the client, and Rafe began to understand the meaning behind her slay smile. Laffey snaps with a grin. Kindness matters, but he has to sharpen his guard and finally claim his own worth. Ray confessed his biggest truth. Recognizing his worth felt like a fight he kept losing. Next chapter, two adventurers huddle, trading a whispered rumor about an alchemist. An alchemist burst into the guild, cradling a mountain of glittering elixirs. Doubt gnawed at them. Could any of it be true? The other sneered and branded it a fabrication. They were mid-chat when a strange noise ripped through the air. A few days earlier, newly minted as an adventurer, Wraith strode into Daisy's shop and accepted her request. He confessed to her he'd been wrestling with the brutal question of his own worth. Daisy's eyes went wide at his sudden remark, and she shot back, "What made you say that?" Wrath admitted a friend had urged him to finally see his worth, and he was wrestling to figure out how. Daisy hadn't the faintest clue he even had friends. Wrath's jaw dropped as disbelief slammed into him. He recoiled in disbelief. She really saw him as a lonely outcast. Daisy slammed the point home. Temper every action. Wraith snapped, "Clarify that." She hissed that dumping a pile of elixirs at once would light a bullseye for unwanted eyes. Sell only one elixir per year. Daisy warned selling the life-saving elixirs quietly would keep prying eyes away. Peddling a whole cache at once would be madness, an open invitation to deadly attention. With curiosity blazing, she asked Wrath if he made elixirs and burned to learn how to create them. Wrath agreed to teach her and immediately put her to the test. demonstrate extraction, purification, component setting, and sublimation. Confidence crackled around Daisy as she barked, "Watch closely." Ray dove headfirst into teaching her alchemy for the first time, and Daisy had been counting down to this moment. Her focus snapped shut, and she whipped a masterful, potent potion into being in an instant. Wrath's eyes flickered with impressed approval, and Daisy practically leapt, fizzing with thrilled joy. Her jaw dropped as he coldly declared her knowledge was lacking. Fuming, Daisy snapped for him to say it again. Wraith shot back that, though she'd mastered the basics, he meant the deeper, book-bound knowledge. He dropped a bomb. Chakra. It only sprouts where the air thrums with dense atmospheric mana. It's the beating heart of elixirs and high potions, and herbals barely even whisper its name. She'd been blind to its past. Now the truth slammed into her, and she had to learn it. Rafe slammed several books onto the table and snapped at her to start studying. She gaped he was dead serious about making her study. She begged to study, certain it would sharpen her alchemy skills. He shot back, "Do you know about the herb?" She snapped that it was meant to staunch bleeding, most effective crushed and packed straight into the wound, and Wraith's nod proved she was right. Alchemists flood it with alchemy, supercharging its clotting to forge a potion that stops bleeding and heals wounds. He thrust 2 glowing vials toward her, one she'd brewed from Lamu, the other he'd crafted himself. Daisy raked her eyes over the vials, crowned his potion top tier, and pegged hers as only medium grade. Wrath leaned forward, eyes burning, demanding whether she could pinpoint what they'd done differently. She couldn't. He leaned in and spat the truth. It wasn't the herbs themselves, but how they pictured refining each herbal component. The way they applied that vision forged the potion's power. Studying was the forge that tempered raw effort into mastery of any skill. In the next scene, Sylvia rushed up to Wrath and hugged him warmly, laughing because her sister had already told her he'd taken up adventuring. He declared it plainly, only alchemy work. He refused to call himself an adventurer. Sylvia flashed a grin, teasing that she hoped Lathe hadn't blabbed about the fainting incident. Then Lathe suddenly materialized and asked how he was doing. Hidden under a lathe-worn apron that made her almost unrecognizable, she zinged Wrath with a playful scold, reminded him she was still a girl, and he immediately apologized. She slammed a steaming pot onto the table, barking for everyone to eat before it cooled. Wraith snapped he hadn't come to eat, but Lackey insisted that, as their guest, he would sit and eat with them. Sylvia blurted an apology for dumping all the work on Lathe. Lathe shrugged it off, saying Sylvia hadn't fully recovered, and though it was Sylvia's first time making the dish, she grinned, convinced it had turned out well. Between bites, Lathe leaned in and asked Wrath how he was. Wrath revealed he'd started teaching Daisy alchemy, and Lathe's eyes narrowed. Would Wrath teach her the same way he'd learned? Wrath warned, voice low and cold. It would likely take anywhere from a few days to decades to reach that level. Sylvia leaned in, eyes blazing, and snapped, "You taught yourself alchemy." The air went cold when he let slip that he had a mentor. The instant she pressed about them, he spat they're utterly hopeless. He spat out how, as a child, his mentor hurled him into snarling beasts for training and never lifted a finger for chores, wasteful, a drunk eccentric, utterly unreliable. He snarled that he never wanted to see them again. Dinner done, Wrath moved for the door, and Sylvia stalked him. Gratitude spilled from her lips as she said. He snatched her sister back from death with a single dose of his elixir. Rate beamed, practically buzzing with the thrill that he'd helped. Then he sprinted straight for his inn. Daisy's request fulfilled, he set his sights on the guild and froze when he spotted a restless crowd swarming the entrance. He surged forward to see what was unfolding. He zeroed in on Amelia as she implored him for help. At the town entrance, 2 adventurers lay battered and bleeding, one clung to life. Wraith froze. Emilio already knew about his elixir. Flash it in public and you could paint a target on your back. Laddie's warning hit him like a thunderclap. Dangerous people were hunting him for his abilities. Wraith resolved to stage his act in Estemelia, baiting him straight to the injured. He refused to turn his back on anyone he could save. She hustled him to the town entrance. He skidded to a stop and caught sight of the woman, gravely wounded. He crouched beside her, fingers probing, and named the 3 killers, bleeding out, festering rot, and poison coursing through her veins. He slammed a green potion into the hands of the man holding her to staunch the bleeding, then thrust an elixir toward the wound to mend it. He carried no potion to counter the poison. They questioned who he was, but he ignored them. He whipped up an antidote in seconds and poured it into her, fighting the poison away. After chugging all 3 potions, the one who bounced back, whole and healthy, the whole town erupted into roaring, stunned joy as the crowd who'd watched Wraith heal the girl's injuries realized a life had been saved. Clients bombarded Wrath with blunt, direct pleas for his services. He should have foreseen the complications. He confessed this was an even bigger hassle than when he was penniless. Wraith tore through the stack of requests and found most were people clamoring for him to brew or sell elixirs. It turned out a shocking number were collectors and wealthy elites, not even sick or injured. She came to his door, tears and fierce gratitude in her eyes, thanked him for curing her with the elixir, and vowed to spend her entire life repaying him. Wrath owned up he'd used the elixir without her permission, so he wasn't taking a single coin. She wouldn't take no, insisting she do something for him, so he made her promise to jump in whenever he needed help. She agreed and slipped out of the room. He was so lost in his own head he blanked. She snapped him back, reminding him he'd unleashed his abilities to save someone. From that day on, Rafe swore he'd sell elixirs only to those who truly needed them, and he hunted down safer, non-elixir ways to fix people's problems. He plunged into hospital work to care for patients, but the relentless pace bled him dry. He'd nearly bulldozed through the backlog of requests. His stash of ingredients was nearly empty. He might be forced to storm back home for the first time in ages just to restock. Or he'd be swamped and unable to take on a single new request. Rafe burst into the Adventurers Guild and announced he'd completed the requests. Amelia declared to him that a high-ranking noble had issued a direct request. Wrath scanned the request as Amelia snapped it came from the Radium family, the same clan he'd already turned down, and as he braced to refuse again, she said they were waiting outside to escort him. The Radium family is about to arrive, brace yourselves. One of the kingdom's 4 great noble families sprang from an ancient, honored bloodline tied to the country's founders. They didn't just back the royal family, they ran sprawling affairs, overseeing lands and steering foreign relations, and kept close ties to the Adventurers Guild. Amelia shot him a hopeful wish for luck, and Wrath's lips curled into a warm, kind smile. He'd rather bolt home and crash into sleep than step foot into their mansion. Wraith zeroed in on the mansion's exterior, his gaze cutting through the gloom to catalog every crack and shadow. A maid greeted him with a dazzling smile and whisked him inside. She hammered on the door and announced prices, daring any rival to match them. Wraith's chest tightened. Would the master actually heed his words? The master's voice struck him and his heart pounded, and as they crossed the threshold, his anxiety surged. A handsome young man strode forward, flashed a rakish grin, and declared, "I am Will's Requiem." Rafe tossed out his name with a grin, and they slipped into easy, casual banter. Wrath wanted out, he'd rather be home than stuck chatting. Will straightened, shrugged off formalities, and asked bluntly if Wrath intended to sell him an elixir. Wraith flashed a defiant grin and refused. When Will dangled 300 glittering gold coins, Ruth shook her head and refused again. Even when Will pledged his family's support, Wraith still slammed the door. Will met Wraith's firm stance with a curt nod, then launched into another question. Will fired the question whether Wraith had taught himself alchemy. When he pushed for the mentor's identity, Wraith revealed he had one. Rafe warned that knowing would do no good, then revealed his teacher was the alchemist Luria. Will's features snapped taut and he demanded, "Ruth, do you mean the fallen hero?" Shock slammed into Wraith when the rumors reached the capital. Will's smile was sharp as he declared that if Wraith was Luri's disciple, it suddenly explained everything. He thanked Wrath for his time and offered to summon a carriage to send him back. Wrath shook his head. He'd already set his course for another destination. Will beamed, offered his hand, and said he hoped they'd forge a better bond from here on. They locked palms and shook. Wrath stormed out of the city's mansion. Requests crashed over him nonstop. Wrath hadn't had a single moment to himself. The constant demand left him clutching one last elixir and nearly out of everything else, so that day he stormed into the market to restock. Out and about, he crashed straight into Sylvia and Laffey. Wrath had unlocked the world for Sylvia, so she stepped outside, and when he spotted something clenched in her hand, he snapped a question at her. She raised the staff and its runes roared to life, pumping raw power into her magic. Then she grinned and dropped the truth. She was an adventurer too. Curiosity hit him and he blurted, "What's your adventure rank?" Shock slammed into him when he learned Sylvia was an S-rank adventurer. He blurted, "Are you heading out on a mission?" And laughing said they'd just returned from slaying a water dragon. In this world, monsters wore strength rankings like iron brands. Everyone knew exactly how deadly they were. SS reigned at the summit while F scraped the bottom, and even the weakest dragon still ranked at least S. The truth slammed into Ray. One dragon could annihilate an entire nation, and he had to admit that Sylvia, the one who called him abnormal, was pulling off feats every bit as extraordinary. Their chat snapped shut, and the girls bolted for Daisy's place. They pushed on, haunted by one burning question. Where did their race come from, and had he ever truly been alone? He shot back that a mentor had his back. He wasn't alone. Curiosity burning, she asked why and said Wrath was impressive but tight-lipped about himself. Lafay added they hadn't told Wrath much about themselves either. They traded sly grins, picturing his jaw dropping when he learned they weren't actually sisters. Lathe had steeled himself, sure he'd be floored by how completely different she once was from who she'd become. Sylvia was snatched by goblins, one of them laughing as he tended her, and she could only remember her name, nothing else. With no family, Lafayette claimed her as his sister, and they plunged into life together under one roof. Sylvia was sure she relied on Lathe, but he flipped the script and asked her to use magic to haul their things to the carriage, a task that was usually effortless for her. Her body seized in an instant, and she crumpled to the floor. Lathe's head spun with confusion, worry gnawing at his gut. Sylvia had counted on the elixir to heal her, but her limbs betrayed her. She couldn't move. Lathe scooped her into his arms, and even there she stayed fixated on the luggage, panic tightening her chest. Lackey shoved the luggage aside and begged for help with the rates. Wrath bolted toward Daisy's shop, the storefront snapping into view as he closed the gap. He darted down a different route, rolled into the capital unscathed, and the city's streets were already imprinting themselves on him. It was his first time stepping into Daisy's shop as a customer, and he couldn't fathom what awaited him. He was sure Daisy would beam at the sight of him, and he pictured her shocked smile right before the doors refused to open. Daisy erupted into a radiant grin and welcomed the customer like a burst of sunshine. The instant her eyes landed on him, her mask shattered. She scoffed that he rarely showed up without her asking for something. He admitted his ingredients had run dry and he'd come to restock. It hit Dazing. He was neck-deep in saving people with his elixirs while juggling a relentless pile of other work. She snapped, "Why do you keep coming to me?" and shoved him to recognize his own worth, cracking that armor proved far tougher than it looked. Wraith snatched up the ingredients he needed. Daisy shot back, 2 silver coins, flashing a smile like he was one of her regulars. Wrath drank in her practiced, professional customer service smile, while Daisy leaned in and asked, "What are you planning to make with those ingredients?" He said he was weighing whether to book an appointment. She warned, eyes blazing, that whipping up those concoctions would outrage the herbalists, and if an alchemist like him brewed better medicines, they'd be out of work. Wrath shrugged, unbothered. He'd heard the herbalists scorned his mentor too. Daisy saw he wasn't fazed, so she dropped a bombshell. The adventure he'd saved had been attacked in a completely unexpected place. Wrath stayed blind to it, even after he'd dragged them back from the edge. The attack erupted beside an abandoned house in a neighborhood that had never reported monsters. The wound he treated seethed with poison and creeping rot. Poison flowed from hordes of monsters. Rot sprang from only a handful. Either an undead abomination had risen or a special weapon had been unleashed. Those were the likely causes. No one could say why the monsters appeared, only that they were irresistibly drawn to pockets where mana throbbed thick and raw. Strange things popped up now and then. Wraith snatched his ingredients and stepped out. The moment he opened the door, a hand clamped around him and yanked him. Lathe cried sorry as he yanked him forward. They swore they'd explain later. She whisked him into her home, where Wrath rushed to Sylvia's side and examined her. She had fallen ill again. Guilt clawed at Lathe, an S-ranked adventurer, after he failed to save someone, and he was about to drop to his knees and beg Wraith for help. Wraith cut her off mid-plea, insisting Sylvia would be okay. He flashed a fierce smile and vowed he'd save her. Luffy gasped, dropped into a quick bow, and blurted a shaky, "Thank you," as Wrath revealed Sylvia was immobilized by a condition called magic crystal disease. Magic crystal disease forced a person's magical energy to crystallize into jagged shards inside their body, freezing them rigid, and the elixir Sylvia took only slowed the disease. It didn't cure her. He'd never confronted this illness before, but he could brew a potion to treat it. He came up empty, no ingredients. Luffy leapt up to fetch them, but Wrath admitted she couldn't identify the herbs. He threw out an offer, come to his house. Monsters roamed every corner, but the very ingredients they needed grew there. Lathe leapt at the chance, ready to help. The crystallization had only latched onto Sylvia's hands and feet, but it would crawl to her heart in roughly 7 days. Wrath warned Lathe she had about a week before the disease turned deadly, so they planned to leave the next morning. Until then, Wrath tore home, hellbent on finishing his preparations. Lathe cut him off mid-stride and blurted a fierce, grateful thank you. Rates flashed a grin and strode away. He plunged into work in his home laboratory. Wrath slammed a poison antidote into an ointment, forging a cure salve, and fused a monster-repelling potion with a healing elixir. He slid the ring from his finger and slammed it onto the table, the metal ringing like a final verdict. The next morning, Lathe barreled up in a rumbling carriage. They vaulted aboard it and tore off to fetch the last herbs they still needed. Rafe shot a sharp question about who was caring for Sylvia, and Lathe snapped that Amelia was watching over her. Wraith knew Amelia had only stepped in because Lafay begged her on bended knee, and he couldn't picture anyone better to watch over Sylvia. After examining Sylvia, Wrath's eyes flashed with a question. He traced the magic crystal disease back to the northeast, and that kind of thing didn't exist in the capital. Wraith leaned in and asked if Sylvie had ever set foot in the northeast, and Laffy shot back that she hadn't, not once since they'd met. Lafayette dropped the bombshell. They weren't blood sisters. She pulled Sylvia out of the blank fog of amnesia, and with no family left, took her in. Wraith listened intently. Lathe tossed those words off like it was nothing, but making that choice when Lathe was still so young had been anything but easy. With Sylvie's memory wiped clean, every clue points back to the northeast. She probably hails from there. Lafayette swore he'd never forget it and snapped, "Where's Wraith's house?" Rafe lived in a tiny wooden house tucked farther down the road they traveled, a rare forest dwelling where his mentor raised him, until one day she vanished without a trace. Wrath's gut twisted with worry over where his mentors had vanished. Out of nowhere, they stumbled on an injured man slumped among the trees. Wraith hunched over and tended his wounds, and the man, eyes fixed on the shadowed tree line, blurted, "Are we heading into the forest?" The instant they confirmed, he blasted out a blunt warning, "Don't do it." He gasped that a blood wolf had attacked him, and he'd barely escaped with his life. Lathe leaned in, demanding every detail about the monster. They thanked the man, then unleashed the crucial reasons they had to keep moving forward. Soon they barreled into the forest Wraith called home. They surged forward, feet pounding the path. Monsters swarmed the road, making carriage travel suicidal. To stay discreet, they slipped forward like shadows, and Wraith hissed to Lathe that beasts might be nearby. As an S-ranked adventurer, Lathe bristled with electric focus, every muscle coiled for battle, her eyes slicing across every shadow. Halfway to his house, no monsters had shown their faces, but Wrath's gut roared that one would leap out any second. A freezing shock hammered his skull as Laffin's warning ripped through the air just before he died. Moments before the explosion erupted. Wrath snapped aside, the C-ranked blood wolf strike tearing through the empty space where he just stood. It wasn't alone, they were trapped in a ring of enemies, even as danger crackled all around them. Wraith kept a calm mask, admitting he was used to this, while terror churned beneath his ribs and every nerve screamed to flee. Lathe caught the raw, desperate urge to flee trembling in his voice. Unleashed a savage assault on the wolves. She hatched the plan. Wraith would bolt and disappear while she pinned them down. She snapped that even she couldn't fight off so many while shielding him. Wraith, worried for her, was removed. Tearing the walls apart with each slash, she felt her strength ignite into a fierce roar. He bolted, uselessness burning in his veins, as he frantically searched for a hiding spot while Lathy tore into the blood wolves. Shame gutted Ray as he cowered. More blood wolves exploded into view. You bolted, sprinting away from them. They swarmed in droves, tearing across the ground like living lightning. He slammed back a potion brewed to repel animal-type monsters. Certain it would work, he hurled it. The walls inhaled it and then went utterly still, and launched back into pursuit, hot on his heels. He ripped forward at full speed, rage simmering as the potion fizzled, and concluded their sense of smell had been dulled. He hurled the potion into their eyes. A homemade dye primed to slam into their eyes and blind them, only temporarily. He hurled a blinding, deafening device that crushed their hearing and snuffed out both sight and sound, leaving them staggered and disoriented. Exhaustion clawed at his limbs, but urgency burned through him. He had to find Lafay. A crash burst from the tree. He leaned on it, and the sudden jolt startled him. Wolves down, Lafay launched into a relentless hunt for him. A suspicious sound ripped the air. They tore toward it, every instinct howling that trouble waited. Wraith spat curses at his rotten luck and bolted from the blazing skeleton. He deduced in an instant, skeletons feel nothing, so potions and dyes are useless, and a hulking skeleton over 2 meters tall, swinging a sword that could fell a tree, loomed terrifyingly powerful, yet fatally vulnerable to holy water. 3 vials. Wraith knew they'd barely slow it down, so he hatched a desperate new plan. He hurled something at the skeleton, and it landed, seemingly doing the job. He slapped on a compress. His agitation exploded into frantic stirring, churning out more potions. The instant Kachina touched water, it violently transformed into a relentless adhesive that clung to everything. Lafay tore through the alleys, hunting for Wraith. They spot the smoke from earlier, still snaking up into the sky. Wrath pinned the skeleton in place for a heartbeat, but he couldn't keep fighting it, and it lunged after him again. He tore himself free and raced to find Laffey. Wraith bolted away from the skeleton until its rattling faded, then ignited a smoke signal that punched up into the sky. He crushed the dye-stained fruit core and the alchemy-filled pot, squeezing them until they detonated into a choking, billowing gas. He botched an alchemy process no one tries on purpose. The theory was etched in his brain, but this was his first hands-on attempt. He slipped into the shadows to lie in wait for Laffey, even tempted to climb a tree. The skeleton's massive sword came crashing down. A single strike obliterated his resistance ring, his final defense ripped away in a heartbeat. Losing his ring and getting blindsided by that sudden attack crushed Wraith. Regret burned. He believed smarter moves would have bought him more time. His last tricks were gone, and his energy was bleeding out. Everything screamed that this was the end for him. The skeleton surged forward, arriving at the last possible second. Lathe burst onto the scene and unleashed her crush, pulverizing the creature. Laffey sprang to Frith's side to make sure he was all right. He flushed a little, and she giggled at his stubborn lack of fear. He asked if she'd lost her sword, and she snapped that she'd hurled it straight into the skeleton's arm earlier. Their jaws dropped as the skeleton snapped bone to bone, reforming itself. Laffey was doomed. She barked at Wrath to stay back, then stepped forward to face the skeleton alone. He stood stunned, certain she'd won. She couldn't vanquish it completely. The skeleton was channeling crackling, arcane magic. She hurled herself forward and smashed its magic apart with brutal force. She unleashed her fracture skills, struck him down, and Rafe toppled into her arms, cradled like a princess. He was certain he'd never marry after being hauled off like baggage by a girl like that. Lafayette snapped that their only choice was to run. They couldn't defeat the skeleton, and she asked if he knew the way to his house. Ray snapped into fierce focus. They had to grab the ingredients he needed now. He seized her hand and hauled her along as a skeleton tore after them. The skeleton slammed to a halt and unleashed a guttural growl, and Wrath stood frozen, wondering what it was doing. Then he gasped as walls of blood surged up, closing in around him. He shouted to Laffey that the skeleton was summoning more bloodwolves, and she braced to fend them off while sprinting with him clutched to her chest. A blood wolf lunged, jaws snapping and fury blazing in its eyes. She slashed it with him still in her arms. Amazement slammed into Wraith again. The moment he asked, laughter's instincts flared. He'd sensed something. She snapped, those blood walls aren't alive. Suspicion prickled along her spine. The skeleton was puppeteering corpses, and she jabbed a finger at their writhing shadows. Wraiths realized magic was puppeteering them. It was necromancy. Necromantic magic puppeteered the corpses, which explained their lack of smell, and for Wraith it was the first time he'd ever seen a skeleton wield magic like that. Magic among monsters was nearly extinct. Only a few, like dragons with their devastating breath, could wield it, and manipulating corpses was a grim skill reserved for the realm's most powerful mages. If they ranked that skeleton, it'd rocket straight to the top. Rafe demanded to know what they'd do. Latte snarled they had to fight it, shoved him toward his house. Grab what you need. She roared, planting herself to hold the enemies back with his front door only steps away. They sprinted full tilt and finally reached their destination. Lackey set him down. He darted inside as she launched into a brutal fight with the wolves. Dust smothered the house after years of abandonment, and relief crashed through him when he realized it hadn't been destroyed. Down in the basement, the Wraith's materials waited. Everything lay pristine. Temptation roared in him, but he snatched only the essentials and walked away. Those materials, which he'd gambled his life to gather, would prove invaluable later. A sword flashed, yanking him straight back to the day his mentor sent him out to gather ingredients. He remembered the beating, how he swore he'd nearly died, and how he screamed at his mentor for almost getting him killed. She tossed him a casual hello, ignored the dust caking his sleeves, then snapped at him to store the ingredients properly. He staggered back, battered and bruised, disbelief exploding at her words, and he hadn't even heard the undead were there. She kept her mouth shut, then flashed an innocent grin and swore she knew nothing about the undead. She scoffed that undead were child's play, one splash of holy water and they'd crumble. Wraith barked that he couldn't use magic like she could. If he tried, the power would tear him to pieces before he could even splash the water. She taunted he'd end up a fillet, not minced meat, meaningless if his life was snuffed out. She thrust a gleaming sword into his hands, presenting it as a gift. She deforged it ages ago and never swung it. When it finally met the undead, the blade tore them apart like lightning ripping through fog. Wraith couldn't swing a blade, Snapping back to the present, he snatched the sword, hoping his unreliable mentor might finally offer some guidance. His fingers tightened on the hilt as he weighed and trusting the sword to Laffey. He'd barely crossed the threshold when the house behind him groaned and toppled into a choking cloud of dust. Lathe barreled over, panic clawing at him as he checked if he was okay. Wrath exploded at her, rage ripping through his words about the ingredients he'd fought tooth and nail to gather. He thrust the sword into her hands, claiming it could slay their enemy, then confessed in a thin, uncertain voice that he hadn't forged it. The sword felt feather-light in his hand. When Lackey slammed it into a skeleton, bones splintered under the blow. The skeleton couldn't regenerate, its bones flat out refused to regrow. Her blade bit hard, the skeleton recoiled, bones clattering as it fled. Determination blazing, Laffey launched himself onto it before it vanished and snuffed it out. Wraith gaped, Lathe brushed off the praise, insisting her S-rank wasn't for nothing and crediting the victory to the sword forged from the skeleton's own bones. The instant the fighting stopped, a massive magic gem burst forth from the battlefield. These gems are crystallized magic itself, the beating hearts of arcane devices, pried from mighty monsters where they pulse like living batteries. Wrath had never laid eyes on one before, but he'd always burned to put one to work in his alchemy. Those gems were near mythic and rarely traded, so this was his first real shot at snagging one, and claiming both the gem and the ingredients they'd been hunting felt like a thunderous victory. Grief smashed into wrath. The precious materials he'd buried in his ruined house were gone. A gutting, irreversible loss slammed into them. After crushing the skeleton and snatching their target ingredients, they tore back toward home. 2 days after Sylvia's collapse, Laffey and Wraith thundered into the capital. The clock screamed, only 5 days left to treat Sylvia. Lathe darted to check on her sister Amelia and Sylvia, finding them both fast asleep. Rafe plunged into brewing the potion while Lackey knelt to tend her sister. Magic was crystallizing through Silly's body. Wraith hatched a plan to brew a potion from monster ingredients to siphon that energy away. Vito's monster loomed. From the frozen north stalks an SS-ranked nightmare that rips the magic from its victims and devours it. Touching it siphoned your life force. Handlers lost control and were drained to death, so handling a Vito required magic isolating gloves to prevent unconsciousness. Wraith's mentor slaughtered those creatures to fuel her experiments, and he scavenged the remains she left behind. He soaked the Vito back to life, poured in fresh water, then cranked up the heat until it purified and sublimated. Medicinal brews tossed out the extras regular potions clung to. Everything depended on a single, razor-sharp sublimation. They weren't trying to boost the Vito's energy siphon. They were deliberately snuffing it out, a surgical feat only skilled alchemists could pull off. Rafe zeroed in, trusting his skill as Lafayette stood by, watching the room bloom with a ghostly glow. Lafayette stood riveted as Wrath worked, awestruck by his mastery, and suddenly the whole thing snapped into focus. They thrust Sylvia's treatment squarely into his hands. After a whirlwind of breath-stealing chaos, the potion finally shimmered. Sylvia had to swallow it. She slept so Wraith wouldn't jar her awake. He planted himself at the table and stole a few hours' rest until dawn. He snapped awake at dawn, snatched the potion, and sprinted to Laffey. He locked eyes with her and barked, "Where's Amelia?" And Lathe shot back that Amelia had just gone home after tending to Sylvia. He announced to Laffey that he'd finished crafting the potion. Joy welled in her chest until tears brimmed in her eyes, and together they knocked on Sylvie's door and swept into her room. Ones plastered Sylvia's body like a second skin. Latvian Wraith bolted to her side and unleashed a Wraith. Wraith's eyes hardened as he scanned her. This sickness was sprinting past every estimate. He shoved the potion into Sylvia's trembling hand and barked, "Drink it." She poured every ounce of herself into it, but the wounds refused to vanish. Laffey's voice cracked with alarm as she demanded, "What's wrong?" And Ray 3 grinned, steady and certain, swearing the potion would work. "Move deliberately, results take time, so don't panic if nothing shows up right away." Wraith barked at Sylvia to keep her magic sealed until he gave permission, then unleashed his scanning skill and watched her magic settle into a steady pulse, proof the potion had worked. He flashed a broad, relieved grin, announced her life was no longer in danger, and urged them to rest and take it easy for the day. Relief slammed into Lathe the moment Wraith spoke, worry for Sylvia still gnawing at them, and their legs folded as the pent-up tension finally snapped. The instant Wrath left, they erupted into wild, triumphant cheers. Contentment washed over him for the day he'd used Laffey's place. He realized he needed a proper space to lay out and organize his ingredients and brew his potions. The Inweraith state strangled him with its restrictions. That cramped space might prevent him from treating some patients effectively. He hungered for a vast workspace, so his frantic work wouldn't disturb a single soul. He drifted into Daisy's shop, every move edged with distraction, like his mind had already walked away. She leaned forward and asked, "What's on your mind?" He replied, voice cold and calm, marveling at how peacefully her shop fell. Just days ago, he gambled his life scavenging materials in the forest, hunted down by a towering skeleton and snarling blood wolves. Daisy's pulse leapt. Could that clattering skeleton be the very monster that ambushed the adventurer the Wraith had saved? Shock ripped through him when Guildrovers reported 2 people had spotted a giant skeleton in a forest that was supposed to be monster-free. Nothing about it made sense. Daisy demanded the skeleton's fate. Wraiths barked that they'd crushed it. They pinned almost all the credit on the adventurer and him. Daisy snapped, "Who is it?" Her gaze slammed onto the skeleton. It had to be at least a plus rank. Wrath dropped the bomb that Laffey was with him. Daisy's jaw hit the floor. She recognized Laffey as the youngest S-ranked adventurer. Daisy's jaw dropped. Wrath already knew someone that renowned, and he'd been in the capital less than 6 months. By the next day, Soviet had rallied, clearly much stronger. Her magic circulation surged back to life, and she stood fully healed. Sylvia flung herself into Wraith's arms, hugging him tight and gushing frantic thanks. Wraith exhaled, relief washing through him as he told her everything had worked out. Wrath announced the guild was buzzing with talk about the skeleton they just fought. Sylvia burst out that morning. She'd been handed a summons to slay a monster lurking in the very forest near the capital they'd just visited. Wraith's jaw dropped when the request explicitly named her. She revealed the client was the head of the Radium family, one of the 4 great noble families. Ruth's eyes snapped to him. She knew that man. Between raucous laughs, Sylvia bragged she'd already slain the skeleton. That blood wall could still be lurking nearby, and it's already plotting to drag the skeleton incident straight to the guild. Ruth lunged to join her. She needed the magic gem as proof of the defeat, and Sylvia wanted to come along. The 3 surged toward the guild, Wraith's gaze devouring the city's buzzing array of shops, and they promised to show him a weapon shop next time. They stopped outside a jewelry store as Sylvia stood transfixed, admiring a necklace meant for Laffey. Wrath rifled through the accessories, hunting a replacement for his broken ring. Sylvia, hunting for a gift that might heal her, locked eyes with him and asked if he wanted anything. Sylvia's smile hit like sunlight, impossible to refuse, so Ruth whipped out a ring. He nearly picked something else, but she insisted on the ring. Sylvie said a necklace wishes for safety, while a ring carries something far more personal, and the admission painted her cheeks bright. Gifts in hand, the group burst into the guild, where Amelia had gone. I erupted with joy when I saw Sylvia, radiant and bursting with health. They flooded Amelia with gratitude for her care. Their close bond ignited a warm fire inside Wrath. Amelia sliced through the silence and called out, "Lappy, are you here for the monster request?" Laffey confirmed they'd slain it, and everyone scrambled through the forest, snatching the ingredients to heal Sylvia. Amelia gaped, mesmerized by their feat. Wrath brandished a pulsing magic gem he'd pried from the skeleton. The wreckage screamed that only an S-ranked adventurer could have felled such a monstrous foe. Amelia, aware of Lade's crushing power, warned her not to overexert herself. She examined the gem, declared it genuine, and reduced the whole thing to a simple plan to deliver it to the Radium family. The reward would be waiting in 3 days. Lappy slammed the entire reward into Wrath's hands, brushing off Wrath's frantic protests. She swore her actions were for Sylvia's sake, not for profit, and unhesitatingly handed Wrath the reward for slaying the skeleton. Ray Threllanted froze, 200 glittering gold coins swamping him. People still clamored for him to open a shop. While running the shop, he shrugged off every challenge and never once found the work daunting. Wrath huddled with Daisy, then made the call. They'd build a workshop instead. To an alchemist, the workshop was a sacred sanctum, a prized refuge where they plunged headfirst into feverish, uninterrupted experiments. Wrath hungered for that sanctuary. In the forest, his experiments were tucked in a subterranean workshop, while the capital's relentless bustle and empty coffers yanked him away from his craft. Now flush with cash, he could erect one. He burst into Daisy's shop and slapped his workshop plans on the counter to share them. Daisy leaned in, her eyes sparking with curiosity at his sudden decision. Wrath announced his new fortune would finally let him chase the dream and begged her help. She had the connections, and clueless about skilled craftsmen, he turned to the ever-sourceful Daisy for guidance. Daisy's cheeks flamed with flattery when she realized Wraith's master had personally forged her own workshop, an almost unheard-of feat. Daisy leapt in, vowing to hook him up with top-tier talent and throwing her hat into the ring to join the project. Wrath was blindsided when she stepped in. He'd already picked someone else to help build the workshop. Daisy's mood curdled into shadow as she shoved her help at him, swearing it was for his own good. Wraith, unnerved by her withdrawn, reclusive air, hesitated and couldn't argue. Worried about leaving her shop unattended, Daisy shoved him forward and snapped that she'd already closed up for the afternoon. As they strode on, Daisy pressed him for who Wrath had in mind, and he dropped the name, Sylvia Laffey's sister. Daisy, unfamiliar with the woman, snapped, "Are you insane for considering calling an S-rank adventurer?" Wraith barked back, "It wasn't my idea." When he asked about the workshop builder, Daisy snapped, branding them a full-blown eccentric. Wrath barely flinched at the eccentric spectacle, knowing Daisy made every oddity familiar. I sprinted up beside her, and we stood before a plain, ordinary house. They rapped on the door, and a beaming woman flung it wide. She barreled into Daisy, hugging her with wild excitement as Daisy demanded to be let go. Wrath gaped at her odd behavior, and Daisy snapped, "Stop." The woman, tears streaking her face, poured out a fierce, aching love for Daisy. Daisy met it with a cold, unfeeling rebuff. Her gaze snapped to Wrath as he announced himself. She was Nicola. Her gaze screamed she'd already heard of him. Wrath burst out that he wanted to build a workshop and dropped that Daisy had put her forward for the job. Nicola's grin cracked wide when Daisy backed Wraith's request to create a workshop. She shoved a sheet of paper forward and blurted, "Is this your first?" Wrath snapped that he'd pulled one off before and knew the ropes, and this time he wanted to set it up in the two-story building he lived in. He slammed a prototype on the table and declared the workshop must be built around it. His budget stood at 200 gold coins, though he could stretch it a little if needed. Nicola's eyes flared at the budget. It cracked open a dozen possibilities, and she jabbed at Wraith with one sharp question. "What are you going to use the workshop for?" Wraith proclaimed it would be used mainly to brew potions and fashion magical devices. Then he brandished a glowing magic gem before her and asked if it could be useful for the workshop. Nicola's eyes lit up. She beckoned Wraith to show her the workshop site and said they'd settle the price after she'd seen it. They waited as she snatched a few items into her pack. Wrath cut in and asked Daisy how she knew Nicola, and Daisy grinned, saying they'd met when she was an adventurer and had stayed close ever since. Wrath's jaw dropped when he discovered Daisy had once been an adventurer. Nicola returned, and they strode onto the sprawling site of the Wraith's planned living workshop. Nicola scoured the scene, vowed to draft a precise quote, and flagged the magic gem as a line item. She asked Wraith if he wanted to use it to store magical energy, and Wraith froze. Magic gems were usually slotted into devices, not stashed as batteries like Nicola had proposed. She pointed out Wrath's workshop was cluttered with magical devices that constantly ate up power, so bottling energy into a gem would let him activate any tool instantly. Magical devices crave massive power, so stockpiling a reserve would let us tame the ones that siphon it non-stop, Wrath agreed. Nicola announced they'd kick off the workshop setup in about a week. Her voice snapped, slicing the air. She demanded to know about Wrath's relationship with Daisy. Ice crawled down Ray's spine and he bolted, desperate to escape the sudden electric tension. Nicola clamped a hand around his throat before a word escaped him, and Daisy jumped in, insisting they were tightly bonded while skipping the fact that Wrath was her teacher, then added that he'd been teaching her all sorts of things. Wrath trembled, pulse spiking as it hit him. Her explanation sounded wrong. Nicola, pale as bone, marched up to Wrath and snarled that if he ever harmed Daisy, he'd make him pay. Wraith swore he'd never do such a thing, and Nicole melted on the spot as relief surged through her, and she flashed a smile like nothing had happened. She swept Daisy into a fierce hug and kissed her, announcing she was heading home as Daisy squirmed and batted away the onslaught of affection. Moments after Nicole left, Wraith's eyes darted. He had no idea where to look. He pressed Daisy. Did she really want to come back next week? Daisy's resolve was steel. She stayed committed. She laughed, admitted she couldn't tame Nicola's smothering affection, then thanked Ruth for the day. Next scene, Wrath and Lathe strode shoulder to shoulder as she leaned in and fired. "What are you shopping for?" He grinned and vowed to snap up any eye-catching piece for the workshop's interior, then laughed and prodded for an update on how the build was coming along. Wraith shot back that it would all come together, then whipped out a flower clip and they draped it over Laffey. Her cheeks flamed as she snapped that she couldn't pull off anything that feminine. The shop owner zeroed in on Wrath and Lathe, grinned, called out, "Shopping day," and slapped a discount onto their bill. They wasted no time denying the rumors. They weren't dating. Rafe tore through the stalls, snatching whatever he wanted while Lathe waited for him to finish, and he asked if Soltia or Lathe wanted anything so they could grab ingredients for dinner. Lathe shrugged, insisting she had no specific preferences, but Sylvia lit up for sweet foods. When Wraith blurted that girls Sylvia's age loved sweets, Lacking couldn't help but point out how ancient he sounded. Daisy's similar words crashed into Wraith, flooding him with a quick, bitter sadness. They decided to make dessert too and raced to Wraith's kitchen. In the kitchen, they plunged into preparing dragon meat. Wraith lunged to help, muscles burning as he fought to carve through the stubborn, unyielding slab of meat. Laffy shoved a cleaver his way and snapped, "You chop the vegetables, I'll tackle the dragon meat, that stuff's brutal to cut." Against all odds, they fought through the chaos and whipped up a mouthwatering meal. The soldier's eyes flared at the sight of the spread. He lived for creamy, dairy-rich dishes. They couldn't wait to try Wraith's dessert, then dove into dinner and traded easy, casual banter afterward. Laffey and Wrath tore through the kitchen dishes, and Laffey grilled Wrath about his workshop, asking if it was open any day. He described it as a workshop, bristling with enchanted devices and shelves of ingredients. She pictured bizarre curios and odd contraptions piled everywhere. This was his workshop. After scrubbing the place spotless, they bow and thank their hosts for the meal, then head home. A week later, they come back to take them home. Wrath strode up to Nicolai and Daisy and declared he'd brought backup Sylvia. Sylvia stepped forward and introduced herself as shyly. Her cuteness hit Nicola like a tidal wave, almost knocking him flat. Nicola's arms ached to sweep her into an embrace, but she bit the urge back. This was their first meeting. A sharp envy coiled in Daisy as she measured herself against Sylvia. Sylvie confessed Wrath had asked her to help, but she had no idea what her role was. Nicola chuckled, eyes alight, and assured Sylvia she didn't have to slave away. "Daisy and I will cover for you." Daisy strode up to Sylvia, hope blazing in her voice, and said she wanted them to work well together. Sylvia reeled, undone by Daisy's irresistible charm. Sylvia leaned in and whispered to Wrath, asking about Daisy as her eyes lit up at how cute she was. Ray blurted out Daisy, and that Daisy was older than Sylvia. Panic slammed into Sylvia, and she snapped into stiff, overly formal speech. With everyone present, Wrath leaned in and asked Nicolette if the preparations were ready. She clutched her magic bag to her side and assured him every last thing was inside. The bag bent space, swallowing a cavern inside its slim shell, a priceless relic forged by advanced spatial magic, not something merchants sell. Nicola confessed a mage friend pulled her through the collaboration. Wraith froze at the suggestion they make something together. He had no clue. Never done this before, he eyed a mage who could help, imagining they'd conjure something awe-inspiring together. The shift should have begun, but Sylvia's focus shattered the moment Nicola stepped into the room. In the workshop, Nicola tore open her magic bag, plucked out furniture, and snapped each piece into place with crackling spatial magic. Wraith watched, jaw-dropping, clearly impressed. Sylvia smirked and asked if he was really impressed, scoffing that this sort of magic was run-of-the-mill for mages. She warned that spatial magic was brutal, no simpler than her own, maybe even tougher. A bolt of inspiration hit Wraith. He turned to Sylvia and asked, "Want to make a magic bag with me?" Sylvia's grin erupted as she nodded, excitement setting her eyes ablaze. Wraith's heart exploded with glee at the thought of owning his very own magic bag. They plunged into brewing potions, while Nicholas assembled a humming arcane contraption to stash their ingredients. Similar ingredients demand precise temperatures and humidity for storage. Nailing that is the make-or-break step before any workshop. They split the tasks and charged into the work, moving as one unstoppable force. Fresh off finishing his first task, Wraith barreled into the second, then his gaze snagged on Daisy and Sylvia, locked in a lively conversation. Sylvia was deep in discussion when Daisy snapped her back to the moment, barking for them to funnel every spark of magic into the skeleton's magic gem. Nicola toiled alone, piecing together the magical device, while Sylvia at the mage poured crackling power into the gem. Nicola, idle and stung by uselessness, ripped into planning the workshop setup for tomorrow. As they geared up to craft the enchanted devices, Nicola slammed his palm down and shot out, "Ideas hit me." He shot up from his seat and blurted out his concept, eyes blazing to share it. He unveiled the magic circle he'd crafted, and Nicola snapped to attention, transfixed. Daisy and Sylvia froze as bafflement slammed back over them. Sylvia gaped. She'd never seen a circle like that before. Wraith snapped, "Not for casting spells, it's for something else." Daisy snapped, impatience razor-sharp in her voice, "What's it for?" He revealed the circle was built to forge magical devices with an alchemical pen process. Infuse it with the exact spell you want, and it would transmute ordinary accessories into powerful magical devices. He plotted to siphon the magic gem's raw power into the circle, blasting it into overdrive so the circles sprang into being in an instant. Normally, magic circles burn out the moment they forge a magical device, becoming useless and forcing a fresh circle to be drawn for every single creation. The numbers screamed that a constant feed from the magic gem could lock the circle into permanence and make it reusable, but it would devour enormous amounts of energy. By sheer luck, they had a skeleton's magic gem, pulsing with the raw, roaring power of an S-ranked mage. Nicola called Wrath's idea promising, but said he needed time to study the unfamiliar circle. Daisy and Sylvia stood baffled, eyes wide, as Wrath and Nicola concluded their discussion. Wrath blurted an apology for leaving them out, locked eyes with Sylvia, and asked if she'd help craft the magic bag they'd been planning. He pressed her to enchant the bag exactly to Nicola's instructions, dread gnawing at him over the risk of failure. Rafe snatched up the essentials: veto fluid, a bag, and a brush. He slashed the mana-drenched fluid across the bag and etched a one-of-a-kind magic circle onto its surface, and since it was his first attempt, every stroke fought him. Daisy and Sylvia bided their time, poised like coiled springs, every breath a quiet countdown. Sylvia surged forward and blasted spatial expansion magic onto the circle. She barked for everyone to step back and plunged into the ritual. They stepped back, breath held and hearts pounding, unable to tell if it had worked. Wraith put the bag to the test. The interior opened into a jaw-dropping, cavernous expanse. Victory seemed certain, but Wraith's instincts screamed that something was off. Out of nowhere, liquid gushed out of the bag. A whirling globe of energy blossomed, swelling into a spinning spherical vortex. Daisy latched onto Wraith's foot as the sphere's pull yanked them inward. Sylvia unleashed a pulse of magic that slammed the absorption to a halt, stopping it cold and sparing everyone from harm. The expanding sphere erupted, ripping open the house's walls and shredding every nearby object. They sank to the ground, lungs burning, and they locked eyes and snapped to a unanimous decision: contact Niccolo, it was the best play. Sylvia's magic roared to life exactly as intended, but the fault lay in the magic circle Nicola had drawn. It was his first attempt. He probably botched the markings that were supposed to lock the bag's spatial expansion inside. The faulty circle split apart, and the expansion ripped outward in a blistering explosion. It dove straight into assessing the damage, racing into the workshop's heart, the largest room right by the entrance, which cradled the magic gem and most of the enchanted devices. Other rooms were probably wrecked too, and guilt clawed at Wrath for causing the chaos. Nicola burst in, declared the original plan dead, accepted the situation, and vowed to use every one of them. He poured every last coin into forging the finest workshop imaginable. Days later, crews hammered the wreckage back into place and erased every trace of the damage. The workshop's exterior slammed into view, bold, gleaming, impossible to ignore. Curiosity gnawing at him, he shoved the door open to see if Nicola had fulfilled his request. He stepped inside and his eyes locked on permanent magic circles, forged from mithril, a rock-solid, highly conductive metal, siphoning power from the magic gem and supercharging the production of magical devices. They weren't finished yet. Nicole revealed the circles still lacked their final markings, and she'd fashioned 5 modest-sized ones to keep the space from choking on clutter. Mithril channels magic like a thunderbolt, perfect for the job, yet it's painfully rare and a nightmare to work with after the challenges. Daisy had declared it. Nicola's skill was nothing short of breathtaking. She warned charging straight into mithril was brutal, so she pressed a custom mithril tool into his hands. When he finished, she'd snap the circuits onto the magic gem. Anxiety coiled in Wraith. Determined not to repeat his last mistake, a veteran of magic circles, he traced each ring with surgical, painstaking precision. The moment arrived for Nicola to connect them. Nicola lunged and locked them together. She prowled with the gem, baffling Wrath. Curiosity burning, Wrath leaned in and asked what she was doing. She said she was channeling magic to forge the circuit, and when he asked to watch, she agreed. He fired the question at her: had she been an adventurer like Daisy? She flashed a teasing grin, suggesting Daisy might have hinted at a love story, and he snapped back, nope, that never happened. Nicola revealed she used to hunt Daisy down, the same Daisy who flat-out refused to join any adventuring party. Nicola fell head over heels the instant their eyes met. When Wrath asked why she'd quit adventuring, she gave him the reason. She dove headfirst into crafting, driven by someone who set her soul ablaze. She became the fierce guide, lighting the path through every turn of her crafting journey. She gleamed with outward beauty and burned with razor-sharp intelligence and ironclad determination, the very person Nicola longed to emulate. Wraith pressed for her name and she dropped the bomb: Luria, the kingdom's legendary hero and the very mentor who trained Wraith. Wrath, Luria's own disciple, snapped at Nicola, insisting she stop putting Luria on a pedestal. Nicola's jaw dropped. She caught wind that Luria had a charming apprentice, so she pressed him for Luria's whereabouts. He just shrugged. He didn't know. Even as his words suggested otherwise, Nicola swore he'd find a way to meet Luria again, and Wrath, sensing the steel in his resolve, didn't push. They'd finished the job. Nicola tuned the magical devices until every rune sang true, and Wraith put them through a live trial. It passed flawlessly. She urged him to reach out the instant anything left him unsatisfied. She'd leap in with whatever help he needed. Daisy and Sylvia barreled in, drawn by the commotion, and Wraith practically vibrated as he cried out that the magic circles were up and running. A triumphant chime burst forth, proclaiming his workshop complete at last. Luffy caught wind of the news and shot, "How's the workshop?" Wraiths beamed, "Fantastic." Amelia intercepted him. She'd been waiting to meet him, and shoved something into his hand he assumed was a letter, then snapped, "It's not a letter." The royal family slammed down a direct order. Next chapter, Luria steps into the story. With a drink in hand, he dueled a towering behemoth, casually sipping between strikes. She bolted the instant she heard Wrath had arrived in the capital. At 7, Wrath barreled up to Luria and blurted, "How did you get so awe-inspiring?" She lined in, eyes blazing, and demanded the single truth at the heart of alchemy. He snapped, "Knowledge." Luria fired back, declaring something mattered far more than knowledge. "Practical experience." She shoved him face to face with the monster and commanded him to snatch the fruit lying by its nest. He made it look like child's play for a 7-year-old, even as terror ripped from his throat. It was all a dream. Wraith jerked awake and toppled off his chair. He'd fused his home and workplace into one, living there almost nonstop, and started collapsing into sleep during all-night work. Now life felt effortless next to the merciless crucible of his mentor's training. A tiny twinge of worry pricked him the moment he saw the royal family's letter. The letter slammed down like a gauntlet, a blunt summons to the royal castle in 3 days. Wraith wouldn't dare refuse the royal family's call, but dread coiled in his gut because they gave no clue what they wanted from him. Her face in the dream hit him out of nowhere, chilling him to the bone. He hadn't thought of her once since he set foot in the capital. For a heartbeat he feared his mentor might drop by. Then he crushed the thought as overthinking and plunged into his morning routine before heading out to shop. Every morning he burst into his workshop and, with a flash of alchemy, shoved the plants into sudden, rampant growth. A grin cracked across his face as he pictured those plants when they were nothing but puny sprouts. He lined up his tools, snapped the case shut, and charged out the door to hit the shops. Ray snatched a letter from his mailbox. It was from Looms. Shock slammed into him, leaving him speechless. He blinked hard and checked again to prove he wasn't dreaming. It came from the Looms. He barreled over to Lafayette and Sylvia, demanding an emergency meeting about a terrible situation. Lath shot out, "Is this about the royal family's request?" And Wrath's reply landed like a blade, "No, it's far worse." The girls erupted in squeals, then Wraith dropped the bomb. His mentor was coming. They erupted into laughter. Lafay hesitated, torn. Should they plan a party or not? Wraith panicked, snapped that he had to flee at once. Terror clenched his chest because she knew his address, and he feared his peaceful life would be wiped away. Lafay snapped at him to relax. He clocked his mentor's strangeness and wondered if he really had to go to such extremes to dodge her. Wraith insisted reunions only warmed hearts when mentor and disciple actually cared for one another, and his mentor was a disaster, awful and hopelessly clueless. Lafay declared his mentor wanted to see him. He'd go meet her. Wraith shot back that living with her meant he cooked every meal, scrubbed the place spotless, shouldered every load of laundry, and stared death in the face at every turn. He refused to return to that nightmare. Luria burst into the room and greeted Wraith. Her aura slammed into the room, forcing 2 high-ranking mages to freeze and stare. Tension exploded in the room as Wraith, face aflame, stammered that he had urgent business. Luria clapped a hand on his shoulder, dropped down beside him, and shot, "It's been ages since we last met." Luria locked eyes on Lafay and Sylvia, jabbed Wrath with a sly grin and taunted, "So, are you the kind who charms cute girls?" Wrath snapped that even if anyone called them his girlfriends, they were just friends. He ripped into her for snapping at strangers, sneering that her razor-sharp attitude was why she was still single. Luria froze, a grin splitting his face as he declared, "There's something on my face," then flicked his nose. One flick and Wrath shot airborne, drifting away like a weightless feather. Luria's strength slammed into her like a freight train, freezing the girl in stunned silence. Lath snapped, "Who are you?" Luria's whole demeanor snapped into steel as she declared, "I am Wraith's mentor, the legendary Mimi." Lath and Sylvia shot back their names. Wraith demanded why she'd come to the capital, and Luria, like an acquaintance, explained how to request a task for her. She snatched the royal family's letter out of her clothing. Shock slammed into wrath when she discovered she actually had ties to humans. Luria confessed her blood tied her to the royal family, yet she despised their fallen hero who carried her nickname, all while loudly praising Rui. Sylvia's eyes snapped open and she blurted, "Am I Luria James, the one who repelled the dragon horde that stormed the capital and helped rebuild it?" Minnie's jaw dropped when a young girl recognized her as the greatest mage. Wraith spun to Laffy, demanded if it was true, and Laffy nodded, confirming it. Luria lobbed an outrageous demand, free drinks at every establishment, and Wraith, who knew Luria sneered at Coin, suspected they'd targeted the wrong person. Lath explained Luria demanded free drinks across the capital, sucking dry every bar for 3 straight days and nights, and grinding the reconstruction celebrations to a halt. Recognition slammed into Wraith. It was her. Sylvia poured out how he dragged her back from death's grip. Luria threw him a smug smirk. Wrath announced he'd received the same royal summons and pressed Luria to say if she'd accept. She snapped that it depended on the task. The letter had been maddeningly vague, only telling her to come. Secrecy ignited Wraith's suspicion. Why had they concealed details from his mentor? Luria offered to teach Sylvia magic during their stay, and she beamed. Wrath felt the warning well up, "Don't get attached," but Sylvia's bright-eyed excitement shut his mouth. He locked onto Sylvia's S-ranked venture status and knew she could storm a dragon's nest without blinking. Luria planned to kick off training tomorrow. Wrath excused himself and slipped away, and Laffy and Sylvia split off to tackle their own task. Wrath fired the question at Luria, "What now?" She had no plan, shrugged, and slipped into his wake, deciding to follow him. They raced to his workshop. Luria's new adventure burst into life. Laughter erupted. She tore into food, glasses chimed, and fun took over. Annoyed at Wraith's tardiness, Daisy snapped, "Who's Luria?" Luria stepped forward and declared her name, slicing through the silence. Daisy leaned in and asked, "Am I the fallen hero?" Luria nodded, and Daisy's piercing stare froze Luria's breath. Wrath leaned in, locked his gaze, and asked Daisy if she had time. She exclaimed she'd scored a rare ingredient. It would need way more time to process. Daisy leaned in, eyes burning, and pressed, "Luria, what is your purpose?" Luria threw herself into helping as penance for stalling her discipline, and Daisy agreed. He held aloft a rare southern herb, cooked into feasts and brewed into cures. Luria slammed a hand on the table, eyes blazing, and demanded, "How will you use this in Daisy's medicine kit?" The instant Luria confirmed they had enough materials, she plunged headfirst into the process. She warned, voice tight, that it locked in heat and killed bacteria, but one tiny slip in prepping it could trigger a sharp, undeniable stink and make it utterly unsellable. Luria bent it to her will with a single spell, confidence roaring through her veins. Daisy's eyes widened and Wraith stared in awe as Luria requested magic bottles, declaring them perfect for storage, even though Wraith was still crafting them. Luria snatched up her own bottles and, snapping her fingers, sent some and several tumbling into the room. He guided Daisy forward. She stopped dead, eyes blown wide in pure astonishment. She'd been aching for a scrap of praise, but Daisy never handed out compliments. Wrath couldn't help but note how their mentor welded alchemy to magic. Their methods clashed with his, lightning-striking stubborn stone. Daisy, seeing for the first time someone rip open space and puppeteer minds in the same heartbeat, shoved Wraith and Luria into the same dangerous file in her head. Wraith snapped, insisting he hadn't touched a drop and had already shouldered every responsibility. And her gritty, practical instincts cut through problems Luria couldn't. Luria smirked, admitting he could whip up elixirs as easily as breathing. Wraith snapped that she brewed elixirs to pay off her bar tabs. Daisy watched them spar, glanced at the bottles, and the truth hit her. They'd both been selling themselves short. The next chapter explodes open as Ruth snaps, demanding to know why Luria was trailing him. She shrugged it off like it was nothing, then declared that visiting a disciple's workshop was a mentor's duty. Ruth finally caved and let her stay because she'd already finished the day's tasks. Luria zeroed in, relentless and hellbent on pestering him. He pleaded with her not to wander off so much. Reluctant, she shoved aside her hesitation and agreed. When she pressed him about opening a shop, he admitted he was toying with the idea but hadn't decided. The moment Luria stepped inside, she shoved his instructions aside and prowled every corner, firing questions at anything that moved. She snatched up objects, swung in the hammock, and demanded to know everything about whatever caught her eye. Wrath's pulse thundered. Was she planning to stay in the kingdom? She met his gaze and nodded. Reality punched him. he'd be cooking, doing her laundry, and cleaning up her messes again. His smile snapped shut, but Luria read it as pure excitement about moving back in with his mentor. She asked for alcohol, and Wraith snapped back, reminding her how old he was. When he demanded to know where she'd been, she declared she was out gathering ingredients and visiting friends, but her translocation magic hit with devastating power and devoured so much energy she couldn't use it often. Luria, burning with curiosity, leaned in as Wrath admitted monsters had overrun his old home, and his coin had run dry, forcing him to hawk potions. Ever since he walked away from that house, life had battered him, and now his mentor's crushing demands and relentless royal requests closed in. Wraith decided to cook, but Luria refused to help. Admitting she couldn't cook, he stared, stunned that someone who commanded alchemy and magic lacked basic kitchen skills. Luria's lone cooking attempt sent Wrath doubled over with a stomachache, proving beyond doubt she couldn't cook. While Wrath tended the stove, Luria ghosted through the other rooms, every step hammering home how much he'd grown. She burst into the freezing room, the cold slamming into her like a punch, and bolted back out. A sharp suspicion that Sylvia had enchanted it, Wraith couldn't use magic, seized her, and she pushed into the final room. The last room was dark and damp, appearing empty at first. Luria's gut tightened. She sensed a thief and braced herself to confront them. Her scream ripped through the air, and Wraith bolted to her side. He found her, tears carving tracks down her face as time wore on. Bugs swarmed everywhere. He declared they were valuable. They spun one-of-a-kind threads that could withstand magical enhancements, and Wraith urged turning them into shoes and bags to lift Luria's spirits. After dinner, he implored her to help with the project. Mid-bite, he slammed the task into the conversation and snapped, "Don't talk with your mouth full." They announced they'd have to forge a magical device, and Luria's jaw dropped when she realized Wrath couldn't craft it himself. He confessed it needed magic he couldn't wield alone. She met him with fierce calm and urged him to trust his mentor. Wrath drank in her blazing enthusiasm and noted she didn't have to unleash her full power. It could raise the capital to ashes before dawn. When she asked about the project, he smirked and revealed they were building a bag that bent space to swallow and stash far more items than its size suggests. Luria's role was to tear open the fabric of space with her magic. Wraith prayed she'd dive in the moment anything went wrong. He declared her mentorship the power of 100 helpers, then revealed he'd used a brand new method to fashion the bag. The materials held threads snagged from the very bug that had sent Luria reeling earlier. Stronger than mithril, a perfect conduit for magic, nearly unbreakable by hand and built to hold a grown man's weight. He thrust the bag at her. He'd woven a magic circle right into its threads. With the bag declared bug-free, Luria dove into the process. When she finished, Wraith snapped their gaze up and asked, "Did that work?" Confidence burned in Lorien. He proved it by sliding an item inside. The bag had succeeded. Luria flashed a triumphant grin, bracing for him to fire a cheeky quip. He's utterly consumed by thoughts of her. It hit her so hard she burst into tears. A surge of boldness hit her, and she seized the moment, inviting him to join her for drinks. Wraith snapped, "You're underage," then offered juice. His excuses died on the spot. Later, Sylvie dove headfirst into her first magic class, Luria and Wraith right beside her. They asked Luria if she had any teaching requests, and she froze for a beat. Then a spark lit in her eyes as she weighed teaching Sylvia spatial magic. When Luria volunteered to teach Sylvia magic, Wraith slipped in beside them, concern coiling in his gut, and Sylvia practically hummed with eager excitement. As he hesitated, Luffy jabbed Wrath, worried, and swore Sylvia wasn't fragile. She said personal lessons from Luria, the hero who saved the city from giant dragons, were painfully rare, and lamented she couldn't teach Sylvia herself to become a swordsman. Wraith swallowed hard and asked if everything would get worse now that Sylvia was hurt, and Lathe's grim nod confirmed it. Luria shot out the plan, kick things off with translocation magic. Not just magic, cutting-edge spatial sorcery, honed to a razor's edge. She declared the challenge nothing to fear, praising Sylvia's talent, but doubt already clouded Sylvia's eyes. Laffy sneered that Luria picked translocation on a whim. Wrath agreed, spotting her impulsive streak, grudgingly conceded she could be reliable sometimes, and Laffy read that as a red flag that she could just as easily be unreliable. Luria proved translocation. One heartbeat she vanished, the next she materialized somewhere else. Sylvia exploded into applause, but betting she'd try it on the spot was wishful thinking. Celeria let Sylvia sense the magic first, clasped her hands, channeled the spell into her, and Sylvia gasped as it surged through her. Luria leaned in, pushing her to try, and Sylvia froze, baffled and helpless, not knowing where to begin. Luria snapped his fingers. In an instant, he sewed the advantage into his grasp. The crowd froze, jaws dropping as dread crawled up their spines. Sylvia ripped back into the sky. She slipped and fell straight into Wraith, who swept her into his arms and held her safe. It hit like a blow. Luria was responsible. Wraith snapped at her, then cracked a devilish grin and teased he'd slip a bug under her pillow that night so she'd regret it. Luria leans in, voice razor-sharp. Did you feel the magic while it happened? Sylvia confirmed she had, chose to practice there to cling to that sensation, and insisted staying conscious of the link between target coordinates was crucial while casting. They started with small things. Someone handed Sylvia one of Wraith's potions. She shifted it with a pulse of magic, then accidentally fired a shot. It shattered into a spray of shards, and Luria declared that despite the minor damage, the translocation had worked. No ordinary person could have pulled that off, and Sylvia only had to lock her focus on the connection. Focus is everything. Slip up and you could shred whatever you're moving. Sylvia's breath caught. What would happen if she tried moving a person? And Luria smirked and shot back they could split into. That day's magic lesson closed with a lone spell that hit the mark. Lathe demanded to know when they first met. Luria dropped the bomb. She met Wrath 7 years ago, and after a whirlwind of events, he pledged himself to her as her disciple at just 10. Sylvia exclaimed their meeting was mind-blowing, a collision of brilliant minds. Lauren dropped that she'd already known Wraith's parents. She never imagined they'd produce a child as perfectly suited to alchemy as Wraith. Sylvia blinked, confusion knitting her brow, and Wrath snapped that his parents had been adventurers who could match Luria blow for blow, but he hadn't inherited a shred of their combat skill. He wasn't cut out for battle. His rare gift for alchemy blazed so brightly that Luria claimed him as a pupil. He confessed he never would have become her disciple if he'd known her true personality back then. Sylvia practically squealed when she met Luria, and Luria's friends sidled up and murmured a secret that made both girls grin at Wrath. He demanded to know what she'd said, and she finally confessed she'd told them. He hurled barbed words, but under that armor a quiet, stubborn kindness beat. She grinned. Wraith's never missed a birthday. Every year he'd send a gift, each one a quiet proof of his kindness. That evening Wrath stormed back home and found chaos waiting behind his door. Luria clutched a bottle of alcohol to her chest, knuckles gone white. Wraith clawed through the haze, desperate to piece together what had happened earlier. Luria implored for just one bottle. She insisted it was harmless. Wraith refused, but she refused to back down, snapping that she'd helped with his magic bag. He clenched his jaw, relented, and begrudgingly allowed only one bottle at dinner. He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Luria was no stranger to drinking, yet unease clung to him. He poured out a raw apology to Sylvia and they surged forward and launched straight into cooking dinner. Later, a thunderous crash ripped through the air, yanking him into Luria's room to check if she was okay. The room where she hunched over a glass, drinking. That catapults us to now. Wraith demanded what happened, and Lafferty blurted that Luria suddenly unleashed her magic. The bottle sat pristine, but Wraith suspected she'd bent space with translocation magic and siphoned a drink straight from it while he lay drunk. Wraith conjured a ribbon of water to refill it, then told her to sit and swore he wouldn't scold her for drinking. She snapped that she wasn't drunk. Lathe shouted, "What do we do?" And before Wrath could answer, a wind tore through the room, hurling everything into chaos. It was Luria hurling spells even while drunk. Magic normally demands razor focus, yet she summoned it instinctively. The skill burned into her bones. The house teetered on the brink of ruin as Sylvia forced her magic into silence, and it worked. She crumpled to the ground. Wrath shoved a healing potion into her trembling hands to yank her back to health. He vowed he'd never let a drink pass her lips again. Luffy snapped at Wrath to keep an eye on her while they tore through the mess. Ray shot a quick, grateful thanks at Laffy, then yanked Lure Sims toward him. Wrath hatched a plan, told Sins to rest, and plunged into frantic work with Renee over a soaked, sagging fruit. He'd meant to test it first, but the clock was merciless. Lorraine had stirred up trouble for Lathe and Sylvia, and Wrath dared to hope this would serve as an apology. He unleashed a crackling surge of alchemy, and the liquid began to rumble. The mixture seemed to take. Wrath's grin split his face in triumph. He slid the soddy in last, his first attempt at crafting anything other than a potion, and it worked perfectly. He darted back into the room, stunned. The place was spotless. He unveiled his creation and explained it was a gesture of gratitude. They demanded to know what it was, so he answered by unleashing a jaw-dropping demonstration. A rift tore through the lights, and the bottle flared to life with a savage, electric glow. The girls appeared to enjoy it. Molten fruit runoff shimmers in a riot of colors that shift with every beam, while Sagi, a plant that drinks the soil's magic, spews both light and shadow. Alchemists fuse them into a breathtaking glow prized across the kingdom. The Linford family thanked Wrath, then tore out the door, called away by a direct request and urgent business awaiting them tomorrow. A towering noble house descended from a renowned herbalist who fought in a war over a century ago. Its bloodline crackles with potent magic and legendary battlefield feats. Their deeds vaulted the Linfords into the ranks of the kingdom's four great noble families. They churned out brilliant herbalists and mages who safeguarded the realm, and the eldest son, Seth Linford, was getting chewed out. His sister Elisha snapped at him for sighing, sure every sigh chased their happiness away. She begged him to snap out of it, but Seth stayed, swallowed by a stubborn gloom. Elisha coaxed a reluctant smile to bloom on Seth's face. He grinned, teased that he looked better that way, then locked eyes and asked, "Were you thinking of Ada?" Seth couldn't stop thinking about him. The silence of no news gnawed at him with relentless sorrow. Her mind snapped to it. Could this be tied to their father's earlier talk about the royal family? Seth's silence slammed her suspicion into place. Alicia stepped forward, voice fierce, telling him she wanted him to lead the family, but never at the cost of his joy. Seth shot back that he wasn't against taking the mantle, but if he stepped aside, the burden would land on Aura or his younger brother. He outclassed Seth as both herbalist and wizard, and seethed that he deserved the family's leadership more, but inheriting the territory is the only way to take over. Talent alone won't cut it, and his brilliant skills were undone by a rotten personality that ruled him out as heir. Alicia leaned in and declared to Seth that their father was eyeing him as the successor. If everything fell into place, the path ahead would be smooth. Seth snapped that if this standoff with the royal family swung the wrong way, it could rewrite the entire line of succession. A direct command from the royal family landed. Alicia hadn't read the letter's details, but she knew it had handpicked 2 people to carry out the order. Seth said he'd give it his all, then swallowed his pride and conceded Otto's skills dwarfed his. He snarled that if he were more capable than Otto, they wouldn't be trapped in this mess. Alicia scrambled to explain, but Seth cut her off and blurted, "It'll be okay." He'd find a way. Alicia prayed nothing terrible would happen. Seth flashed a mischievous grin, lobbed a playful jab her way, then strode off to see their father. Guilt gnawed at him. He'd caused Alicia so much worry. He burst into the hall and locked eyes with Idha, who smirked and tossed a sharp, mocking taunt his way. It was suggested they meet their father together, and Seth couldn't refuse, so they marched off. He couldn't risk knowing what Adam might say if he declined. As they strode, Ada seized the moment, practically shouting that this was the perfect chance to prove to their father, who truly deserved to take over the family, while Seth kept his head down and locked onto his own preparations. At the same time, in Rate's house, Luria snapped awake, tumbling from her sleeping spot and slamming onto the floor. To Wrath, she was a bug. She pressed against him, pleading for him to look after her. She tried to argue, but Raid's glare froze her in place. He snapped at her to stash her complaints and get ready to. That day, they charged straight for the royal castle. The day they received a direct request from the royal family dawned. Ray's chest tightened. He couldn't risk making a bad impression. Luria lounged, cool and unfazed. Wrath flashed a smile like a blade of ice. He jabbed the truth at her. "They're connected again, and it's all because of you." Before getting ready, Luria glared at the nagging wraith in his mind as a sudden ache for his kinder, younger self punched through him. She snapped her fingers, every muscle coiled to spring. She reached for breakfast. Wrath snapped there was no time. If she wanted to blame someone, she had to slam the blame right back onto herself. Hunger gnawed at Luria. They grumbled with every step. Ray cut her off and snapped, "How well do you know the royal family?" Luria boasted she'd slain giant dragons for them, and that bought her serious sway. Wrath saw the benefit, but she confessed they never wanted her to cut ties. They kept her tethered to exploit her. She'd fled the kingdom because staying to do their tasks would have been a nightmare, and Wrath had no idea she'd been through all that. Luria's giggle burst out, then she leveled a razor-sharp warning at Wrath, "Tread carefully, you're my disciple." She scoffed that the kingdom had surely branded her a free spirit, too untamable to pin down whenever they came calling with requests. They'd zero in on her disciple next. In other words, starting now, Ruth could be swamped as a torrent of requests begins pouring into her place. Rage flared in Wrath. He refused to be her errand runner. They crested the ridge, and the castle burst into view. Luria bolted, heart pounding at the mere chance of a meal waiting there. Wraith lunged to stop her but couldn't. She acted like a child, and the mere chance of no food would set her off. When they reached the gate, Wrath gaped up at its towering, monstrous size. Soldiers slam them to a halt after the royal family's letter is brandished. The soldiers shot out hurried apologies and hustled them inside. As they walked, Luria burst out, "Those dragons are as big as the castle." Ruth froze, stunned, when, out of nowhere, someone barreled into him. Otta sneered, spitting out that they were nothing but commoners. Rage flared in Luria as he snapped, "What's your problem? You don't even know me." Wrath's stomach twisted. Had Otto been summoned to the castle too? Otto snapped that it wasn't his fault, insisting he'd already apologized. Still, he shoved Wrath deliberately. The maids burst in, apologizing for the delay, and Wraith's gut twisted with uneasy dread. They burst into the room and found Seth and Otto already there. Confusion flared across Wraith's face. They were seated in the same waiting area as the nobles, and the man from earlier sat right there. Luria ignored everyone else, hunger gnawing at her until it consumed every thought. Seth Rose greeted them with a radiant grin and swept a tray of snacks forward. They thanked him, traded names, and pressed him for his purpose. Wrath declared he was Mimi's disciple, sent to fulfill her request. Seth's jaw tightened. Wrath wasn't acting alone. Wrath and his brother Otto were executing orders straight from the royal family. Another scoffed, sneering that nobles like Seth mustn't stoop to mingle with commoners. It would tarnish their status. Seth shot back that it wasn't his concern, then shrugged like the barb hadn't even touched him. Wraith felt the air snap with their tension, but every bone in him ached to be home. With every last prep locked down, they stood primed to surge forward. That should slam into them out of nowhere. Apologizing, Seth poured out his regret for his brother's actions. They burst through the doors, and the royal family's father barked for everyone to calm down. Luria swept Wilbur into a warm hug, beaming as she teased, "When did you start getting old?" Wilbur paused for a beat, then admitted that age was finally catching up to him. Luria snapped, "Why did you summon us?" Suspicion burning in her voice. This wasn't a call for idle chatter. Wilbur clocked that the Linfords already knew the reason, so he ripped the truth open for Luria, James, and her disciple, who were all in the dark. He had one mission: reclaim the crystal dragon, the nation's sacred emblem. Worshipped for over 3 centuries, this rare dragon forged gleaming crystals. He implored them to save it, and they heeded him, dragging it to safety. The once flawless crystals blackened and crumbled, while the dragon's massive body withered and shrank inch by inch. Luria slammed the point home. The goal was to heal it. Ruber hesitated, doubt crackling in his voice, then surged forward and swore to the king he had healed it. Luria bristled at his smug confidence and shot back that her disciple would succeed just as surely. The king gaped at Wrath's youth. Luria snapped that Wrath outshone the other young man. Wrath locked eyes with her and begged her not to expect too much, then faced the king and vowed he'd pour every last ounce of himself into the task. Luria braced, every muscle ready, and asked if this had ever happened before. The king shook his head. Never. Luria demanded every detail of the dragon's diet and habits, and the man revealed its shredded metal for food and prowled the yard and castle, always trailed by his daughter. Wrath leaned forward, eyes blazing. He had to inspect it up close. Tension crackled under the dragon's scales, every muscle coiled to explode, yet it held itself perfectly motionless. Wraith zeroed in, eyes cutting into it as he logged every twitch and flicker of reaction. The king snapped, "Did you discover anything?" Wrath insisted the dark discoloration came from microscopic metal shards lodged in the crystals, even though the dragon usually digested metals down to nothing. Wraith slammed down a theory. The dragon either failed to digest the metals or something went wrong after digestion, and its insides were jammed with undigested metal that choked its vessels. Dissolved metals that once bled to the skin were strangled by blockages. He realized the dragon's vessels had stopped, and a dangerous buildup was swelling inside. He fired off a question. Had the crystal dragon been eating metals like always? And the cane answered it hadn't. Maybe its instincts sniffed a deadly threat, sensing any more fluid would burst its vessels. To a human, the pain hit like blood vessels bursting. Sympathy crashed over Ray, and he swore he'd hunt down a cure. The king pressed him for a solution, and Wrath blurted a daring idea he'd just hatched, urging them to try it. The king nodded his permission, and Wraith strode straight toward the dragon. At first, the dragon recoiled from his touch, snapping its massive head back and hissing in defiance. Wrath hauled it into court, baiting it with a promise to help. He hurled a desperate transformation spell at the dragon, trying to force its form to shift. Unlike magic, alchemy molds what's already at hand, channeling the practitioner's influence so he might pry metals straight from the dragon's crystal. Even this power slammed into an unbreakable limit. Wraith's influence, stronger than Luria's, slammed into the dragon and simply bounced off. Ray's grin died as a cold knot formed in his gut. This was going to be far tougher than he'd imagined. Luria pressed him to switch tactics and try a fresh angle. Wrath dropped to one knee before the king, apology burning on his tongue as he admitted this was all he could do for now and swore he'd return with a solution. Before he assumed command of the castle, someone snapped a warning at Wrath: don't act on impulse. Seth burst onto the scene, intent on striking a deal with him in the next chapter. Lorien swept Seth and Wraith into the nearest eatery, hunger clawing at her. After the meal, Seth summoned Wrath for assistance. Wrath froze, wondering if Seth meant to grab the credit. Seth shook his head and said he was fine with Wrath finishing the request. He vowed to stop his brother. Rafe didn't care who finished it as long as it was done, and Seth cautioned that since the request involved the country's symbol, if it came from the royal family, anyone could have fulfilled it, but to him it ignited a personal crusade. He ripped off his disguise and announced he was the eldest son of a powerful noble house, the heir everyone expected to take the reins. Luria knew the family, renowned herbalists who seethed with envy because her alchemy outshone their craft, so her arrival was met with icy hostility. If this request went through, the family succession would fall to Seth's younger brother, a fate Seth would fight tooth and nail to prevent. He raced to broker a rates collaboration to stop this. Ray scanned the proposal, weighed every angle, then nodded sharply and accepted. Spying a golden chance to pad his shop's coffers, unlike Auda, Seth answered with gentle kindness and quiet modesty. Faith's curiosity ignited. Why was Seth so hell-bent on leading the family? Seth proclaimed that his younger sister backed his claim. He flat-out refused to hand the responsibility to his brother. Nearby voices sneered at Seth's soft-hearted motive and left him burning with embarrassment, while Wraith stood firm and declared it noble. Wrath's gaze snagged on Seth, surprisingly warm and approachable for a noble, while Seth, fighting not to seem aloof, kept wondering if he should pull back and act more reserved. Wrath admitted he'd never mingled with nobles from great houses, yet he prized kindness over titles and reached out warmly to anyone, no matter their rank. Shackled by his noble status and forced to smother his true feelings, Seth's chest burned with relief the first time Wraith treated him like an equal. They locked hands with Seth eager, sealing a daring pact to join forces. They leaned in and started plotting, and Wrath jabbed a finger at Seth, demanding, "What do you know about the crystal dragon?" Seth swallowed and admitted the brutal truth. Even nobles barely ever glimpsed the dragon, so he knew no more than Wraith. Rafe was flying blind. Luria urged experiments, but they couldn't risk it. This was the nation's symbol, not something to tinker with. The real gauntlet was pinning down exactly which metals they were. The crystal dragon refused to dissolve, and neither could those that snapped back to their original form after being dissolved. He pressed Seth, did he know any forge or foundry in the kingdom that processed molten metals, somewhere they might find a metal that flipped between liquid and solid at the slightest change. If this could meet the checklist he'd laid out, they had to race to the heart of the kingdom's molten metal network to learn more. He ripped through room after room, hunting for answers, while she only knew the one place in the city to get a drink. Ray ran through who could tame liquid metals, and then a bolt of inspiration slammed into him. Luria leaned in, eyes sharp and pressed. Do you have someone in mind? Wraith snarled that bringing someone less capable into it would only invite trouble. He plunged into brainstorming, snapping Luria's patience. She snapped, "Move now," and they tore off into the unknown. Nimi swept them to a girl who burst into ecstatic cheers the moment she saw Nimi. Her eyes refused to believe it. Her name was Nicola, yet Luria couldn't recognize her at first. Then it hit her. Nicola had been the one who nursed her through that drunken night years ago. Mortified, Wraith snapped upright and braced to bolt. He snapped that they were there, because the mission forced them to probe liquid metals. Nicola's instincts screamed. This odd disturbance couldn't be ignored, and spotting a noble and an alchemist tackling the same task lit every suspicion inside him. She rattled off several relevant spots and asked, "Are you hunting something specific?" He snapped, "Do any metals slip from solid to liquid that easily?" When his hand touched the dragon's crystals, a living heat surged from them, like blood coursing through stone. He realized if the surface was that warm, the interior had to be molten, and Nicola had just name-dropped a new liquid metal recently shipped up from the south. Wrath blurted silver and nailed it. She shot back that only a sliver ever made it in and not a single piece remained. Seth snapped that the information still mattered. He could get his family to source it. Rafe scoffed, convinced it wouldn't work. Snagging silver was nothing but a roll of the dice. Silver surfaces only in volcanic zones, always paired with a second silver-white metal that mimics it so perfectly it's indistinguishable, until the volcano sleeps and that metal liquefies, finally giving itself away. Silver-veined volcanoes teemed with restless spirits. Spirits haunted storms, rivers, and mountains, seen only by those whose magic burned bright, and they could whip volcanoes into furious eruption. Nicola's apology trembled out as she admitted she couldn't do more. Wrath cut her off, declaring she'd already been invaluable, then pressed her to scour the kingdom for any silver that remained. He dangled Lorraine's as the payoff, and Nicola's face lit up as he sprang forward to help. Wreath barked at Seth to dig through his family for some, and if that came up empty, to check whether the royal family still had any left. After 5 brutal days, every attempt crashed and burned, no success. Wrath snapped another demand for answers, but their efforts came up empty. The royal family had none left, and Nicola found nothing either. Wraith hurtled straight to the source, determined to retrieve it himself. Even with his analysis in hand, the two metals blurred into one, impossible to distinguish. He spun to Laramie and shot, "Can you cool the silver with magic?" She tossed out that it could work in a spirit-free area, then flinched, afraid to tamper with their power. She vowed she could pull it off if the spirits let her call down their magic. Wraith gaped, heart hammering. She was actually talking to them, and she warned that spirits of major natural phenomena could be intelligent, and if luck smiled, friendly. If not, they'd risk being incinerated. Options thinned to one: parley with the spirits. Wrath demanded to know if she could cut down their enemies should the spirits grow hostile, and the reply crushed them. Clarity slammed into him. He had to act. He snarled that if his mentor couldn't break them, they'd have to forge a magical device to seize victory. He specifically sought a magic circle that would supercharge magical energy, planned to forge a ring to amplify his strength, and Luria admitted she knew of no circle for that purpose. Ray slammed the truth onto the table. He dreamed up the idea while she was gone, dead sure she'd assemble it in a heartbeat. Luria snapped, refusing. The intricate magic circle was beyond her mastery, and only Wrath could command it. Wraith clenched his jaw, eyes burning, poised to kick the process into motion. Denied the power to cast, he leaned on Seth and Luria to carry out the tests. He slammed the scarlet crystal into the light. It wasn't the alchemical catalyst mages used to supercharge their magic. Seth traced the first arc of the circle, dread coiling in his gut. Wrath finished and hurled the question at the room: "Who wants to try it first?" Seth froze, hesitation written all over him. Luria volunteered. Seth froze, asking if it was safe. Wraith flashed a grin and swore it only emitted light, harmless to anyone. When Miriam touched the circle, a savage flare of light exploded into their eyes, making them gleam. In the next chapter, Sylvia and Laughing caught a blinding flash from their house and bolted inside. Wraith's magical enhancement device unleashed a light magic test that hit the three like a second sun, searing their eyes and causing severe damage. Lassie let out a breathy laugh and declared they'd been lucky to be right there. Salvia fired up the stove, whipped dinner together, and asked if they could move. At the word food, Luria clawed her way upright, hunger roaring through her veins. Seth jabbed a blunt reminder about his earlier safety warnings at Wrath. Wrath blurted an apology, but Seth flatly refused. They've put the magic circle to the test and proven its power firsthand. Seth shot back. He'd rather have never gone through that himself. Wraith unleashed abilities that shattered the limits of ordinary alchemy, feats no normal alchemist could ever pull off. Catching Lathe and Sylvia's curious stares, he strode forward and declared his name. Catching the flash on Lathe's face, Wrath burst out that he met Seth while handling a request for the royal family, and their injuries traced back to an experiment born from that job. Silly smirked and declared Wraith a magnet for chaos. Wraith locked eyes with Lafty and Sylvia and asked them for a favor. He held his breath, praying it wasn't trivial. He beckoned them to join him at Woolloomooloo Volcano. A colossal volcano loomed over the southern Delicate Mountains, worshipped since ancient times as a dwelling of spirits. Ray flashed a grateful, nervous grin, thanked them for joining, and confessed that being down to just the three of them left him on edge. Owing him, Lathe dove in to help without a second thought. Wraith's face flared red as he mumbled that having two ranked adventurers at their side steadied him. Lafay snapped the conversation toward the spirits that drenched the mountain in blood-red light. Luria hissed that lingering in the mountains at night could summon a curse fire. She stressed spirits outmatched humans, and those that took human or animal shapes were the most powerful. Her gut screamed they'd already found the spirits. No wonder the salamander spirit guarded the place with blazing fury, turning every outsider back. Wraith, Hope, and the villagers leaned in, voices primed and ready to hash it out. Fire sparked in them as they vowed to visit the nearby village. That oozed a lazy, unshakable calm. Sylvia suddenly gasped, a sharp sound ripping out of her. Cold dread slammed into Rafe. He worried something was wrong. She squealed, eyes sparkling, completely overwhelmed by that impossibly cute plushie. The other girls swarmed the plushies, while Seth and Wraith lingered on the sidelines. The seller revealed the dolls were sculpted to mirror the salamander that dwells on Lulu Volcano, and they were nothing like what Seth had pictured. The seller slammed the counter and barked, "You can't climb the volcano now, it's impossible." From the village the horizon bled a warped red. Salamander's power had turned the volcano into a merciless furnace that sucked the moisture from anyone in minutes. If they were dead set on going, they'd have to lie low and wait for Salamander to finally surrender to sleep. Wraith plunged his hand into his pocket, snapped out an object, and offered it as the solution. The seller spat a warning. Not even a conjured illusion could shield them from Salamander's power. Wraith couldn't resist. He had to test it himself. The seller cackled, flung up a crooked grin, and cried, "Good luck," as they burst out of the shop. Salamander seethed when humans dared invade his domain, utterly convinced they couldn't withstand his blistering heat. The group closed in on the volcano, not a drop of sweat on anyone, and Wrath's grin split his face. His plan was working. He pressed an impact resistance ring, and 3 magic strengthening rings into every palm. Each would flare only once and then go dark, so he warned them to pick their moments. Seth snarled, disbelief like fire, demanding how these devices could protect them when magic itself had already failed. The group pinned everything on the Wraith's plant and insisted they were fine. A sudden voice tore through the silence, bellowing that it wasn't okay. Wrath snapped, "Did anyone else hear that?" Laughing shook his head, he hadn't heard a thing. Sylvia shouted, "How far do we have to go?" And Luria snapped, "That all depends on where the spirit is." Wraith toyed with the idea of launching a reckless, random assault on the mountain to bait the spirit into showing itself. To prove his point, Wraith cracked a grin and booted a stone for laughs. A monster erupted from nowhere. Lathe snapped at him for drawing monsters, and a stunned Wraith blurted that the creature was short-tempered. The monster snapped, bristling as it denied being short-tempered. Wrath's heart slammed when it spoke. Laffy barked that monsters couldn't talk. The monster burst into a savage spin. His taunt snapped Lathe into action. She ripped her sword free and lunged forward. Lauren scanned the brutal, treacherous ground in the monster's back, armored in jagged rock. It zeroed in on exposed Billy, singling him out as the weak point. He shapeshifted, pinned the Billy in his sights, and threw Lafty a perfect opening to pummel its weak spots. Laffey seized her sword, rocketed skyward, drove the blade into the monster's belly, and watched it collapse. She landed safely, then spun on Wrath and tore into him for his reckless actions. Wraith snapped that if they pushed on like this, they could still reach the spirit. Lathe's glare burned into him, and he backed down. Lathe threw herself between him and the danger, and Wrath swallowed his protests, falling in step behind her. They pushed forward and found the road had unraveled into chaos. Luria urged them to find another path, but Wraith slammed his hand down and vowed to forge one by transforming the land. The moment he touched the ground, he shot forward. The voice slammed into him again, snarling that he must stay out of its territory and flatly refusing to let him interfere. Wraith's head snapped up as a colossal bird tore through the twilight, plunging like a living shadow. "Tell them, then scream it until everyone bolts." He locked eyes with Lathe and fired the question, could she handle it? The bird hovered overhead, stubbornly refusing to come down. Seth's gaze snapped to the emergency. He snatched his ring and chose to unleash it. Seth fought tooth and nail to bend his wind magic to his will. It seized up, tore free from his control, and teetered on the edge of exploding. A thunderous blast cracked the air and hurled Seth into a brutal, stomach-dropping freefall. He plummeted. A memory slammed into him. Before they left, he told his sister that Wrath would forge enchanted devices for them. His sister burst into laughter and declared how wonderful it was to see Seth enjoying himself so much. It beamed, without a doubt, the happiest sheet he'd seen in ages. Seth shot back that being able to chat casually with a noble made it laughably easy. Then his brother's command crashed in, spitting venom and belittling him all over again. Seth shot back that this wasn't his brother's problem. His brother was cold as stone. He sneered that Seth could debase himself all he wanted. "Keep your guard up tomorrow, watch every step." His brother walked away, and a single thought gnawed at Seth. Had he done something wrong? All hope and his will to live drained away. He mouthed apologies to everyone in his head and let himself plummet. In a heartbeat, Wraith hurled himself after him and snatched him back to safety. He lunged, snapping his arm out to seize Seth's wrist. Yanking Seth close, Wrath slammed his ring's impact resistance into action too. He slammed down but sprang back up, walking away with no major injuries. He lunged to Seth's side, grabbed his shoulder, and demanded to know if he was all right. Seth snapped, "I am." Then he rewound the moment in his mind and replayed what had happened earlier. Seth snarled that his brother had almost certainly hit him with interference magic beforehand. Ray's heart slammed against his ribs as he wondered if siblings could really sink to such murderous betrayals. But Seth, unfazed, flashed a sharp grin and coolly thanked Wrath for saving him. He snapped, "How do we escape?" Stripped of the Wraith's impact resistance ring and the set's magic-enhancing ring, the volcano boiled with monsters, so they had to sprint back and rejoin Laugh and the others. From where they stood, they could engage their ally. Wraith hesitated, but Seth's shout shattered the pause. They spilled out and froze as a colossal snake fixed them with a cold, unblinking stare. They tore away from the serpent, sprinting until death overtook them. They finally broke free from its relentless pursuit. They'd sprinted for miles, dazed and directionless as the world spun around them. Unsure of their location, ever since they plunged into the volcano hammered by relentless monster attacks. The voice sliced into Wrath's ears again, snarling that he must never interfere in its domain. He leaned in and demanded, "Did you hear any muffled voice since we arrived?" Seth just shook his head. He hadn't. Seth's question sliced the silence. "Did you hear that?" Wrath scoffed and waved it off as nothing but his imagination. Wraith's gaze snagged on a familiar red rock and he called it out, but Seth shrugged and pointed out the whole area was strewn with the same stones. Wraith scarred the rock with a clear mark, a simple precaution. They pressed on, only two. They spotted the marked rock again. Cold, undeniable proof a merciless time loop held them. They slammed into a huddle, ripping through frantic escape plans, and Wraith's jaw clenched as he imagined confronting whoever had trapped them in the loop. Being stuck turned every step into a desperate, uphill battle. Seth snapped. If spatial magic forged the loop, a handful of coordinates had to be tethered to it. Rathgren proposed they could tear those coordinates apart with a single thunderous burst of earth transformation magic. Comprehension slammed into Seth, and he lunged to force his way into Geinber. Rafe roared that true men give their all. Seth barked a warning, urging caution. An explosion ripped through the air and cut them off. The girls frantically tried to pin down where they were, and Sylvia snapped, "What happens next?" Luria's instinct screamed they were still on the volcano. The magic sitting in the wrong place told her they'd been tangled in spatial sorcery. As long as she could feel their power, they were alive. A single burning question tore through the air. Who else could wield such advanced spatial magic? Minnie locked eyes with her plushie and hissed that the salamander probably saw them as enemies, turning negotiation into an uphill battle. A thunderous roar ripped the sky as the creature slammed its claim on the land, daring any human to move a single inch. A monstrous, wind-sculpted figure exploded into existence right in front of them. The salamander spirits murmured like ember-warmed breath, swearing they'd come only to talk. The salamander bellowed, "Leave now." Luria Sims leaned in and hissed to Sylvia, "Ready your magic, be ready to unleash it at a moment's notice." Sylvie told the salamander they'd come to the volcano to claim a medal found nowhere else, then pleaded with him to free the two companions his master had trapped. The salamanders stamped their feet and vowed they'd stay forever. Lori snarled, promising he'd regret ever refusing to set him free. They were his target. Fury ignited the salamander and he lunged, but a thunderous explosion ripped through the air and stopped him cold. Confusion slammed into him. He stopped dead, and Lori's eyes widened as she realized it was real. A scream ripped through the air as something slammed into the ground. It was Wrath and Seth. Seth seethed about plunging from death-defying heights twice in one day, even though he'd fought to stop both falls. Doom would have swallowed them whole without their final ring of impact resistance. Wraith, brushing aside Seth's complaints, flashed a grin at the limbs and jabbed a finger over his shoulder at Solomon. Both sides froze, eyes wide as shock slammed into them the instant they saw each other. Wrath roared that his expert analysis and precise aid would blast them free with alchemy. The salamander scoffed, insisting no one could unleash alchemy freely in his domain. Wrath laughed, oblivious, like nothing could shock him. Even Luria had to admit that, limited as it was, alchemy might be easier to wield here than magic. She dared claim Wraith could be the lone exception. That lit the salamander aflame with fury. It unleashed another earth-shattering roar. Luria roared, "Counter my magic," as a wall of flame surged toward them. Wraith's rank erupted into a shield around them, leaving the salamander stunned. Wraith's magic-enhancing ring catapulted Sylvia's power to 10 times its former strength. Freed at last, the salamander erupted into flame and swore to turn them all to ashes. Luria unleashed her ring's power and slammed the salamander with a blazing strike. Smoke cleared after the attack, and every jaw dropped when the salamander gun gleamed from the wreckage. Wraith's eyes snapped to a tiny hammer skittering. It mimicked Sylvia's doll. It barreled toward them, and Sylvia lunged, snatching it with a delighted cry. The salamander, still trapped inside, screamed, "Release me." Recognition crashed over Wrath. This creature was the salamander. Doubt tore at him. Was this its true form? It cut through the question with a blunt confession. It had overused its power. Luria Eames snatched it, scoffed at its pitiful strength, no threat to them, and smiled. The salamander twitched weirdly for a heartbeat, then lunged, jaws snapping at her. Sens lunged to strike, but the other cut her off. When the tension finally broke, Wrath confessed they'd come to the volcano for a specific metal. They needed the salamander to lift the volcano's magic. Still defiant, the salamander spat at the invaders and refused to bow, and that was the end. Noticing the salamander's stubborn streak, they crouched, met its glare, and whispered that they needed something from the volcano. And she stepped forward with a polite smile and asked him for his help. Her earnest eyes shattered his resolve. He gave in and ordered them to leave the moment they had it. Overjoyed, Soldvia barreled forward and wrapped him in a bone-crushing hug for a green. Ray's pride crumbled as the salamander stole the spotlight, and Seth could tell he hated that smug swagger. The salamander shredded the enchantment and darted forward, leading them straight to the silvery. He roared a warning, "Don't make a single needless move." Ray hurled a sharp thanks, and together they dove in to grab the silvery. Later, Seth burst back into the Linford residence. His sister met him there, throwing her arms wide to welcome him. She snapped, "Are you injured?" He shot back that with everyone's help they'd pulled it off. When Seth pressed her, she blinked, utterly puzzled. Otter strode up and spoke to him, voice steady and eyes blazing with confidence. He turns into a blur the instant someone casts interference magic on him. He spat out a denial and put on a show of wounded outrage. Seth leaned in and pressed for an update on his request. He insisted he was making headway and told Seth to stay patient and let him handle it. Seth tensed, poised to snap back, then caught Alicia's gaze on him. She shot him a mischievous grin, fired off "What's going on?" and snagged his cheeks between two fingers for a teasing pinch. Seth snarled that this wasn't the first time he'd acted like that, swearing he'd put him in his place the moment he became Lord. Lucia lunged forward, concern flashing in her eyes as she declared, "The trouble, you're stuck going shopping with me." Seth was forced to carve out an entire day for it. Meanwhile, Wrath prowled the town, taking in every ash-dusted street and scorched ruin the volcano left behind. Lathe and Sylvia barreled back home to tackle their next task. Seth dropped in to see his sister, and Lamb plunged into drink. He jabbed Seth with a reminder about the planned silver experiment, admitting Seth's schedule was jam-packed. With Luria likely gone all night, one stubborn problem still stared him down. I burst into the women's shop. Panic roared up his spine as the women clustered, whispering about his presence. He slammed his jaw shut, shoved his nerves aside, and kept repeating he was only here to grab gifts for Lathe and Sylvia. Then a woman's voice sliced through the bustle, calling, "Is there Wrath?" She explodes into view, and you recognize Amelia in an instant. She demanded to know why he'd shown up in a place like this, and he answered with a single, cold click. He tore through the shops, hunting perfect presents for Lathe and Sylvia. Amelia blinked, confused, and he cut in. They'd pulled him out of trouble in a huge way just days ago. Disappointment flared across her face, and she shot him the question, "Have you decided yet?" Wraith confessed he had no clue what they'd find cute and begged her to help. Amelia leaped at the chance to help, and he said he was eyeing dolls as gifts, remembering Laffy adores anything cute. It was unexpected. She was a storm. Her strength and boldness put any man to shame, and Amelia snapped at him not to say that in front of her. Rat's heart dropped. Laffy had once spurned an accessory he'd offered, and he feared she'd toss the doll aside the same way. Amelia fired him a puzzled glare, convinced Lathe was too shy to accept it. She caught him in the act, using it to hide this from him, and said nothing. She volunteered to pick a doll. Relief surged through Wrath, then she plucked the ugliest doll in the entire store. Wraith squinted, his mind flipping as the doll flickered between a mouse, a fish, and a chimera, while Amelia unleashed adorable. He pushed the rabbit doll into view and asked, "What do you think?" She hesitated for a beat, then declared her choice superior and swore Lathe would adore it. Rathover clenched his jaw. People had different tastes, and maddeningly the doll appealed to him. Amelia had gone out of her way to help, so he couldn't outright refuse her choice. He hatched a plan to buy both dolls and keep the strange one from ever reaching the girls. The following day, he strode up to Lathe and Sylvia's doorstep and thrust their gifts into their hands. She let out a breathy laugh, cheeks flaming, and whispered a shy thank you. Sylvie beamed a genuine thank you and pointed out that Lathy adores anything cute but is too shy to buy it. That confession lit Lathy's face up with pure joy. Wraith beamed they loved the gifts when Laurie suddenly appeared behind him, visibly upset. She barked, "What are those hideous things?" He blurted he didn't want to buy them either, and I blurted it out there was a second gift. He grinned and offered to forge weapons instead, turning the gifts into battle-ready gear for their life of adventure, and they snapped to it, eyes blazing with interest. Wrath hadn't swung a hammer at the forge since he reached the capital, but confidence crackled through him. This was going to go off without a hitch. They plunged into forging a sword first, sparks flying, and turned to Lafay to ask what exact blade she wanted. She snapped, "It only has to be razor-sharp and indestructible." Lathe's monstrous strength demanded a weapon tough enough to match every devastating strike. If her blade survived every savage swing without shattering, Lathe would be a complete non-issue. Wraith asked to see her current blade, and she showed it. Laffy depended on brutal swordsmanship and raw strength, wielding a heavy sword because she believed light weapons never struck with enough impact. Eyeing the sword's weight, blade thickness, grip, and length, Rafe zeroed in on chalkum as the perfect material. Lathe barked that such a prized material was unnecessary, but Wraith shrugged and assured her it was fine. He rarely used it himself. He crammed charcoal and orchulcom into the furnace, then roasted the orchulcom and pried it out again and again. As the orchulcom flared, he reinforced it with a strengthening treatment and hammered it, each thunderous strike siphoning the hammer's light into the metal. Finally, he unleashed transform magic and stood back as the spell cooled. While waiting, he dove into crafting Sylvia's staff, firing off questions about exactly how she wanted it. She insisted on a staff so feather-light it never slowed her movements. Sylvia's staff couldn't just kickstart a mage's casting, it had to magnify raw magic into a surge. Most staffs were hewn from magic-conducting ores that left them heady, and Rafe eyed Mithril, but wanted to experiment with a different material. The staff's heart wasn't the wood, but the channel where magic surged through it. Instead, Wraith snubbed the usual magic gem and hatched a daring plan. He fused the raw essence of his power with pieces from his rings, then sealed the staff with a splash of holy water. Sylvia gaped as he finished the staff in a heartbeat. Wrath shrugged, saying crafting a staff was far simpler than forging a sword, so he'd whipped it up in no time. The sword wasn't ready, Wraith snapped. "Sylvia, put your staff to the test right now." He pleaded with Lathe to hold off until dawn for her sword, and she agreed. They burst outside, slime hunting to fulfill the request. A fierce wave of nostalgia slammed into Laughing and Sylvia. It had been ages since they'd hunted slimes together. When they encountered the slimes, Wraith barked, "Do these blobs resist spells or shrug off physical strikes?" Laughing snarled, warning that a lightning-fast sword slash could still slice through them. They'd come to push the staff to their breaking point, the Wrath advisors. Strain coiled in her arms as Sylvia put her new staff to the test, blasting probing gusts of wind magic into the air. Wrath's mind snapped to the image. Skilled mages could braid wind into razor blades and split monsters cleanly in two. Sylvie lunged to slice the slimes, but her blade slammed into the earth and ripped the ground wide open. The staff flared with raw power, sending everyone into stunned silence. Wraith steeled himself and charged in to gather the slimes. They realized the laughter sounded strained and uneasy. She snapped that the feeling had washed over her when Wrath asked if she still felt it. Lafayette said the sensation evaporated the instant her eyes swept the room. Sylvia feared the moment Wrath chose her someone would come after him, but they vowed to protect him. A butler burst in to report the race's movements to his master. Wrath had plunged into the forest with 2 ranked adventurers to hunt slimes. The man demanded whether Wrath had done anything noteworthy, and the butler snapped that the adventurers were right on his heels. One had detected his presence and gone instantly on alert. Making any move now would be courting disaster. The unnamed man ordered the butler to keep watch and strike at any opening, then bided his time until Lathe and Sylvia left Wrath alone. Dawn found Lafayette and Sylvia at Wraith's house. Wraith staggered under Lathe's new sword, its massive weight nearly dragging him to his knees. Lafay hoisted it like it weighed nothing and shot him a quick thank you. Wraith leaned in and asked, "Want to test it?" She shrugged it off, didn't need it. She trusted Wrath's craftsmanship. After a request to leave arrived the group. The group drifted away, leaving Seth and Wraith alone. Seth couldn't resist saying how much they'd trusted him. Wraith went scarlet, suddenly shy and scrambling to change the subject. At last they seized the silver they'd been hunting, a precious, delicate metal that demanded steady hands. They cracked the box open and cradled the silver into its new home. The light snapped out, and something slammed the wreath backward. Seth's eyes snapped open. He clocked it as a magical assault and felt other presences closing in. Unable to see anyone, Wrath's voice sliced the silence as he ordered Seth to yank the intruder out. A hooded man lunged at Seth, a sharp whistle slicing the air as he attacked. A savage kick straight to the gut sent Seth crashing to the ground. The attacker spared Seth, then zeroed in on Wrath, leaving him utterly dumbfounded. Wrath realized they wanted the silver the instant the man's hand lunged for it. Luria's voice cracked like a pistol. Freeze. And she spat that if he dared harass her disciple again, he'd count himself lucky to stagger away with only a few broken bones. The man unleashed a barrage of knives, aimed straight at the echo of Larry's voice. But many were already behind him. She slammed him into the dirt. A sharp voice snapped, "Don't you dare underestimate her just because she's a woman." She fired the question at Wrath, "What's happening?" and he sagged, admitting they were completely clueless. For now, she decided to pounce, yanking his hoodie off and ripping the mask away to unmask the intruder. Seth's eyes snapped to the man, one of Order's lackeys. Wrath snapped, "What's our next move?" Seth barked that there was little they could do. If Otto discovered his sabotage had failed, he'd only try again. They bound the man and plunged back into their work. 5 days later, they marched into the throne room and stood before the king. The king demanded whether they'd hatched a plan to save the crystal dragon, and Luria shot back, "We wouldn't be here otherwise." Wraith surged straight at the frail dragon, wasting no time. With Luria at their side, they forged a crackling arcane device to freeze the mineral so the dragon could swallow it, and the silver trapped inside its body would melt back into liquid. The dragon flared its nostrils, sampled the scent, then crushed the mineral beneath its jaws and swallowed it whole. They unleashed transfer magic, and a tar-black ichor erupted from the dragon. Luria unleashed her extractability, seized it, ripped the silver free, and sealed that gleam safely inside a bottle. Out of nowhere, the dragon's dark marks evaporated from its scales. In under a minute, Wraith's voice cut through the air, no silver left in the crystal dragon. Wraith reported to the king that the crystal dragon had purged every last trace of silver and stood fully healed. The dragon slammed to its feet, reborn with crackling power, and the king gaped, voice breaking as he thanked it. They told Seth the news, and relief hit him like a wave. Grinning, Wraith demanded an update from Seth. Seth revealed the attacker cracked under pressure and confessed. A sharp order then rang out, "Withdraw to the countryside, temporarily." He was suddenly thrust into running his family's affairs. Everything about it felt surreal. Bate demanded to know his reward, and Ray coolly asked for ingredients from the Linford family's stock. They stoked greed, yet hungrily probed the shifting rates and simmering tensions. Wrath's eyes burned with ambition as he revealed his dream, to open his own shop. Later, at Daisy's shop, she jabbed, "Why are you here?" He vowed he'd jump back to helping regularly starting tomorrow, then pressed a question. He set his sights on opening a shop and implored her to guide him through the process. Daisy sneered at first and called him foolish. She slammed a warning. Opening a shop blind was foolhardy. He had to lock down location, budget, and inventory, because just hawking potions and ingredients wouldn't cut it. The market already overflowed with them. Rafe pitched making magical devices and instantly ignited far more excitement than any other idea. To open a shop, he first had to secure a permit from the guild. Wraith bristled at the kingdom's iron rules, but his unmatched skills and hard-won feats meant approval would come in a heartbeat. Next, Wraith raced to secure materials and funding as she urged him to nail the guild's permit first. "Prove you're committed and I'll show you the rest," she promised, and he thanked her. He prowled the shop, cataloging every shelf and aisle in his head as the blueprint for his own. Noticing her lack of response, Wraith continued to browse the shop's interior. Deep in the forest, a creaking carriage thundered along, hauled by two hulking monsters. The carriage cradled a black-haired girl and an adventurer. He leaned in to check she was comfortable, and she confessed it was her first time in an earth dragon-pulled carriage. Ariel and the S-ranked adventurer both asked her out, yet Lucia, the beautiful girl, coldly spurned him. Ariel dropped that she'd meet another S-ranked adventurer, and the S-rank smirked like it was the best punchline ever. At the guild, Wraith swept up to Amelia and greeted her with a roguish grin. They burst out with a burning dream to open their own shop. "I'm seconds away from being showered with congratulations." They slammed it at him, submit merchandise samples, and pass the test. Keel strode in and they kicked off the test, ripping through the merchandise samples and rating each one. Amelia thrust Kyle into the spotlight as the examiner for new businesses, assuring Wrath the test was just a formality so he had nothing to worry about. Then she slipped away to prep the documents. Wrath's jaw dropped as she began shuffling papers while the exam clock was still counting down. Why was she already preparing documents? Kyle jumped in, echoing Amelia's certainty that Wrath would pass, raving that Wrath's samples blew right past the standards, and even asking where he could buy some of Wrath's goods. Kyle demanded proof that Wraith had forged the items and could crank them out at scale. He insisted on a live demonstration. Kayla swore a top-quality potion would take at least a day even with speed. Kyle braced to wait, but within 30 minutes the elixir was ready. In 5 minutes flat, Ray brewed a top-quality potion with jaw-dropping speed. She couldn't fathom how he'd finished so fast, muttering in stunned disbelief as Wrath tore into the exam with razor focus. Keely roared that Rafe had passed, and Amelie burst back in. Riveted, she gaped at the potion's shimmering beauty. She slammed the documents into his hands, utterly convinced he'd win. She swallowed hard, heart-pounding, and asked if Lathe liked her gift. Rafe smirked and offhandedly declared Lafay loved it, even though Lafay was lounging right in his living room. Amelia beamed as Lafayette loved the gift, while Rate's conscience gnawed at him and he couldn't reveal the truth. He slipped out of the guild like a shadow, leaving Amelia completely untroubled. With the next step looming, Seth's house crackled with strange tension as Seth handed the Wraith materials. Their behavior screamed shady business, while the ingredients looked perfectly ordinary. Wraith urged Seth to play along for a heartbeat, but Seth refused, scoffing that Wraith couldn't shoulder everything. Rafe, brimming with confidence, stuffed the materials into his magic bag and readied himself to leave. Lisha hurled herself through the doorway, slamming the door behind her as tears spilled, and she shouted, "I missed him." He clung to the belief that Wrath had struck a shady deal with a stranger. The door slammed into his face. Blood spurted from Rate's nose, but they shoved a napkin at him to stop it. Lisha swallowed her pride and apologized for assuming things. Ray swallowed his pride and owned it. He was the one to blame for standing by the front door like that. Alicia bristled and shot back that she should have opened the door more carefully. Seth reintroduced Wraith to his sister with a sly grin, sure she'd start running into him everywhere. At first Wrath saw her as a charming girl, then a sudden bolt of understanding revealed her quiet wisdom, and when he learned Seth aimed to become a lord, a smile cracked across his face. Seth vowed she'd take his place while he was away and urged Wrath to remember her. Wrath shoved the last ingredients into his pack and readied himself to leave. When Seth offered a horse carriage, Wrath smiled, shook his head, and politely refused. At home, Larry's bombarded Wrath with complaints, but he was too busy to feed her. We tasked her with sorting the ingredients. Cream's flat-out refused to work while hungry. Ruth snapped that no one who refuses to work gets to eat, and if she wanted food, she had to pull her weight. Soving launched into her work, but Wraith brushed that aside and zeroed in on the shop, scanning inside and out for detoxifies and rings that strengthened magic. The interior teetered on the brink of completion, only the exterior remained. Outside, he stepped forward and stared at the house. It looked ordinary. They hoisted a sign, but it wasn't enough. He reined in the urge to smother everything in decorations, then his eyes locked onto a smile. He unleashed his power on the potted plant, forcing it to burst into a massive blossom. Suddenly, Lafayette and Sylvia burst onto the scene. News that he was tackling the shop's exterior hit Sylvia like a call to arms. She sprang up and offered to help. He shot out that he only had interior and exterior decorating left and asked them to toss out a shop name. Lafay's jaw dropped when he refused to say his own name. She'd assumed he would, and it didn't sit right with him, so he beckoned them inside to talk instead of arguing out in the open. He yanked out paper and ink, poised to snatch every idea as it spilled from their mouths. Lathe slammed down a blunt, shockingly simple plan, alchemy. Ray sized it up in a heartbeat, a grin snapping onto his face. He liked it, and Lathe froze, stunned Ray had said yes that fast. He ripped through doubt with a snap decision, speed beat overthinking, and he genuinely believed the name was perfect. They needed a logo. Lathe confessed she couldn't draw, but she read it anyway. Great gave the green light. They just had to pore over his design and share their thoughts, and he'd been chewing on the idea for ages, only recently deciding to open a shop. When you finally unveil the finished logo to them, both of them gave the green light. Relief surged through Faith as she finished the step, and the OAS gaped, stunned at how quickly she'd done it. Lathe demanded, "You did it without us." He grinned, "Not a chance, you being here pushed me to finish in record time." Facing the task of creating the shop's products, he took the homemade bento Lafay pressed into his hands as she urged him to give it his all. Ruth exploded with joy, exclaiming he'd cherished it forever. He brewed potion after potion, relentless as he pressed onward. Armed with Seth's bounty, he churned out a flood of new products, feeling hungry. Rage boiling, he snatched Lafay's handmade bento and devoured it. Suddenly Luria appeared, despite her interruption sliced the silence. He snatched a few bites of the bento and plunged straight back into work. Adventurers would crave Grace's specialized rings, enchanted, strength-boosting, impact-resistant, each forged by his unmatched skill. They'd be the shop's signature items, and he planned to sell everyday goods he'd modified for easier use. Wraith poured his soul into crafting products, praying housewives would fall in love with how they made household chores vanish. He slapped his logo onto every item, determination blazing to turn the shop into a roaring success. Wraith flaunted the logos outside, chest swelling with pride. And just like that, how did he snap into position, ready for business? Dawn had barely broken and the shop stood empty, but confidence surged through him. Within a couple of hours, it would be bursting with customers. Convinced his high-quality products would fly off the shelves, Wrath's jaw dropped months later when they only gathered dust. For 3 days the shop lay empty. When Daisy dropped by, she found him cloaked in gloom and demanded, "Why are you so down?" Overwhelmed, Wrath crumpled into ragged sobs, railing at the relentless absence of customers. Daisy burst back into Wraith's shop, poked her head in and shot, "How's business going?" Wrath bellowed that he'd plastered a sign, revamped the shop's interior and crafted a logo. Yet no customers had come, driving him mad. Daisy shot back that sitting idle wouldn't solve anything and asked if he'd tried actually luring people in or using his reputation to promote the shop. It was obvious Wraith hadn't lifted a finger to lure a single customer. Shock slammed him and he griped about having no business while refusing to lift a finger. She snapped that the capital swarmed with potion shops, so an unknown stall with nothing unique stood no chance. She slammed him with the truth. His fame was a weapon he couldn't risk tossing aside. The plan clicked into place for Rates, so he asked Daisy about opening her shop. She said her adventuring contacts blasted the news through the guild, packing her shop and building her customer base. Rafe's grin cracked. Using his social circle to catapult his shop felt like a masterstroke, and he knew he could pull it off. Daisy grinned and said top-quality products practically sell themselves, snag a few customers to spread the word, and traction will ignite with almost no effort. She hammered home that you must hustle and hunt to reel in those first patrons. With his next moves crystal clear, Wrath dove headfirst and unleashed his plan. Daisy urged Wrath onward, grinning as she teased he didn't need the pep talk, then shot him a wink and wished him luck anyway. Wrath shot out the door, Daisy's words sparking in his mind, and vowed to hunt down someone who could spread the news like wildfire. Just then a girl named Loveshe bounded up and asked, which way to the Adventurers Guild? Smitten by Lucia's charm, Ray swept her straight to the guild. She shot him a quick thanks and sprinted onward. The fox on her head crowed that it was lucky Rain knew the way, and now they just needed to buy potions to make some money. Lucia kept stealing glances at Wrath. The fox asked if the young man had caught her eye. She almost never showed interest in anyone. Lucia guessed Wrath was an alchemist. The fox sized him up and declared he looked about Lucia's age. The foxionin grinned and called to Lucia, "I trust you to handle this. I'm ready for a nap. Wake me if anything happens." Half dazed and drifting towards sleep, Lucia tried to follow Wrath's directions, only to stumble and end up hopelessly lost. 1 week later, the Ventures Guild crackled with restless energy. Wrath's chest tightened. Did the girl he'd helped make it? The three-tailed fox crowning her head slammed into his imagination as the perfect, eye-catching mascot for his shop. Austin convinced himself Amelia's call never reached his ears. He apologized, confessing he'd been swallowed by a whirlwind of ideas, and Amelia, spotting Wreath's serious expression, pressed him what was on his mind. He laughed it off with a sharp giggle, calling it nothing major, then confessed he'd finally opened his shop, and it was floundering below his expectations. Amelia's jaw dropped. She hadn't expected this. Luffy joined them, grinning, and said she figured his shop would be so swamped he'd be scrambling to keep up. Ray swallowed hard and admitted running a business was tougher than it looked. Lathie leaned in and pressed, any strategies in mind. He revealed Daisy had thrown him 2 ideas, craft a mascot or put a poster girl front and center, and he was still wrestling with which to pick. Laughing gave a sharp, knowing nod, sensing how it crushed him. Amelia rushed into the room and apologized to Wrath for keeping him waiting. She pressed a stack of papers into his hands, insisting he handle them with care. They were crucial documents for his shop. Rates declared he was finished there and prepared to leave, wished Amelia and Lathe good luck, and they wished his shop the same. But Wraith found himself trapped, unable to leave the room. Suddenly a figure tore through the door, roaring that shine had returned. Shock crackled through the room as people scrambled to make sense of the commotion. A ripple runs through the crowd, faces light with recognition, as people mutter they haven't seen him in ages. Wrath's ears snapped to a whisper naming him one of the few ranked. Lathe melted into the crowd to dodge his gaze. Sylvia hissed, "What are you doing?" And Lathe pressed a finger to her lips to shush her, leaving Sylvia stunned. She'd never seen Lathe this stone serious, not even during your volcano mission. Wrath frantically tried to figure out what was wrong, while Luffy lunged to hide Ariel, the man who had crashed in and caught sight of her. Wrath snapped, was that Ariel, the ranked person who burst the door open? Hirio burst over grinning, calling out that it had been ages and she looked great. Laffy thought what a jerk to herself but kept calm and replied, "It's been a while." Ariel dropped to one knee and asked her out, hope roaring in his chest. Trembling, Luffy snapped that she'd rejected him countless times and wasn't interested. Wrath staggered, this had happened again and again. Ariel demanded he admit he'd laughed over and over and vowed she wouldn't relent while she stayed single. He swore he'd keep confessing until she finally agreed. Shock hit Lafty like a punch, panic sharpening her mind as she hatched a plan. She shot a glance at Wrath and blurted to Ariel she was already with someone. Ariel froze, then snapped if he'd heard right and demanded to know who it was. Rafe reeled in shock. He had no idea who Lafayette's mystery person was. Safi lunged at Wrath and clamped onto his arm, and roared to Ariel that Wrath was her partner. Silence swallowed the room. Even Ariel and Wrath stood frozen. Shock snapped through the room as Ariel, skeptical, shot Lafayette a glare and accused her of lying, pointing out he'd never seen her with Wraith. Lafayette forced a crooked smile and insisted they couldn't always be seen together in public, claiming she'd met Wraith while Ariel was away on requests. Doubt gnawed at Ariel as she tried to believe her. She dove into her own soul, desperate for confirmation that her effort had counted. Sylvia Backlaffy blurted they'd actually met Wraith while Ariel was away, admitting she couldn't say for sure if Laffy and Wraith were a couple, but insisting Laffy hadn't lied. Ariel stormed straight up to Wraith, eyes blazing, and demanded, "Are you really dating Laffy?" Wrath froze for a heartbeat. Lathe's grip crushed his arm so hard he thought it would snap, and with a trembling voice he confirmed they were together. Disappointment hit Piriel like a punch, disbelief roaring in his veins. He refused to accept that it had happened while he was gone. Disbelief exploded inside him. He jabbed a finger at Wrath, screamed Wrath's name, and warned Lathe never to trust him. Ariel, still dazed, stormed out. The instant Lathe let go of Wrath's arm, Wrath crumpled in agony, and the crowd buzzed with whispered shock. After Ariel left, Lafayette dropped into the seat beside Wraith and apologized for the incident with. About the blonde guy, she burst out that she and Ariel had known each other for a while as fellow ranked adventurers. From day when he'd been confessing his feelings nonstop, Wrath had seen it. She always rejected him, but he refused to quit, so she admitted his relentless pursuit forced her to cook up a lie. After reconnecting with Wrath, she hatched a scheme, told Ariel Wrath was her boyfriend, and roped Wrath into pretending to be hers until Ariel finally gave up. He flashed a grin, said he'd already tipped Ariel off, and signed on to the plan because she was comfortable with it. Laffy swallowed, apologized again, blurted a heartfelt "thank you," and pushed for the truth. "Are you really okay with this?" Wrath smirked and said that, from a guy's perspective, Ariel was easy on the eyes and would make a hell of an adventuring duo with him if she chose. She admitted he wasn't a bad person, but his personality simply didn't suit her. Wrath demanded, "What do we have to do to convince everyone we're a couple?" Scarlet flooded Laffy's cheeks as she dared to whisper that they could go on dates. The instant she said it, his cheeks flared crimson. He blushed too. She warned these were fake dates. Ariel still doubted their relationship, so they had to choreograph every move or risk blowing it. Wrath conceded Lathe was right and swore he'd give everything. Lathe's gratitude spilled out again, earnest and bright, and Sylvia watched, certain Wrath would stand by Lathe when she needed him. Wrath launched into his journey, the pact with Laffy to pose as her lover searing in his mind. Link is in the description. With every step you pushed forward. He pressed on down the path until his eyes locked on a girl lying completely still. Seeing she collapsed, he jolted into action, scooped her up gently, and asked, "Are you all right?" He cradled her, his voice cracking with worry as he studied every inch of her face, and a sudden spark of recognition ignited in his mind. Recognition slammed into him and relief surged as her chest rose and fell. She was breathing. Her familiar face steadied him while he kept scanning for any sign she'd wake. Then the fox padded closer and Wrath asked, "Who are you?" The fox burst forward, declared himself Latisha's friend, and implored everyone to help her. Wraith's jaw dropped when he realized the fox could speak. The girl groped for words, so he lunged closer and asked if she was okay, and she could only choke out a desperate plea for help. Her stomach growled as she blurted out that she was hungry. Wraith darted off with bread for her. The fox spat that they'd been swindled out of every last coin, leaving. They were crushed, unable to buy food. Wraith surged with sympathy for their plight. She devoured the bread. He spun toward her and demanded to know who she was, and she introduced herself, her voice low in the fog. Mimi ripped off his mask and confessed he was a spirit, and Ray gasped that a spirit and a human becoming companions was practically unheard of. Mimi revealed he'd been by her side for years. The spirit insisting Lo was like a daughter to him, and Ray's eyes went wide. Stunned, a spirit would claim a human as kin before he demanded to know what they planned next. Lo declared she was hunting an alchemist named Wraith. Wraith's eyes snapped wide as surprise hit him like a lightning strike. Shock slammed him when she said she was hunting someone named Wrath. He snapped that he was Wrath and demanded why she'd come, and she declared she wanted to be his disciple. Wrath froze, then roared his disbelief and demanded what she meant. She explained that rumors had already crowned him an extraordinary alchemist who could brew elixirs, though she hadn't expected him to be so young. Wrath gaped. News of him had swept into foreign lands, but the relentless pull of his shop and his own easy laughter devoured every spare minute, leaving no room for a disciple, and when her cheeks flushed, he couldn't bring himself to refuse her. She slammed her plea at him again, eyes blazing. "Teach me alchemy." A sudden plan struck him, and he declared he'd take her as a disciple, but only on two ironclad terms. She must work in his shop so he can teach her alchemy, and she must keep the absolute freedom to leave whenever she chooses. She could arrive whenever she wanted. Harnessing Latour, he held his ground at the shop and coached her. Lucia sealed her consent to the first condition. His second request, he demanded the spirit serve as the shop's living mascot. The spirit, adrift about its role, watched as he showed it that a mascot's place is planted in the shop, where customers lean in to chat or reach out to pet it. Pride swelled in the spirit, yet it recoiled from human touch. Choosing him as the talking fox still proved irresistible, transforming the shop into a one-of-a-kind wonder. Hope burned in her eyes as Patacia implored the fox once more. The spirit, unable to resist her, gave in. Wrath asked how long she'd stay in the capital, and when she said she hadn't decided, he offered her a corner of his shop to crash in until she sorted out where she'd live. At home, Luria's breath seized the moment she spotted Wrath standing beside an unfamiliar girl. He clamped a finger over her lips and declared the girl would work there from now on. They thundered up the stairs. Letitia demanded, "Who is that woman?" And he revealed she was his mentor who lived there too. He threw open Letitia's door to reveal her room, then pressed a black crystal into her palm to test her alchemy. A relic from her homeland that exposed an alchemist's true power by measuring their sublimation. Her fingertips grazed the crystal, and it burst into a blinding, glittering light. Clearing a crystal to 70% marks a skilled alchemist, but Letitia pushed it to 90%. Curiosity burning, Wrath stepped up to test himself. He'd never once gauged the raw power coiled inside him. The crystal erupted into a fierce, blinding light. He crumpled to the ground, pain ripping through him. Letitia lunged over, checked him, and found him unhurt. He wondered why the crystal shattered, and Letitia suggested he'd pushed it past its limit right from the start for her. She demanded a front row seat to watch him forge a magical device, and Wrath's jaw dropped, stunned. They braced for her to ask for potions. Lucia snapped that she did brew potions, but her true mastery was in crafting magical devices. When you asked what device to make, she shrugged and shoved the choice onto him. Scorched by summer, he rigged a makeshift cooler from a huge sheet of paper, a pen, and a necklace. He filled. He brandished a pen dusted with white powder and declared it a special pen. He could rip material effects into being, skipping the usual ritual of tracing magic circles with specific materials. He lunged and ripped through the magic circle drawn on the paper, obliterating its seal. She slid the necklace into place and sealed the device below with a single, decisive motion. Letitia rolled her eyes like nothing could thrill her. When he asked what she wanted, she coolly replied, "A ring." Seeing him secure one for another girl, Luria watched misread the signs and spiraled into blind panic. Everyone jumped to the conclusion Wrath was in a relationship. He blurted out whether it even looked romantic, and she admitted he simply didn't have the nerve for that. Luria snapped, "What are you doing?" And Wrath explained he was testing Letitia's alchemy. They introduced themselves. Wrath told Luria that Letitia would live on the second floor starting today. He urged Lucia to continue, and she leaned close and whispered a spell that locked a shimmer of magic into the ring. Her use of magic sent the pricing rate rocketing upward. Lucy lunged into it. She constantly forged enchanted devices, crackling with attack magic. Her razor-sharp command of sorcery let her turn raw power into deadly weapons. Luria leapt to the conclusion that Lucia had come to learn magic, but Wrath cut her off, saying that wasn't true, and Luria stood stunned, noting Wrath's way of forging magical devices was utterly unlike her own. Lucia cut him off, declaring she wanted Wraith to teach her magic circles. Wraith raised an eyebrow, warning the craft was grueling and offering easier lessons instead. Lucia slammed a fist to her chest and vowed she'd give it everything. Mid-bite at dinner, Wraith blurted, "What do spirits eat?" The fox snapped, grin cutting the air. "Spirits, unlike weak humans, don't require food." Lowry revealed, "Spirits feed on magical energy. When that fuel runs dry, their memories crumble and they're reborn as new spirits." They cornered Lucia about her origins, and she finally blurted out that she's from Wano country. Wrath had never set eyes on it. Luri had gone there and came back painting its appearance in vivid, unforgettable words. Decadent spirits and gourmet snacks collide, unleashing a one-of-a-kind flavor that slams into your taste buds. She felt the place hum with a different pulse. Every building announced it, and the nation's fierce devotion to politeness set Wrath's curiosity about Lucia's hometown ablaze. Larry's eyes zeroed in on Lucia's youthful face, and he blurted, "Have you always studied alchemy?" Lucia cried out. She burned with a passion for alchemy, but her parents had already signed her up for a magic training school. Luria lunged with the question, "Are you an ability? Schools mostly take nobles," and Lucia sidestepped it, sealing her lips. Wraith snapped the topic into a new gear, demanding how her spirit fox became her companion, and Mimi dodged, saying only that Lucia had forged a contract with him as a child. Luria's jaw dropped as Lucia sealed a spirit contract, spirits siphoning magical energy to unleash a titanic power that obliterated ordinary magic. Wrath grinned and declared, "Starting tomorrow Lucia's coming to work at the shop, she'll be a huge asset," and Luria jabbed him with a smirk, teasing, "So, you think Lucia's cute?" They hatched a wild plan, make flyers to prompt rates to dodge. Lori agreed for once. The next question hit, and someone kept repeating, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." The next day their shop opened, but Wrath's heart sank. Even the mascot couldn't pull a crowd. He clung to hope, saying a quiet opening was just typical for a first day. The shop's bell shattered the silence as Lafayette and Sylvia, there, usher in the first customers, or leap on your bike and race over to check the shop's progress. Wraith greeted them with a crisp nod and grin, then unveiled Lucia with a proud flourish. Sylvia's face exploded into a grin as she shot toward Mimi, rapid fire asking about the tiny creature. Wrath announced he was Lucia's contracted spirit, and Sylvia flinched as a flicker of anxiety sparked through her. Ray I flashed a confident smile and urged Sylvia to pet Mimi. They were guests. While Sylvia chatted with Mimi, Wraith swung over to Lathe and asked why she'd come, cheeks flushing. Lathe confessed she'd come to talk about their pretend relationship, with Wraith acting as her partner. Ray fired off a call to Lathe asking for a low-traffic day, and as he can see, traffic thins. Lathy scanned his schedule, steeled herself, and boldly asked him out on a date. Her request slammed into Wrath, nearly splintering his composure as shock stole his breath. Next chapter, Adventure Rick crashed into a nap while hunched over a small potion he was studying. His partner noticed they were closing in on the quest location and demanded what he was doing, and Rick confessed he was curious about a potion from an unfamiliar shop, scoffing at its promised effects. His partner's jaw dropped. He'd actually bought a potion that supercharged physical abilities. Rick admitted it was odd, but trusted the shopkeeper's honesty, so he slammed the potion back to test it against. A gargantuan poison spider, contorting to dodge its venom within. Unexpectedly high leap. Suspicion flared that the potion had granted his newfound powers, so he vowed to put it to the test. He effortlessly cleaved through two of the spider's legs, slammed onto the ground with a solid thud, and his lightning-fast speed, razor agility, and iron control were suddenly obvious. Stunned by the potion's surge, confidence flared in him as he lunged alone and obliterated the spider with no help from his partner. He cut the creature down with no sweat, and the instant it hit the ground his partner fired, who brewed the potions in that shop. Wraith's fingers danced over the potion bottles, eyes narrowing as he inspected every label, then he slammed the new arrival's front and center to steal the spotlight. Satisfied with the organized setup, he felt opening time looming, seized the door handle, and told Luria they'd probably see few customers today, but they'd still give it their all. Luria nodded, eased the door open, and his breath hitched at the sight of a massive crowd jammed outside, buzzing with eager anticipation for the shop to open. Disbelief burned in Wrath. Sure, this had to be a dream that would vanish once the door swung wide. He threw it open, and impossibly, he found himself open. A tidal wave of customers slammed into them, drowning them in chaos. They stormed the aisles, stripping the shelves bare well before closing time. The empty store erupted when Wrath and Lowe burst in, gasping for air as they scrambled to grasp the sudden tidal wave of customers. A customer rushed forward and blurted, "Have you sold out?" Rafe's voice snapped that a massive crowd had just swept through and stripped their shelves bare, and he leaned in, eyes sharp, asking if she knew what had drawn so many people. The other, stunned he'd been in the dark, barked that rumors had exploded over the past few days about a shop hawking astonishing potions and enchanted devices. Anything stamped with a flame mark was especially trusted. Has Rafe even let that bombshell sink in, the very person who asked if he'd take orders? He shot back a firm "I did," scribbled down her order, and thanked her with a quick, grateful smile. Wrath hadn't expected his logo to ignite a frenzy and catapult the shop's popularity skyward. Elation crashed over him. Riding the momentum, he swore to crank out as many items as he could while they still had plenty of materials. After they locked up the shop, Lucia and Mimi sagged with exhaustion, and Wraith praised their grit while warning that tomorrow might be just as brutal. Though they staggered under the workload, Wraith reminded Lucia, driven by her commitment, spurred them on. She finally relented, grit in her teeth, and vowed, grudgingly, to give it her all. That evening, Wrath met Lafay for an arranged date meant to lure Ariel, and anxiety clawed at him, even as he kept up the charade of being her boyfriend. Lafayette strode into their meeting spot, and Wraith's cheeks burst crimson the instant he saw her. She blurted an apology for any delay, her shy eyes mirroring his. Wrath gaped at her striking look and blurted, "Did you pick that outfit?" while Lefty just grinned and handed the credit to Sylvia. Ariel hung back, eyes locked on the strolling pair, and Wreath's mind raced, imagining every little ritual couples do on dates. Lafay crowed about his shop's booming success, the shocking speed catching her off guard, and she suddenly noticed she was in a sour mood. I noted adventurers converging on the flame-marked potions, trading fevered whispers about a three-tailed fox. A jolt hit Ray. The customer's words matched Daisy's advice from when he'd asked her, proving his shop's fame was snowballing by word of mouth. Lucia and Mimi sent the shop's popularity soaring, enchanting customers of every age and gender, and Wraith prayed the success would last. She giggled, sure the thrill would never die. His products were simply that exceptional. Heat flooded Ray's cheeks. Flattered and mortified, he forced out a quiet thanks and silently prayed the momentum would keep him going. Today, Wrath burst out of the shop, ripping himself free from someone else's care. A child's wrenching sob ripped through the air and slammed into their ears. Wraith lunged to help, but Laffy yanked him back. Moments later, Ariel burst in, thrusting a flower toward the crying child and calling out to them. It clashed with her lovely face, like a stain on silk. He reached out with a gentle, hopeful hand, yet her distress refused to ease. She wouldn't stop crying. Curiosity flared in wrath when he spotted the man's strange outfit in Chuckle. He was sure the man had been tailing them. Guards stormed in and snatched Ariel away. A raw urge screamed at them, sprint away while they still had the chance. Wrath faltered, sensing the man wouldn't relent, and she coolly declared she had a plan. She lit up, painting New York's annual festival in vivid, pulsing detail. The capital erupted, a dazzling parade thundered through the streets, while unique shops sprang up on every corner. She snapped that Sylvia had been mercilessly badgering her to go to the festival together, just the two of them. Since Ariel would probably keep his eyes glued to them, showing up together at the festival would sell them as a couple, and Wrath agreed. Festivals practically screamed date, and he was all in. Lathe backed the plan, so they dove straight into action. He steeled himself and went through with it. After a stunned beat, Ray saw Ariel had been taken away, so the date was pointless and they called it off. A week later, Lucia cornered Wrath, eyes blazing, and demanded to know if he was really going to the festival. At the festival, he shrugged that it was already noon, so the crowd would be easier to handle. Lucia's stomach knotted at the thought of going alone, but Ray flashed a reassuring grin, calmed her, and praised her confidence. On their last date, Wrath froze, humiliated by his failure to take charge, and now he burned with resolve to make this festival date a success. Resolve ignited, he sought Daisy's help. Wraith burst in, apologized for showing up unannounced, and insisted he urgently needed Daisy's help. He suddenly spotted Sylvia there, his voice cracking as he stammered, "W, what are you doing here?" Flash a practiced grin and snap, "What did you think she was doing?" Daisy cut straight to it. Sylvia had asked her to help with a murky problem. Wraith tossed out a bold plan, and Sylvie cut in, reminding him he'd promised to attend the festival with her sister, and warning that his ignorance of the capital's celebrations would leave him unable to lead or lift the mood. Sylvie offered. Sensing his unease, she dove in and matched her breaths with his date to steady the moment. She fired the question at him. Did he really think he could handle it alone, oblivious he'd come to Daisy for that exact reason? Daisy clutched the request, wavering between suddenly getting it and baffled at why they'd picked her, while Sylvie snapped that Wraith barely knew anyone else to ask. Daisy burst out, "Are you dating an S-rank adventurer?" Wraith shot back that he was only pretending to date her to shield her from an unwanted suitor. Baffled, Daisy hesitated, and Sylvia suggested they ask Amelia if Daisy couldn't help. Ruth planted her feet and forbade dragging Amelia in. She could already hear the furious storm Amelia would unleash. Daisy shrugged. Amelia was an adult, no problem, but when Rafe dropped to his knees begging for her help, a single burning question slammed into Daisy. Why was he so desperate for her, of all people? He slammed his palm down, insisting this was a make-or-break matter for him. He begged without end, and Daisy finally agreed to help. Sylvia practically vibrated as she urged that festival preparations begin. Daisy was still buried in work, so they pushed it back. 300 years ago, when the kingdom was founded, they ignited the Royal Dragon Festival to beseech the Crystal Dragon for the realm's prosperity. It swelled into a citywide spectacle, and now every summer the entire capital buzzes with eager anticipation. Wraith staggered as the event's towering grandeur tore the breath from his lungs. Lathy leaned in and asked if he was loving his first Royal Dragon Festival, and he grinned, breathless from the sights, saying every moment had been breathtaking. Now he finally understood why it drew the crowds. His eyes locked on Lathe's stunning outfit, and he burst out a loud compliment. Lucky break, Laffey never caught a single word, just like we'd been told. Suspicion burning, Ariel watched them like a hawk. Wraith scanned the area but came up empty. Sylvia and the girls were hiding. Nicola was ecstatic to be beside Daisy and Sylvia, while Daisy wore a fed-up look. Luria declared Wraith clueless around women, which made getting him to act like a proper boyfriend painfully hard. Her gaze snapped to Ariel, worry blazing as she asked, "Are you okay?" So the S-guard caught wind that he was out of danger, and heads up, Wraith had bought something for Laffey. He thrust the candy dapples into her hand. Their fingers brushed, cheeks flamed crimson, and they jerked apart. Laurie and Sylvia beamed, eyes glued as Rafe and Lathe riffed off each other, while Nicolo's heart thundered as he tried to ask Daisy out. Daisy shot her down on the spot. Nicola melted at that fierce attitude, while Daisy only wanted her gone. Sylvia and Luria leaned in, hatching daring schemes to coax Rake and Laugh into growing closer. A group of men closed in, slick smiles flashing as they launched into flirting. Sylvia unleashed a terrifying glare that seared into them and sent shivers racing down their spines. He flashed a crooked grin and insisted they were only out to have some fun. They were in the capital for the first time, so Laura cut in, owned up that they were strangers and told the men to ask someone else. The men wouldn't back down, pushing to explore together. Someone clamped a hand on Daisy's shoulder, insisting they could hang out, then a menacing voice roared, "Let him go." A blast of ice slammed into his hand, freezing it on the spot. The girls surged to shield Daisy, while Sylvia pinned the men with a cold, "Dare you" glare. They swore it was all just for fun. Sylvia's smile snapped away, and she ordered them to leave. Sylvia zeroed in on saving her sister and Wrath, no time for random strangers. She even toyed with staging a crash to freeze the "Plant your legs and command them to hold. Tell them to wait for a small request." Back at the festival, Wrath and Laffey tore into sizzling street meat, grinning as smoke and spice filled the air. Wrath's eyes snagged on stalls hawking wares from every corner of the map, and Laffey grinned, urging them to snatch up strange local creatures as souvenirs. Memory slammed into him. Lucian had said she'd be at the festival, probably sampling food right in your spot. I prayed Luria Eames was just at home, drinking. Then the men who'd been harassing Sylvia and Laura suddenly appeared and swarmed her. They laughed in quick, nervous bursts. Wraith knew it wasn't flirting. They looked terrified, eyes snapping behind them. Lathe planted his feet, flat out refused to go, and shot them the same feral glare Sylvia had. Panic exploded through them. They bolted. Laughter itself froze, baffled by the encounter. Frustration choked Sylvia as her plan collapsed into ruin. Loria, blind to the scheme, whispered a desperate prayer for Lackey's courage. Sylvia had pinned everything on the chaos, giving Wrath a chance to throw himself between Lackey and the thugs. Lathe was too tough. Sylvia shot to her feet, fixed her gaze on Wraith, and vowed to secure her sister's happiness. Sylvia snapped to Luria that they had to get Wrath and Luffy together, make them touch. Luria's curiosity ignited. Sylvia was going to whip up wind magic to steer Wraith straight toward Laphasupli. Plan sealed, they fused their powers into one roaring surge and swell into towering giants. He ripped up a gust that shoved Wraith closer to Laffey. Wraith lurched forward, his face slamming into Lackey's chest. He blurted a frantic apology, panic cracking every word. Sylvia and Laura erupted into triumphant cheers. This was the goal they'd chased. Lafay and Ray locked onto a game stall and charged over, while Wraith's hands trembled as he took the ring toss and flung each ring with jittery hope. He pictured himself nesting. The ring snapped onto the stick at the last heartbeat. Wraith lunged and tried it. They tried again and nailed it. A sea of faces crashed in as cheers exploded. He stood stunned, clueless how he'd won. Sylvia and Luria slipped him help from the shadows. Lurie watched the crowd swell and snapped they'd gone overboard. Sylvia agreed. His sister was slipping into work mode and said baiting him was their only shot. We urged them to dive into the festival themselves, and Wraith said he'd find a spot to sit for the fireworks after the game. Suddenly, Wraith could revel in the festival, and Wraith said he'd find a spot to sit for the fireworks after the game. Suddenly, Wraith could revel in the festival, and Wraith said he'd find a spot to sit for the fireworks after the game. Suddenly, Wraith could revel in the festival, and Wraith said he'd find a spot to sit for the fireworks after the game. Suddenly, Wraith could revel in the festival, and Wraith said he'd find a spot to sit for the fireworks after the game. His gaze snapped to a melee barreling straight toward him, and he tried to slip away, yelling he'd grab some drinks, but it was already too late to escape. Amelia flashed a grin, asked where Sylvia was, and assumed they were alone at the festival. Latte rushed to clear the air about Ariel. Amelia conceded, then pointed out how close they looked and that the festival was a magnet for couples. She spoke and Wrath watched fog coil up from the air, snapping his gaze to his hand. The Ritz ring that nullifies magic suddenly snapped, a sharp, echoing crack tearing through the silence. A shimmering aura revealed the thought was magic. Amelia collab. A jolt ripped through them both. Wrath leaned over, checked her, and declared she was fine, just asleep. Lathe let out a relieved breath, but confusion churned behind his eyes. Wraith hissed that the fog was laced with sleep magic. His ring kept him safe, and when he asked Lafty, she shrugged, "I'm fine," then figured the haze hits people differently and snapped that they had to move while they still could. A suffocating fog swept across vast stretches, clearly the work of a powerful mage, and Rafe's mind raced. How many people in the capital were still awake? Lathe snapped they needed to search for anyone still conscious. With no clue when the fog would lift, they plunged into the surrounding areas. The fog slammed shut around them, thickening into a choking curtain, and they braced to meet a foe who could match or even surpass their mentor. Something had to be done. Rafe would trade this entire crisis for one of Amelia's teasing smiles in a heartbeat. They crept through the dark and found everyone fast asleep. Lathe's senses flared. He sensed the presence and shouted, ripping the silence and revealing. Ariel shot them a grin, laughed, asked whether he knew anything, and then owned up that he didn't. He knew the ones still awake, him and Lafay among them, had ironclad magic resistance, their ranked adventurer status proving it. Luria and Sylvia hustled Daisy and Nicola to safety and tore off to hunt Wrath, while Lafay reached for Wrath's magic, only to have her own power slam into a dead wall. Sylvia clawed through the ether to pin down her sister's lure for him, but two other magical currents slammed into her senses and drowned it out. Sylvia zeroed in on the other source as Ariel, the ranked adventurer they were trying to lure. Sims snapped that Ariel was the one hopelessly in love with Lafay, and when pressed, Sylvia insisted her magic still held firm in the fog. Luria launched into the air, squeezing every last spark from her magic, and moments later they spotted Wraith and the others. Rafe's jaw dropped as they swooped in through the air, and grinning, he yelled, "Are you drunk?" A voice ripped through the air, and they snapped into position to strike. But Mimi sneered and tore into them, mercilessly mocking their weakness. A single burning question ripped through the room. Why was she there, and where had Lucia disappeared to? Mimi dropped a bombshell. Lucia ignited the blaze. Wrath froze when Ninny dropped the name Luria, and she rushed to make it clear. This wasn't the usual Lucia. He blurted out whether the quiet, expressionless Lucia was the one who gets irritated. Mimi snapped that the Lucia he knew was the light Lyria. The spell erupted from Dark Luria, the half-human, half-vampire hybrid. More than 1,000 years ago, a magical race called vampires ruled the night with a ravenous thirst for blood and superhuman strength, but their inability to reproduce doomed them to fade into history. Many warned that Lucia hadn't mastered her powers. When blood-starved or drunk, her personality snapped and she exploded into berserk violence. Mimi warned Lucia's slipped into her dark vampire mode, and right now she's unleashing her power to smother the capital in a choking fog. Wraith demanded, "When will this mode end?" And Mimi shot back, "It can last anywhere from half a day to over a day." Lucia burned with a strength that crushed ordinary humans, and bound as Mimi's contracted spirit, Mimi couldn't lift a finger to stop her. Wraith replayed what first made her snap, insisting she'd only had a few drinks while Nimi egged her on. Wraith pressed any ideas. Luria shrugged and shot back that no strategy was necessary. Their mission was simple: stop Lucia. Worries about injuries flared, then Ariel crashed in and reassured everyone. He'd take him down. Ariel flashed a sly wink and promised his potions would sharpen their edge. With everyone resolved, Mimi urged them to follow and sprinted ahead. Lathe shot her hand toward Wrath, barking that flying would be quicker, as Sathya latched onto Lathe. Tossed by brutal turbulence, they finally settled onto the runway. Wrath, unused to the sky, gagged as nausea knifed through him and his life flashed before him, a spotted dark Lucia hovering above. She beamed, eyes alight, and declared the group below looked downright mouthwatering. Her grin slapped Wrath awake. This wasn't the Lucia he knew, yet he clung to the hope they could reason with her. Mimi hissed for them to stay sharp. Lucia wouldn't hold back. Lucy shrugged off caution and barreled straight ahead. Luria, cool and polite as a blade, urged Lucia to lift the fog magic and chewed her out for misbehaving and stirring trouble across the capital. Luria's voice snapped as she refused, spitting, "You're just an old lady," and the barb ignited her fury. Wrath froze, eyes razor-sharp, and demanded of Lucia, "What purpose drove you to unleash all this chaos?" Lucia grinned, declaring she had no specific game in mind. She just wanted to cut loose and have fun after being confined for so long. She blinked into existence, right in front of Wrath. She beckoned him closer like a dare. Wrath, stunned by her lightning speed, went rigid as she coiled to strike. Luria hurled a vicious kick, but Lucia slipped away like water and laughed, taunting, "That won't catch me." That backward glance cost her dearly. Her opponent unleashed razor-sharp ice that snapped shut around her, sealing her in a frozen cage. Staggering, Wrath's mind spun. Had she really teleported? A bolt of realization slammed into him, and he roared at them to bind her, now. But Lucia struck them down and melted into the shadows. She sneered that their magic couldn't touch her, then blasted into the air and began circling them above. Wraith's mind snapped to it. She wasn't moving on foot. She was dissolving into fog, and Sylvia lunged, flinging a chain to snare her. Lucius ghosted free from their hold, smooth and utterly effortless. Lucian's eyes flared as he realized Sylvia's strike wasn't meant to hurt her. He barked, "What are you really after?" Countless chains closed in around Lucia, and so. She wasn't trying to hit her. From the first move, she swung to wrap the chain ball around her and lock her in place. Lucia's breath hitched as the chains coiled around her, knitting into a tight spherical cage that sealed every step and crushed any chance of escape. She swallowed her pride, had to admit she'd underestimated Sylvia's cunning, when Lucia's power erupted, incinerating every chain and setting her free. Next, Laffy hurled herself at her, but the instant they made, Lucid's arm dissolved into a swirling fog, sending Lathe crashing hard to the ground. Laffia choked out an apology for failing, and Wraith's jaw dropped. How could she vault like that in a yukata? Lackey growled that the only way they'd stop her might be to hurt her. Wrath bristled, insisting there had to be another way, but Luria snapped. Lucio was the fog's source and was easily fending them off. If they didn't act decisively, the situation would only worsen. They unleashed a synchronized onslaught. Lucia struck back, unleashing a fierce counterattack as the fight escalated. Wraith lunged at Minnie, desperate for a solution. Minnie snapped back, laying out the vampire's weaknesses: sunlight, crosses, flowing water, fire, and holy water. Night couldn't silence the sun. Luria's crew was already hurling water and fire. Conjured elements glanced harmlessly off Lucia, forcing them to hunt down raw, natural sources. Holy water was their best shot. Wraith clutched a lone bottle, hoping one strike would shut her down. Without warning, Lucia sprang up behind him and yanked the bottle from his hands. Laffy lashed out, booting her, then lunged to see if he was all right. Wraith spat that Lucia had taken the holy water. Lucia snapped the cap off, poured the bottle out, and said sharply that sneaking around alone only painted a target on him. Lucy erupted into mocking laughter, lashing Wraith with vicious taunts and cutting insults. Wrath quaked under her jabs, but he never struck back. He told the girls he wasn't angry. He'd been struck by a cruel inspiration to hatch a plan that would make her cry. The girls froze, dread knotting their throats at his plan. He grabbed their gaze and swore no harm would touch her, though he'd need the help of all three. Luria vowed she'd shut the plan down the instant it turned into something awful, but Wraith scoffed and insisted it was harmless. Sylvia snapped, "How can we help?" He beckoned them closer with a sharp curl of his finger and hissed the strategy into their ears as Lucia washed, confusion clouding her face. He ordered them to bait her into the open by Southgate and, if possible, stop her from fleeing. The task was perilous, but Wraith leaned in, pushing them to go through with it and promising in a whisper he'd handle the rest. Ariel lunged with a sudden, brutal strike, but Lucia slid aside like it meant nothing to her. Lucian sneered, branding her an old woman, and rage exploded inside her. With a rough slash of the hand, Luria conjured several tumbling water spheres. He sent them screaming toward Lucia as Lucia. Lucia's eyes snagged on the swirling water balls, then Sylvia's chain snapped up inches from her face, daring her to dodge or take a strike that would mar her beauty, and in that instant Lucia knew they'd been holding back. But now he revels in the challenge, daring them to go all out as they slip past their hunters. They herded her toward the area Wrath had mentioned, wherever that was. They found their mark and planted their feet, but Lucian read their intent and stopped dead. Ray barked that everyone must follow his orders to the letter, stepping forward to shoulder whatever fallout came. Lucia felt her pulse rocket as she braced herself. Would Luria or Sylvia move first? Wrath lunged out of nowhere and struck first. Lucia's eyes snapped wide. Wraith couldn't fight, nor could he summon a single spell. She hung back, doubt coiling in her gut. She couldn't believe he had what it took. Wrath unleashed her compression power, pulverizing the fountain into a spray of shattered stone. Danger slammed into Lucia. She spun on her heel and bolted. Lathe barreled after her, hot on her heels. A laugh nearly exploded from her. Lucia spun into a fog. In the blink of an eye, Luria and Sylvia loomed right behind her. Wrath snarled at Luria, summon walls and cage Lucia inside the area. He didn't care how she pulled it off. Luria, a master of magic, grinned and plunged into the task. Wrath didn't mean to shove Lucia into the fountain. He meant to haul the fountain right up to her. He unleashed his compression power again, and the fountain detonated into a roaring geyser. The explosion unleashed a sudden, stinging rain, and Lucia, hurtling from the sky, felt her vision tunnel as consciousness began to slip. He lunged and snatched her from midair, catching her before she slammed into the ground. Wraith checked their safety, then gasped. Lucia was drenched and still laughing. Lathe snapped, "Why are you staring?" He breathed, "They're close," and a sharp scolding slammed him for gawking. Wraith watched as Luria whipped up a gale that shredded the rain off her and Sylvia, leaving them bone dry. Lucia snapped awake and, with a wry smirk, conceded that Wraith had utterly outdone her. She grinned at her defeat, amused that someone without magic had actually bested her. A triumphant grin split Wraith's face. He'd caught her completely off guard. Wraith felt a cold jolt. He realized the dark Luria's taunts had wreaked havoc on them. With that handled, it was time to tackle Lucia's trouble. Wrath and Luria tore after her. Wrath closed in and landed a few sharp spanks. Playing Lucia, Williams swore she'd never repeat that action. Luria's eyes flashed as she snapped that Wrath had pushed things way past the limit. It was behind them. They slammed the door on it and moved on. Wraith bore into Lucia with a fiery stare and snapped, "How much do you remember?" Relief crashed over them when they learned she remembered everything, and she bowed her head to apologize with raw, honest remorse. Remorse poured from him. Mimi cheered the whole squad but jabbed that she'd expected a faster finish. After all, it was 4 against 1. Wraith learned to shrug off her barbed jabs. With Lucia snapped back to herself and the fog finally lifting, people erupted into sobs. To Wrath, the world blurred into a dream as sleep claimed him. He dove in from the sky, verified the heat, and kept everyone safe. They thanked him. He confessed he'd been digging into whether Wrath and Lathe were dating. Wrath had shoved from his mind that the mission began with him. He grilled Ariel about her findings, and the truth slammed into him. He and Lafay were a couple. They both feigned ignorance of Ariel's investigation, and Ray, skeptical at first, realized it still nailed their goal. Ariel cut in out of nowhere. If Wreath's love for Lafay ever faded, he'd storm in and proclaim his own love. Until then, he implored Wrath to keep Lassie happy, then vanished. A week later, Wrath looked beaten, his shoulders slumped and his eyes hollow. Lathe's voice snapped, "How long are you going to stay like this?" Mimi brooded beside him, and Seth, right there, barked that he had to move on. Fountains shattered into spray, roads heaved and buckled, arcane energy snarled through the city, the festival erupted into chaos, and hostile spells rained down. They were grave crimes that usually slammed people behind bars. Wraith's eyes went sharp with understanding, then he flinched. The price was too steep. Lucia's shoulders sagged as she whispered they were broke. Sylvia surged forward, offering to lift their spirits. Offers to pay for the spirits poured in, but Wrath refused. "Cutting them off with this is between Lucia and me." When every hand backed away, he swallowed his pride and paid the expenses himself. Lucia protested, but he shot back that after collapsing penniless, she had no grounds to argue. Catching her expression, he snapped that it wasn't free. She'd have to work hard in his shop to pay him back. She took it gratefully and thanked him. He conceded everything would have played out differently if she'd been upfront. She apologized, then unleashed a fiery explanation about the non-human races. Like vampires, she endured relentless hatred, denied service, even violently attacked, and terror sealed her lips. Ray III seized her hand, eyes steady, and swore the capital's people were kind. He blurted to Lathe that alchemists were racing to aid roadside stragglers and ranked female adventurers. Lathe agreed, saying discrimination against non-human women was crumbling as more of them joined the adventurer ranks. She flung her arms wide and welcomed Lucia back to the capital. A brutal question slammed into them. Could the shop's tiny earnings keep them afloat? Seth slammed the paper into Rate's hands. They cornered him, demanding to know what he'd been thinking. It was an application for a temporary teaching job at the This is the Royal Magic Academy. Will's Radium claimed the chair and presided over School 7. Shock slammed into Seth as Wrath recognized him and leaned in, eager to pick apart every connection. Rafe rushed to clear it up, insisting it hadn't been intentional. Seth leaned in to ask about the alchemy teacher post, and the pay was hefty. Temporary teachers swooped in to cover his classes, freeing Rafe to dive back into running his shop. Ray's heart leapt when he learned Alicia was at Academy 2. With 2 familiar faces around, he figured he could handle it. Doubt devoured him. With no teaching experience, he couldn't imagine himself standing before a classroom. Mimi cheered him on, but Ray froze. She couldn't feel the doubt knotting his chest. Lara believed in him without question. Wraith feared the students would write him off for being nearly their age. Sylvia grinned and declared she'd soak up every second of his class. He zeroed in on the job, already planning to call on Seth's sister if it came down to it. Seth barked a laugh, his eyes snapping to her. She was younger than him. Wraith anchored the chaos with iron calm, even younger than the flustered Seth. Seth shot a teasing grin and darted off to get ready. They hammered away in the shop for months. Wraith and Seth burst through the gates of the Royal Academy for Wraiths to meet the Wells. Wrath froze at the door, mouth opening to ask if meeting Wells was necessary, but Seth snapped that it was. Wrath would be working here. They knocked and stepped into Wells's room. Will shot Wrath a polite nod, and they traded tight, brittle smiles, thin masks barely hiding the chill between them. Will smirked. He'd been drowning in whispers about Wrath since their last encounter. Will snapped, why did Wraith choose our academy? Seeing Wrath's nervous expression, Will panicked, convinced he'd overstepped, and blurted an apology. Wrath's mind raced. Did Will know about the fountain Wrath had destroyed? Will declared, whatever brought you here, we're ecstatic to have an alchemist of your caliber. He fired the question, did you review the documents? And Wraith met his stare, confirming he'd already seen the papers they'd passed him earlier. They slapped him into the role of assistant teacher for academy classes, shelved the employment terms for now, and ordered him to obey the lead teacher's every instruction until the test. If he noticed anything during classes, he could leap in and unleash a sharp insight. Wrath had free rein to speak his mind. When he pressed about assisting, the answer hit him. The teacher was Helga. The name slammed into Seth and he froze. Will's memory snapped. Helga had been Seth's teacher at the academy. Wrath shot a question. Could health be someone's personality? Will hailed him as an excellent teacher, but Wraith demanded more. He wasn't asking about lessons or methods. He wanted to know Helga as a person. He butted heads with Will, who scrawled his signature on the papers and urged them to meet Helvet so he could judge for himself, convinced Helga would hand down precise class instructions. Wrath's jaw dropped as he met Will's teasing grin. Will smirked he'd been counting on teaming up and waved them off like they were nothing. In the hall, Wrath let out a thunderous exhale and swore he'd steer clear of Will's for years. Seth called it an overreaction but shrugged and agreed. Reed Will's constant grin grated on him, and he swore he'd call it out next time. Rafe paused, turning Helga inside out in his mind, and Seth shot back. She's not bad, she's been fighting to hold herself together. I painted him in razor-sharp detail, so Wraithade would understand the moment they met. Seth hustled him toward Helga's room. Wrath's jaw dropped as he stepped into a cathedral of books, a room that swallowed his tiny workshop whole. It hit him he was far more organized than he'd realized, keeping every spinning plate from crashing. When Seth cornered him and demanded to know what kind of person he pictured Helga as a chaotic whirlwind, a disorganized mess like Luria. He'd only teach her what he knew inside out. Seth's jaw dropped. His teacher's room was empty, and that man had always been there when Seth was his student. Rafe's eyes tore across the room, certain it was empty. Seth snapped that they should hold back a moment. The rat locked onto a glint atop the box. At first it looked like a stone. It glittered like an enchanted gem, and he lunged forward, desperate to examine it up close. Gruff bark split the air, "Who's there?" A bearded old man stepped forward, claiming the place as his research room and forbidding them to move freely. Seth greeted Helva, who. He recognized him. Seth's face erupted into a grin he'd remembered. Eyes snapped to him, and they dubbed him an exceptionally bright student. Helga shattered Wraith's expectations, and he froze, baffled by Seth's earlier reaction. Helga erupted into motion, darting around the room while Wrath's eyes locked onto him. A sharp voice cut in, blurting that Wrath seemed shockingly young as he. He'd heard of Wrath and even bragged he knew the name. Helga zeroed in on him. Since he arrived in the capital out of nowhere, Wrath carved a fierce reputation, and she found him absurdly gifted for his age, brewing life-saving elixirs and yanking adventurers back from the brink. Those were his crowning victories. Whispers tied him to the realm of dreams, and Wraith staggered, stunned that so much about him was already out in the open. Just as hope flickered in him, Helga warned he'd refuse to admit the Wraith's abilities without seeing proof, and he wouldn't let Wrath get cocky. Wrath bristled at Helga's iron strictness, then flicked a sharp, searching look at Seth, who plaster fake smiles across their faces. Spotting Wraith standing there, Helga ripped into him for dawdling again and barked, "Get over here." Wrath trailed behind, doubt gnawing at him. Could he really handle working there? He pressed close to Seth and hissed, "Why drag us all out just to talk about the job?" Worry clawed at him. He was sure he'd done something wrong, convinced Helga was furious after they barged into his room uninvited. Seth assured him it wasn't an issue. Knowing Helga's nature, he guessed she'd bristle, because Rafe was the same age as the students. Wrath staggered, panic flaring, when the crushing truth slammed into him. His age couldn't be changed. Seth's chuckle sliced the tension as he waved a hand. "Helga's not a bad person, Wrath, don't sweat it." Helga thundered, "We're here." Keith blurted, "Where are we?" and his eyes snapped to a grim training ground. Helga snapped he'd test Wraith there. Wraith froze, stunned Seth. He ducked his gaze, guilt crackling. He'd left Wraith in the dark about the test. Wraith swore he'd never forget. He stood poised for Helga's orders when Helga snapped, "Build a golem." Golems weren't toys. Their gem cores seethed with magical energy, animating the dolls so they moved on their own. Wrath stood stunned. Tests were for brewing potent potions, enhancing weapons, or crafting arcane devices, so why was he being tested on this? He locked onto Helga's face, burning to know what she was thinking. Helga shot back that the gall didn't have to be large, it only had to move well. Helga pressed a tiny magic gem into his palm. Wraith's chest tightened. He'd never forged a golem before. He knew. The theory finally clicked, but nerves clawed at him and sweat slicked his brow. Helga, stay tuned. And fired the question at him. Was he going to do it? Heart pounding, he sprinted to the training ground. Wrath could feel it, admitting he'd never forged a lead golem would snuff out his chances on the spot. He clenched his jaw and plunged in. Wrath inhaled, locked his focus on crafting the golem. Every precise detail and fierce spark of imagination had to align, because alchemy lives in the image of the finished thing, and for golems that vision is everything. The magic gem would flood the body with energy, but a shoddy frame would cripple the gown's movements, and at worst the gown could go wild, something he would do anything to prevent. He cinched the magicum tight and plunged into the procedure. Seth's anxiety crackled through him as Rafe stepped forward to begin the transfer. In the formation phase, Heldo froze, jaw dropping as the breathtaking beauty of his work slammed into him. In a heartbeat, Wrath ripped the air open, and a snarling wolf golem sprang into being. Helga leaned in, eyes devouring the gum's eerily lifelike surface, breath catching at the flawless craftsmanship. Years teaching alchemy hadn't steeled him for a golem this monstrous. Picture the endless trials, the countless attempts poured into sculpting this into perfection. Wraith forced a grin, pulse racing, silently begging his first attempt wouldn't be a complete disaster. Hell's stunned face hit him like a gut punch. He feared he'd messed up. Seth's jaw dropped as Wrath pulled it off on his first try, but Hell stayed skeptical. They insisted that not even a genius who'd spent his whole life honing his mind could have forged what Wrath had just unleashed. No ordinary person could forge this level of mastery, not in 100 lifetimes, and they expected him to believe this was Wraith's first try. Nerves roaring, Wraith froze, tongue-tied, and forced out a shaky apology. Back in Helga's room, they sat in thick silence as Helga's shoulders slumped and her eyes went downcast. After laying out how he'd pulled it off in the test, Wraith whispered, "What's next?" Seth snapped that he still won't acknowledge his own talent, and suddenly Helga cut in to say she had no complaints about his work. For now, he braced himself to rip through the class material. Their first lesson zeroed in on the goal and construction, and he ripped through the process, laying it out like a battle plan. They laid out the steps, drilled them until muscle memory kicked in, then funneled the gallons straight into savage sword and magic drills, and Helga announced Rafe would help prep the training and answer student questions. They tasked Wraith with staging demonstrations while he juggled his other duties. Grasping his role, he begged to be excused, his health failing, and confessed another duty was tugging him away. Wrath swore it was his first time making a golem, and that confession earned him one sharp piece of advice: practice with it until class. Only one doubt gnawed at him, the stone wraith he'd been obsessing over earlier. He blurted, "Is that a magic gem?" and snatched it into his hand. They confirmed it was true. Gratitude burned in Wraith's voice as he said, "Thank you," then he turned and walked away. From his room, Helga watched them depart the academy, doubt clawing at him as he wondered why he'd handed Wrath that unresponsive item after he'd failed to process it himself. It hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd let his emotions cloud his judgment about his age. He clung to the slim hope that Wrath might pull off the one thing he'd longed for his whole life. At home, Wrath stared into the magic gem, hunting for the perfect goal to craft from its power, and Sylvia grinned, certain his creation would be jaw-dropping. Wraith realized Helva had left them no clue about the gall's shape or materials, turning the choice into a gamble. He pressed Luri for her take, and she suggested making. She teased something epic and refused to spill a single detail. Inspiration hit Wraith like lightning. He sprang into action to craft a jaw-dropping spectacle for the students. Lathe tossed out a goal that ruined any sword or spell training, snapping that he had to weave in traps and tricks to blunt those skills. He snapped his agreement, and she exploded with excitement, urging them to pick a humanoid or monstrous form. Wrath hatched an idea and locked onto one crystal-clear goal. When Lassie asked if he felt uneasy, he unveiled a plan to forge a goal that would change everything. Even Luria faltered, incredulous. Could that even be done? Luria owned up she'd never forged a transforming golem, but backed Wrath to pull it off. Wrath admitted he didn't know how. Luria tried to leave, but he stepped in front of her and coldly told her she had nowhere to go. Lathe cut in, "Do you actually have a plan to build it?" She knew the race's skills inside out, but making something entirely new would push even him to his limits. He feigned cluelessness while a plan burned in his eyes. It was an experiment, so they could try anything, and the creation needed a sturdy, pliant practice dummy that would let magical energy flow and drive movement. So they went with Nithril, the metal Wrath had used on Sylvia's projects. Channeling that thrill into the golem meant they'd likely have to tweak every gear with surgical precision. Rafe whipped out a glowing gem and, in a heartbeat, snapped a human-shaped golem into existence. It moved with such lifelike precision it could pass for a real person. Lathe's eyes locked on the gong, curiosity igniting. Wrath barked for her to strike with a feather touch, "Don't damage it." Luffy unleashed a one-handed swing. But the golem parried her blade. She lunged once more, and the blade bit through it. Wraith urged Sylvia to probe it with a restrained burst of magic. Sylvia unleashed her go-to spell, and it glanced off the golem, leaving it utterly unscathed. She reined herself in. A golem that shrugged off attacks from ranked adventurers like Lathe and Sylvia was jaw-dropping, ridiculously overbuilt for something meant only for training. Sylvia's jaw dropped at Wraith's creation. Wrath tinkered with it, and the golem morphed by itself, a jaw-dropping miracle that left even Luria breathless. The human golem snapped into a wolf golem, and Wraith, beaming at his handiwork, streaked after it in a playful chase as the next moment closed in. Sylvia and Luria leaned in, desperate to crack his methods, and Luria cut the silence with the question, was Wraith planning to bring the goal into the academy? He froze for a beat. Was that an issue? Luria doubted he could bring it there. All of the Golem's power poured from a single magic gem lodged in its core. When that gem's energy ran out, the golem shut down cold until recharged. The wolf suddenly crumpled, its energy utterly spent. Rafe begged Helva to recharge it with her magic before they raced to the academy. Gloria agreed, but warned it would demand constant recharging, and she couldn't always haul herself to the academy. They'd have to store the goal here. Disappointment hung over Wraith. They barreled in with goofy cheer to lift him, but he brushed them off. He forced the words out. He had to accept that his time with Liquid Niquin was over. On his first day at the academy, Wraith found himself hopelessly lost while curiosity flared. A luscious silhouette spotted him, and a bolt of curiosity struck. Who was he? Wrath had scoured every corner and still couldn't find his destination, the students' whispers hardening into suspicion of him as he weighed his next move. Alicia barreled up and barked, "What are you doing?" He blurted that today was his first day on the job. She already knew and snapped, "Where are you headed?" He burst out, pleading for help in his workshop, following the list shot. Wrath's gaze snapped. She mirrored Seth. the same hair color, the same eye placement, the same facial features, and he pointed it out. She locked eyes with him and demanded his honest verdict on her brother. Wrath hailed Seth as his rock, the steady friend who leapt in without hesitation whenever Wrath needed help. Elisha raised an eyebrow at the odd reply, turned away, a sly grin curling at the corner of his mouth. Everyone else tried to prey on her brother. Wrath alone was genuinely on his side. She ushered him into Helga's workshop, beaming that she couldn't wait for their classes, then slipped away. Keith rapped on the door, then strode inside. Rage ripped through him when Wrath showed up late on his first day. He blurted a shaky apology, confessing he'd gotten lost. Helga declared lessons started today. They'd kick off with theory, not hands-on practice, to ease them in. He skipped most classes to save his strength, so he didn't have to overexert himself. When the practical lessons began, Wraith hurled every ounce of himself into them, and it helped. Who lunged forward, demanding answers about the magic gem she'd slipped into his palm. Wrath confessed he'd poured it into forging an energy-efficient golem, a creation he deemed neither outright triumph nor flat failure. Helga gaped he'd actually forged an entire goal out of that single gem. Wrath relived every failed attempt, staggered when those words struck him, then clenched his jaw and locked his focus on the task. Hold that thought, we'll blast into it later. He teased he'd introduce himself any second now. They burst out of the workshop toward Wraith's first class, his shot to seize the room as assistant teacher, and then panic sliced the air. He's not here, he's not here, he's not here. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Nerves coiled in wrath as the students' gazes pinned him. He ached to bolt but couldn't, so he latched onto Helga's voice and forced his breath steady. Her words blurred and he couldn't follow. When he finally came to, Helga shoved him forward as the temporary teacher, her eyes drilling into him for a response. The Wraith stood quaking, sweat slicking his skin. Helga had to prod Wraith again until Wraith snapped him back to his senses. He strode in, introduced himself, and vowed to pour every scrap of his knowledge into them while he was there. A student snapped her hand up. She slammed her palm down and demanded, "Were you that suspicious figure this morning?" She'd seen him with Alicia and burned to know what tied them together. Wraith flushed and stammered that he'd been wandering to memorize the new students' faces, apologized, and insisted Elisha was only an acquaintance. His words only deepened the class's confusion after he'd just claimed a connection to one of the 4 great noble families. Helga snapped in, insisting Wraith was only lost, and that his nervous hesitation had everyone eyeing him like a suspect. Recognition slammed into her. His quirks matched ones she'd known, and she ripped her attention back to the lesson. Day 1 they branded Wraith with a nickname, the lost temporary tutor tied to a noble house. During the lesson, Helvet slammed the point home. The magic gem is the power source and beating heart of every Golem. Shatter it or drain its energy, and the Golem will stop. Relief hit Wraith like a cool wave, no immediate tasks, and he realized this lesson was the hard-won skill he'd hammered out under Luria, now being taught as formal doctrine. Helva then swept the class onto the training grounds for an early practice that exploded into an electrifying race. He pounced on the chance to erase his awkward introduction by leaping in to help. He urged the students to bring their questions to Wrath, but they eyed him with doubt after his earlier blunder getting lost. Wrath forced himself to believe sharp answers would win them over, yet they started building Gons on their own and left him stranded. Convinced their opinions were set in stone, he scoured the halls for any student who might need help. Wratham zeroed in on a girl, bewilderment blazing in her eyes. He reached out to help, she shook her head and refused. He darted to others who rebuffed him or waved him off, telling him to consult Helga. Realizing everyone was dodging him, Wraith and Alicia let out a single, exasperated sigh. He leaned in and asked what was wrong, and she confessed classmates had been swarming her, peppering her with questions about her relationship with him. Wrath expressed regret and apologized, but Alicia reassured him it wasn't his fault and urged him not to dwell on it. Wrath blurted that people were dodging him, leaving him reeling and unsure what to do. Alicia snapped that they couldn't erase his image as a suspicious figure and demanded to know why anyone dared doubt his skills. Rafe swallowed and admitted he still hadn't unleashed his abilities in front of them. Alicia urged him to meet her at her location for the next practical lesson. Curiosity gnawing at him, Wrath demanded to know her intentions. She shrugged him off with a bored flick and walked away. Her mind raced, shredding apart every motive until the lesson ended. After he stepped out of Daisy's shop, Daisy snapped that they assumed he was too swamped to stop by, but Wrath smirked, said he'd carved out some free time and swooped in. Daisy shot him a quick question. Was it fine for him to leave his shop? Wrath jumped in, clarifying Lucia was managing it, and Daisy leaned in, grinning as she teased, "What did you mess up this time?" Irritation flared in Wraith as he snapped at her to stop tossing out those cryptic comments that left him baffled. Daisy demanded, "Did you mass-produce those elixirs?" Wrath admitted he'd just taken a short-term teaching post at the Magic Academy, but students were already whispering that he'd gotten lost and stumbled in late on his very first day. Daisy snapped, "Are you foolish?" Desperate Wrath pleaded for advice to restore his reputation, and Daisy froze, incredulous he'd even ask her. Ruth warned that if he begged Luria for help, she'd turn it into a weapon against him, while Daisy would shoot him straight with honest feedback right away. She dared him to prove his worth as an alchemist and reclaim his shattered reputation. Wraith's jaw snapped shut. He'd have to wait until the next practical lesson to make his move. He swallowed the urge to ask Daisy how she'd been, noting he'd ghosted her, no help at the shop, no alchemy lessons lately. She volunteered to show him her progress so they'd get through it faster. They burst into a room where Daisy put Lamo to work as she. When they first met, they'd brewed a middling potion, and Wrath's curiosity flared. How much had she improved since then? The moment Daisy started brewing the potion, he caught her movements smoothing into a flawless, practiced rhythm. The potion shimmered like proof of her hard work. After she finished, Wraith lifted it, peered into its depths, and awe slammed into her. It was top tier. He heaped praise on Daisy, amazed she'd run the shop solo and sharpened her skills so much in under a year. Daisy's cheeks flamed as she admitted she might one day surpass him, and Wrath's grin lit up. He couldn't wait. He pushed open his shop door and froze. Luria sat there, worry carved across her face. When asked, Luria snapped that her maniflo had fallen off. Wraith shot a question, did something happen? And she replied there were no negative effects yet, though it felt like a tiny bone was stuck in her throat. Alarmed, he demanded she probe it deeper. Luria warned it was a whisper of an anomaly, so faint most mages would miss it, and devilishly hard to examine. Wraith said they could shelve it for now if it caused no harmful effects. Luria nodded eagerly, leaned forward and pressed, "How was your day at school?" His face screamed that it had gone horribly wrong. Lafayette and Sylvia arrived, stunned to see him so utterly downcast. Luria insisted she'd only asked about school, and he snapped, anger boiling over. Blackie leaned in, grilling him for details, and Wraith's voice cracked as he admitted the students were avoiding him. He laid bare that a chain of incidents had shredded their trust, and he couldn't fathom what he'd done wrong. Frustration snapped. On impulse, he handed in his resignation. As Helga's assistant, his whole job was to back her, and even at worst that was enough, so he dismissed overthinking and decided to roll with it. Sylvia swore he'd be okay. She snapped, "Your mana's been off, really strange lately." Wrath realized it stirred no chaos, so he shrugged off the concern. He dropped in on Lathe. She lit up and said that because of him, Ariel had finally calmed down and the whole place had settled into peace. His face lit up, and that laugh shoved him to reach out the moment he needed help. He thanked her, eyes gleaming, and vowed he'd finish on her when the time came. Come dinner on the second day of practical lessons. Ruth's jaw clenched as she watched the students still snub him. He gaped at their brilliant, almost reckless creativity with guns. Something gnawed at him, were their perspectives just different from his, and he didn't hesitate, striding straight toward Alicia. He found Alicia transfixed by the magic gem in her hand. With the others already forging their gons, he hustled over and demanded what was wrong, convinced she was falling behind. She snapped that she wasn't slacking, shoved a shimmering magic gem into his hand, and demanded they prove his abilities. She sucked in a deep breath and roared that Wraith would give a demonstration. Excitement crackled through the students as they leaned forward to see what would happen, yet doubt gnawed at them about those Wraith skills. Wraith seized the opening to flip their doubts, grabbing Alicia's attention as he implored her to trust him. He barked back up, eyes glued to it. He needed the space. Their scathing remarks about him slammed into his ears in mere seconds. Wraithcrafted stuns Catgallum, leaving everyone gasping in astonishment. The golem practically breathed, its fur so shockingly lifelike it could pass for a living animal. Whispers exploded across the classroom as students wondered if their teacher had always been this astonishingly skilled. Equally stunned, Alicia had heard her brother rave about those extraordinary talents, but she hadn't imagined they'd blow her away like this. The gong looked so alive it blasted past being just a doll and felt like he'd breathed real life into it. Most golems were built to sit and take hits, but only a master could craft the delicate inner lattice that let one move. One tiny flaw in motion would shatter it, so making a mobile golem was far beyond any ordinary alchemist. He'd expected a roar, but silence stunned him. He'd been sure he'd nailed it. He shot the question at Alicia. Was his demonstration all right? She paused, admitted she might have underestimated him, and said she now understood her brother's perspective. Wrath's brow knotted as he demanded she explain. She repeated herself, but every repeat plunged him deeper into confusion, and that shock hit her like a punch. He shrugged off his feet like they meant nothing, and her admiration for her brother only grew. Later, a blushing student, cheeks aflame, stepped up to Wrath. Her words slammed into him, leaving him reeling. She stammered, then laid out her goal. His body lay broken, and she had no idea how to mend it. Wrath, relieved it was just a class issue, snapped that she simply hadn't drilled hard enough on compression. She urged her to zero in on that weak seam while shaping the golem, so she tried again, and this time forged one that didn't crumble. While demoing for Elisha, students bombarded him with non-stop questions, and being called sensei made him squirm. Helva snapped her fingers, pulled everyone close, declared they were plunging into the lesson's core, crafting gulns as practice dummies, and asked him to demonstrate it once more. Wrath squeezed every second into forging a humanoid gulm, tapping hard-won lessons from Lathe and Sylvia to make sure it couldn't transform. He slotted the magic gem into place and effortlessly conjured a finely detailed, lifelike humanoid. Amazement pulsed through the student as he stared at his goal of crafting skills, and Helva snapped at Alicia to test it by striking the goal with her magic. Alicia ripped the sky open and blasted the gauntlet with a roaring gale. It shrugged off the blast and walked away unscathed. A stunned hush fell over the students as the goal stood untouched, not a single scratch betraying the chaos. Alicia, their strongest magic user, staggered in disbelief as her spell fizzled uselessly and left no mark. For the first time, her magic sputtered and died against a measly dirt golem. Frustration crackled in Alicia as she glared at Wrath and snapped, "What's so unusual about the golem?" Wrath swore he'd only made a plain gong, but Alicia ripped into him in front of everyone, and as she scolded him, the students froze, terrified she'd demand they all produce the same thing. Helga overheard their panic, stepped in to calm them, and made it clear she never expected them to tackle work this advanced. A week later, Wrath stood baffled as students furiously blasted their own gongs with magic. Smoke, shouting, and flashing steel turned the training ground into a war zone. He slid aside to dodge the carnage, but noticed. The gongs splintered at the slightest touch. Made of dirt, he'd been sure they'd test him with scrap metal or gleaming mithril. Wrath's gut clenched. Was there truly enough mithril for every single student? Out of nowhere, Will exploded into view, jolting Wrath's who. He donned an icy mask. Someone demanded why Will was there. Will fired back, "I'm the school chairman." Will announced he was checking in on his new hire and pressed for an update on the rate's progress. Wraith confessed he'd been barely holding on. Will had assumed he'd be thriving. Wrath cracked a nervous laugh, admitted hurdles were blocking his path, and said he was grinding like crazy to bust through them. A satisfied grin lit Will's face. He leveled a quick, unreadable stare at Rate and kept his reasons to himself. When Alicia called Wrath, he fired off a quick excuse and slipped away. She closed in on Alicia and saw him shrink back, his words to Will snagging in his throat. Wrath didn't even notice how he was acting, but Alicia said that while he looked calm, she could tell discomfort churned beneath the surface. This ripped the calm from Wrath. Alice should explain that growing up inside the four great noble families burned this insight into her, a skill she stumbled into without meaning to. Surprise slammed into Rafe. Seth hadn't picked up on it, and he strained to see if Will had noticed his discomfort too. Alicia suspected Will probably already knew. Wraith vowed he wouldn't hide his feelings if that was true. Alicia confirmed Will and Wraith were acquainted. Wraith. They brushed it off as an unwanted coincidence, but Alicia doubted Will had met that person by chance. Ruth shot Alicia a grateful grin and nodded to her earlier request for a demonstration. That instant clinched the students' respect. Alicia declared it necessary and hailed his effort, hoping everything would glide smoothly unless trouble reared its head. Ras let out a weary laugh and pleaded for a quiet, uneventful tomorrow. Wraith hovered outside the chairman's office, jaw tight as he mustered every scrap of courage to step inside. Will waited for him, every nerve taut as he felt Wraith's curiosity flare the instant the summons arrived. He snapped at Wraith to calm down, insisting he only wanted one favor, Will asked. To rally help and keep the school's property spotless. Wraith pressed for clarification. Will brushed it off as simple. The training grounds lay scarred from the recent alchemy lessons. He was correct, the grounds were in poor condition after the previous day's class. However, Wrath, hired as an alchemy assistant teacher, felt this extra work was beyond his duties. He stood on the brink of refusal until Will tossed out, "You'll be paid." That was enough, and he agreed to take the task. Everyone watched Will blaze through tasks, and he said every ounce of effort was meant to build a better learning space for his students. He stopped at nothing to cram more money into his pockets, snatching up any extra pay he could get. Day after day he toiled, patching, polishing, and keeping the school's facilities running like clockwork. Students besieged him, pelting him with frantic questions and desperate requests. The final test was scheduled for the next practical class. The student bombarded the room with question after question. Faith decided to stay after school and throw an all-out test prep blitz today to back them up. He unleashed a last-minute announcement, bracing for only a handful of people to show up. Surprise slammed into him. The classroom was packed with students. Awe surged through him. He'd only ever assisted Helga's lessons, never run one of his own, and that fact knotted his stomach with nerves. He snapped everyone grab a box and promised he'd walk them through the next steps. Boxes in hand, he slammed his order, shaped the dirt into a tight ball. The students won't be able to do it. 200, if that's all. It sounded simple. Someone guessed he'd go around checking each of them, but he barked that inspecting them one by one was exactly today's job. They swaggered, convinced they'd finished in a flash. They heaved and strained, but every attempt failed. The dirt refused to budge. Rafe snapped they'd already figured it out. This wasn't ordinary dirt. It came from the southern continent, a place that sucks the life out of magic. Some soils ravenously pull in magical energy, others violently spit it out. That was the exact patch of earth Wrath had handpicked. He tossed them an out. Anyone could quit if they wanted. He vowed to answer every question, so just raise your hand. A torrent of questions crashed in, drowning the room in noise. Alicia snapped, "This dirt won't budge," doubt sharp in her voice as she wondered if it could ever be moved. Spotting their skeptical stares, he strode forward to demonstrate and beckoned them to huddle close. He flicked his wrist and the dirt slammed into a tight ball, and Alicia blurted, "Is that a trick?" They warned they could cram more magic into it or weave the spell with surgical precision. The dirt fights magic. It refuses to yield unless they shove a surge of mana into it, just like he warned. He instructed them, if a speck of dirt resists your magic and won't bend, zero in on each grain and hit it with surgical precision until its resistance shatters. This exercise forged their strength. It boiled down to technique. Only those who'd mastered alchemy basics could claim victory. Alicia locked onto the moment with laser focus, her calls sharp and unwaveringly fair. She finally forced the dirt to budge, but keeping it there was brutal. She doubted they'd pull it off in a day and thought shaping it flat out impossible, while he wondered if he'd set the goal too high. Alicia nodded, and Wraith cut the task down, barking one command: get the dirt moving. The special session slammed shut, and everyone dove into a fierce, all-out work sprint. Night fell, yet he still had to keep the school's facilities running. His eyes snapped to a ragged pauper hunched in the turning ground. He squinted, pulse spiking. Was it from another lesson, and were there more marks waiting to be found? He locked his jaw and barreled into the next scene, dead set on following them. Wraith burst through the door, bone-deep exhausted after a brutal day at work, as Laffy, Liu, Rhymes, and Sue leapt up to greet him. Dinnet primed himself. They waited, every gaze locked on him. He thanked them, tore into his meal, laughed, and asked about school. He brushed it off, insisted everything was fine, noted the test was coming up, and said he'd been staying late to answer students' questions. Laffy flashed a grin and teased him, dubbing him a great teacher. Embarrassment pinned him mute. Luria leaned in, taunting him sensitive, and they exploded into a loud, snapping bicker. Sylvia felt that strange pulse in the flow of magic just vanish. Luria froze, then blurted, "It's gone just like that." Wraith snapped, "Did you pin down the cause?" They could only shake their heads. They hadn't. Laughter jerked the conversation around and pointed straight at the test he'd mentioned earlier. He slammed the point home. It was a Golan construction test, and he wasn't directly involved. As the substitute teacher, Wrath refused to grade the test. He rolled up his sleeves and plunged into drilling the students for it. Luria jabbed him with a mischievous grin, poking fun at his unshakable commitment. Faith scoffed and revealed he'd even started maintaining the school's facilities while he was working. Lafayette roared her joy and cheered him on, certain he'd soar. Test day hit like a freight train. Ruth beamed and announced the day was perfect for it. The students crowded the training ground, tension crackling on every face. Helga scanned the room, confirmed everyone was present, then kicked off the exam. He zeroed in and forged a rock-solid goal at lightning speed. Points vanished from anyone who dawdled. The quickest students tore through their galls in 5 minutes. Next came the durability test. They slammed the gallant with searing light magic to see if it would hold. When Alice's turn came, Wraith zeroed in, his gaze boring into her every move. She forged an awe-inspiring golem and subjected the test to its full, crushing force. Alish hammered a golem into being in 3 minutes, and it stood rock-solid and flawless. Having lived up to Helga's sky-high standards, Alicia strode up to Wrath and demanded, "How did I do?" Wrath blinked, confusion sparking in his eyes, and demanded she repeat the question. She wanted to know how she'd fared on the test, and he told her she looked like she was leaving everyone else in the dust. Wrath's praise hit Valesha like a dud, flat and underwhelming, and Wrath insisted he meant it as a compliment. Without warning, a strange surge of magic ripped through Alicia, the same eerie current Sylvia and Luria had felt. She blurted out that it hadn't happened yesterday. Wrath couldn't pin down the cause, so he zeroed in on a rogue magical anomaly. He brushed Alicia off with a shrug, insisting it was probably nothing, even as each fresh mention stabbed at his certainty that it wasn't just a coincidence. After school, while fixing the training ground, Ray threw himself into the work with fierce, single-minded focus. He froze paw prints right there again, determined to investigate. I tailed them until they slammed to a halt. Not a single clue slipped out about the magic's pulse or those cryptic prints. The next morning, Helder went ballistic when he found the students' gallons smashed to bits. The students poured their hearts into their creations, each one fanning the inferno of her rage. Wrath urged them to report it to Wills immediately. They stormed into Will's office and the news hit them. There were no witnesses. The night guard swore he'd seen nothing suspicious and no other reports surfaced, so Will pressed them to probe the shattered gongs for clues. Inspecting them, Will suspected magical destruction, doubting human hands could cause such damage. His breath caught, the gem's magic lay utterly drained, every spark snuffed out. Magic gems don't just run out on their own, someone must have bled them dry. Will beefed up his guards, and with lessons about to start, they slammed the brakes on the investigation. Later, Rafe tore into every detail of the incident with Luria. Faith confessed his grasp of magic was shallow. His jaw dropped at the idea that anything would have to amass such a colossal surge of magical energy. Luria snapped that siphoning raw power straight from magic gems was almost unheard of. With nowhere to bottle it, the surge had to be spent the moment it was ripped free. She fired off any sign of it. He shook his head, none to be found, and Luria stood just as clueless. Graith's heart hammered. Even Luria, a master of magic, was clueless. With golems at the center, he raced to inspect the ones he'd forged earlier, hunting for any clue. He stormed into the storage room to see it, then froze, stunned by what he'd done. He ripped it open and found something shocking inside. In the following scene, in Lucia and Luria, Raitsum sprang to his feet and roared. Drive home how critical this was and make them zero in, every eye and ear locked on it. He'd held his composure until that instant, then panic ripped through him. He blurted out that his liquid MC1 had vanished. Lucia froze in confusion. Luria snapped. The gone wraith made it. Lucia demanded to know why it had vanished and whether it had slipped away on its own. Wraith burned to understand why. The gulm held no magic at all, that warped everything. He remembered people saying they'd felt an eerie ripple in the magic's flow. He shot the question at Luria. When did the magic flow stabilize here? And she snapped, yesterday. He pressed on. When did the irregularity start? Luria's eyes sharpened with understanding as Wrath confessed the magic flow went haywire the moment he created liquid MC1, and the same breakdown had been plaguing the Magic Academy since yesterday. Every clue screamed that the magical disturbance started with his liquid Mycoon. It ruptured and flooded the Magic Academy. The golem destruction at the Magic Academy. The culprit siphoned every last spark of magic from the gems of the shattered goms. If an energy-hungry, inefficient golem was behind this. If it drained magical energy to survive, he'd be the one to answer for it, so he summoned Lathe and the others to his aid. He pulled the girls close and laid out the danger, then implored them to help take down the rogue golem. To Sylvia, this was a catastrophe. Lathy warned that dealing with a goon crafted by Wraith would be a brutal, time-sapping nightmare. Lucius only wanted to bolt home and finally rest. Wrath clung to every one of them, his voice cracking as he confessed the crushing regret tearing him apart. Lafay refused to pin the blame on him. No one had ever heard O'Gallan move a muscle on his own. Wrath's pulse hammered as he prayed nobody would trace the gallant back to him, if they did. Silence swallowed the report. No one filed it. Then, at the very last moment, the scene flipped. We're going to get to know you. We're going to get to know you. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very. He barked a laugh, shot back that its unique abilities would give it away. Then, on reflection, his grin faltered. Even if they'd never touched it, this could be the wild card that turns the tide. Latvia dropped the bomb. They were heading out. Wraith snatched up a book, slipped into the group's ranks, and barreled toward the goal he'd birthed. They reached the academy and slammed into tightened security that blocked their every move. Rafe hatched a daring plan to slip past the guards. He pitched a daring plan and asked Floria for a favor 10 minutes later. Everyone snapped into their academy uniforms, the courtyard exploding into a wave of crisp, identical colors. Wrath snarled that this was only to get us through the main gate. Now blending in as ordinary students, he convinced himself no trouble could touch them. The security guard stepped forward and demanded to know their business. Wrath blurted he'd forgotten something, and the guard sneered. No way the whole group had come back for a single student's item. He figured they'd need school supplies and pitched conjured, enchanted disguises to help them pass. Clinging to the uniforms as a shaky clue, Wraith gauged the guards' reaction, and they slipped inside unchallenged. Once inside, the schoolrooms exploded into whispers, everyone stunned by the audacity of his plan. Ray couldn't hide it. He admitted he was blown away. She pulled it off, and the wild part was she was in her late 20s. Lathe demanded, "What's our next move?" Rates barked they'd charge to the storage, where the shattered gallons sat, hunting every scrap for clues. The guard still planted himself outside the going storage room. Laughter's breath hitched. Had the school already pinpointed the culprit, Luria urged them to flee before they were caught. Wraith pushed them onward, insisting they press deeper, then turned to Luria and asked her to unleash her magic and pinpoint the gulms. Sylvie had been probing for magic since they set foot in the school, sensing nothing, until a sudden pulse of power slammed into her. A jolt of uncanny magic ripped through her. They decided to investigate and stormed the backyard, hunting every corner, yet not a single gallon was in sight. Sylvia's eyes flashed with bafflement. She'd been certain the magical energy was pouring from that very spot. Luria locked onto the presence. She'd confirmed it lingered close. Wrath's chest tightened as he wondered if their goal had already slipped away. Sylvia and Luria swore it was still close, as Golan's magic writhed and shifted in a restless, unending dance. If it was thrashing that wildly, someone, either them or the security guards, would have caught sight of it by now. It struck Wraith like a thunderclap. The guard they'd been hunting was the golem itself. Wraith clamped a hand on the guard's shoulder and hissed, "Don't start picking up new powers without us knowing." The man whipped around, his body suddenly melting. They froze in shock as he melted into his true form, a writhing liquid Mekwangallum. Lafay and the others reeled in confusion. Even Wrath's unshakable composure crumbled. He suspected the Goa was devouring magic or hiding some strange anomaly, siphoning power and sprouting new abilities as. They clamored, desperate to explain it, when the golden liquid MC1 shot free and bolted. Lafayette, Chase, and Swansea, just saying those names sets my pulse racing. And its throat nothing but a nest. Wraith roared for Luria and Sylvia to unleash every spell they had. The Golan looked unstoppable. But their spells had no effect. Wraith snapped, commanding Luria to weave a magical seal around the Gaul and its surroundings to trap it, then added, "Thank you very much." Luria lunged forward, desperate to snare it. Lathe lunged in, slamming every escape route shut and trapping the Gulm with nowhere to run. Wrath barked, "Laffy, attack again. Bring that sword down." She sneered it didn't matter and lashed out. He wanted to test something. The gown twisted like lightning and slipped past her blade once more. Wraith realized they couldn't land a single blow, and the thing devoured magic, Luria, and the others' spells fizzled, so he had to pin his hopes on Laffy, and it struck him as bizarre that such a nimble golem would bother posing as a human. If his theory proved right, Lathe was seconds away from unleashing a devastating strike. His hunch was dead on. Laffy surged forward and slammed a brutal blow into the Garm. Ray realized Galms needed magical energy to move, and Liquid Micron was running dry. No wonder it zeroed in on magic gems and student-made Galms. No glowing gem sat nearby to restore its energy. The Golan staggered, every movement dragging as its strength bled away. Laffy's strikes were finally landing, and Wrath practically buzzed with confidence. Galms run on magic, so every hit siphoned its power and shoved it closer to defeat. The golem shuddered, stone grinding as it snapped into the form of an armored soldier. Then a thunderous voice boomed, speaking directly to them. Wrath gaped at the Gallant's power. Laffy urged them to try talking to it to halt the fight, but the Gallant scoffed that it would be pointless. Ray's breath caught as he realized Lathe might collapse before the Gulm's man, Arandri. He barked Laffyback's name, some in the. Luria barked, ordering Luria and Sylvia to keep the Gon occupied with relentless physical spells. Luffy burst back in and snapped, "Do you have a plan, Wreath?" Doubt gnawed at him, yet he laid out a daring strategy. They all chose to take the plunge. Latvian stepped in beside Sylvia and Luria. They baited the gallant into a brutal clash to pin it down while Luria was gone. Seize the smallest opening, then pummel it with shattering spheres of ice magic. Exactly as expected, the Gulms snuffed out the magic. In that instant, Wrath shrank into a tight sphere, vanishing inside it as his transformation snapped into place. Burst forth to strike, engulfed in the magic gem's blinding glow. He detonated a blast that sent everyone crashing to the ground. The Gulm ballooned into a monstrous colossus, rearing above them and dwarfing everything in its shadow. Luria's breath hitched as she realized the strange mana flow pulsed from the golem of. It ravenously siphoned every scrap of magic from its surroundings. Wrath pressed the question, and she revealed it could siphon magic back to refill its own reserves. Panic clawed at Wraith. This was his only strategy. Luria doubted it could gulp enough mana to power all its operations. The Golem locked onto the students' gallons, ravenously draining them to steal every drop of mana. They had only two choices: let its mana bleed out or strike straight at the magic gem. Rafe's body shook though he wasn't in combat, and Laffy hurled himself at the Golem again. The fight exploded with brutal intensity, but the Gollem's increased size bogged it down. Laughter burst out. Wrestling to hold the Gollem's attention, they begged for a plan and met a blunt no. The truth hit them. Shattering its magic gem would demand outside help. Its massive frame made it a walking bullseye, but its ironclad resilience swallowed every strike. Luria barked, "Clear the area," as she readied herself. Exploded into a powerful spell. Wraith's breath hitched at the thought of wrecking the school, but Luri shrugged, cool as ice, saying they'd repair it later. He protested, but she snapped a humming magic sphere around him, its pulse urging him to stay put. She'd had enough of holding back to avoid trouble and lunged after Luria's massive. As the attack thundered down, Lathe and Wraith clung to the hope the gong had been obliterated, believing it couldn't survive such a blast. However, when the smoke cleared the gong, he stood, one broken arm still crackling with raw power. Wrath's well of ideas had run dry, and Laffy gripped her sword, heart sinking as she realized it wouldn't even scratch the thing now. Rafe's jaw clenched. Their only choice was to reach out and touch the Gollem's magic gem and snuff its power. It demanded teamwork, and he froze, refusing to drag everyone further into danger. They'd already plunged in, their resolve blazing for everyone to see. Rafe swallowed his fear, barked for them to pin the goal in place, then surged forward to close the distance. Lucia struck first, Sylvia pounced next, Lathe tore in, and Luria finished the assault. A sudden opening cracked wide, handing Wraith a chance to dash for the magic gem, and slammed the controls, kicking the shutdown into motion. The gong fought back, siphoning his mana. It turned the task into a brutal slog, and he exploded with a fury fit for the Gollem's creator. Wraith slammed every ounce of will into one last explosive surge, and finally broke through to victory. It sent the scene careening into collapse. Mana drained and utterly spent, he could barely stand. Then they'll unleash. Their troubles exploded the moment Will's guards stormed in. Ray stumbled into Helga's room and caught her voice cracking as she poured out an apology. Wraith lunged to cut her off and comfort Helga, but Helga dug in her heels and refused to back down. The investigation tore the lid off the truth. The Gallon's rampage was triggered by a faulty magic gem Helga gave Wrath. If Helga truly didn't know about the flaw, everyone would have shrugged and called it an accident. Helga slipped Wraith a sabotaged gem, betting he'd botch the golem and lose heart, but Wraith's masterful alchemy forced life into the flawed stone, and Helga's jealousy exploded into chaos as his fierce talent ran wild. Helvet owned up. It would be wrong to shove the school's damages onto ratepayers, and he swore he'd pick up the tab himself. Rafe burst into Will's office, and Will, seeing Helga's genuine remorse, called him a good person. Will vowed Wrath wouldn't be blamed for the incident, and lauded his jaw-dropping alchemical genius. When Will asked Ruth, "Do you want to keep teaching?" Wrath's thoughts snapped to the friends who filled his life outside work. She flashed a gracious smile, bowed, and turned the offer down. Will didn't even flinch. He leaned in and vowed the door would always be open to him. They exchanged a sharp look, and Rafe exploded into motion, tearing through the chaos to clean up the mess they'd made. When she asked how things turned out, he revealed Golin's magic gem had failed. No one blamed him for the incident, and he'd quit teaching. Taken aback, Luria shot back, "Do you honestly think you're cut out to teach?" and warned his lack of friends would leave him unable to support students through their struggles. Wraith shrugged it off, insisting Laffy and the others had his back, and Luria beamed, truly overjoyed he'd found good people in the capital. Wrath snapped, "What did you mean by that comment?" Luri's expression snapped into steel as she declared it was time for her to leave. Confusion hit him like a punch. He demanded where she was going, and she snapped that she was leaving the capital and heading beyond its borders. Wrath seethed at her sudden announcements, but he knew that was just her nature. She flashed a mischievous grin and dared miss me, then he'd. Her expression hardened as she declared she'd watched her disciple come into her own and was ready to set off again. Reese proposed one bold plan: throw a farewell party. Delight danced in her eyes as she teased him again. 14 days had crawled by since the Golan chaos. Mimi's farewell party kicked off as Wrath whipped up irresistible dishes and flooded the room with a roaring, festive buzz. Someone thrust a champagne flute into Luria's hand as the room erupted in a roaring toast to the end of Rate's days as a teacher.